Our story begins in a place where a swarm of different demons is attacking, and people are running for their lives, trying to escape. When one of the demons is about to grab a woman holding her son in fear, someone slashes the demon's hand just in time. The woman and the child are shocked to see this, and it is a man who declares that the demons are annoying, warning them that not a single one will be spared. The swordmaster, Haiban, tells his teammates to get ready because the demons are approaching. He wonders aloud if this is the Demon King's final struggle. His teammates simply take their positions. Haiban then informs them that the Archmage will handle the aerial assault, while he and Lepenia will deal with the ground forces. Both the Archmage and the Swordmaster Lepenia agree. The King of Power, Valtas, excitedly announces that he'll take care of them all. The warrior man adds that he will infiltrate the demon castle and negotiate a surrender. Haiban then looks back and tells the Chief of Security that he is counting on him to quietly support the heroes from behind. Our protagonist, who is the Imperial Chief of Security, knows that his duty is to protect the Imperial castle. He is someone who silently helps heroes from the shadows. He replies to Haiban to go without worry, making Haiban smile at him. He smiles back in return. Haiban then runs toward the demons, shouting that they should have a drink together after work. As the demons charge, Lepenia releases her sword and swiftly slashes through them, defeating a swarm instantly. Valtas leaps behind her and strikes at the demons with his fist, shouting that they should all burn. When Valtas slams his fist into the ground, the surrounding demons are sent flying through the air. The Archmage then casts a spell that causes the demons to dissolve, while on the other side, Haiban faces a group of enormous demons. He releases his power, his eyes turning red, and launches forward, instantly killing many of them with his sword. Elsewhere, flying demons approach from behind, causing panic among the knights. One of them shouts that the demons are coming. He calmly replies that he has it under control and tells the others not to be afraid. He draws his sword and with a single slash kills the flying demons overhead. The knights are astonished, unable to believe that basic Imperial swordsmanship was enough to fell demons. But he simply asks what they're staring at and shouts at them not to lower their guard. Suddenly, one of his men warns him to be careful. When he turns to the side, he sees demons speeding toward him. Meanwhile, in the Demon King's castle, the Demon King tells the warrior that this is his victory, his destiny, and that he should take his head. He tells the humans it is their victory and that they should enjoy their peace to the fullest. The warrior raises his sword and slashes off the Demon King's head. A moment later, back in their city, the people cheer joyfully, celebrating that the Demon King is finally dead and peace has been restored. Haiban tells his team that it is a beautiful day, though he can't seem to find the Chief of Security. Lepenia responds that the chief likely didn't die. He's probably off somewhere, immersed in sword training or something. Meanwhile, the chief is behind the crowd, watching the heroes and thinking that they deserve the respect of people across the world. He believes his role is enough because he is neither a hero nor a swordmaster. Later, in the snowy mountains, he is swinging his sword, thinking that he may not have had natural talent, but he always loved the sword. Throughout his life, he wielded it. In his youth, during his academy days with Haiban, and later as part of the Imperial Guard. Suddenly he coughs violently, blood pouring from his mouth, and he curses, feeling as if he's dying. Laughing, he thinks that if he were only young again, his wounds would heal quickly. But he knows his time has come. He wishes he were a hero like them, ageless, immune to illness. But he alone is growing old and frail. He grips his sword and swings it one final time. As he does, a powerful energy bursts forth. He is shocked, recognizing it as the state of someone who has reached the peak of swordsmanship, a true swordmaster. He laughs, saying he never thought it would happen in his lifetime. Then he lets go of his sword, wondering what the point is now that he is an old man nearing death. Still, he thinks it wasn't a bad life. He closes his eyes, content that he became a swordmaster before dying. Moments later, he opens his eyes and is confused to find himself in bed. He sits up, asking where he is and if this is the afterlife. Then he sees himself in the mirror and wonders who he is and where he has arrived. A moment later, he stepped out of his room and walked toward the castle, wondering if he had been reincarnated into a child's body. He soon noticed that he was in the castle located in Ilok territory, the same place where he had served during his final years. As he pondered whose body he now inhabited, he spotted a young girl training with a sword. He paused, watching her for a moment, curious about her identity. He wondered if she was the Lord's daughter, as he didn't recall seeing a child like her in his previous life. He then noticed the sword technique she was practicing. It involved movements that resembled a snake. This made him question whether it wasn't the hero's sword technique, the one invented by that man. The technique looked difficult, but the girl appeared to be quite talented. She soon noticed him staring and called out to him, asking if he had woken up and why he was just standing there when the others had already begun practice. This made him wonder if his name was Asher. He responded by asking whether the technique she was using was Ravinia's sword technique, and commented that, judging by her skill, she must have practiced it consistently for at least 4 or 5 years. However, he added that her sword movement was still slightly unstable, suggesting she relax her grip and slow down the slashing motion a bit. Suddenly, a practice sword was thrown at his head. Furious, she asked why he was speaking so casually to her and whether he shouldn't show some respect to his employer. She then ordered him to call her Lady Laika. He quivered and stuttered an apology, realizing that she was his employer and not his younger sister. She decided not to dwell on it and asked whether he had gotten enough sleep, commenting that he seemed a bit off today. Then she added that for someone who had never wielded a sword, he was acting rather suspiciously, asking how he knew about the hero's sword technique, how much he knew about it, and whether she should test him. She warned that if he didn't perform properly, he'd be the one in trouble. He nervously walked toward the practice puppet, having no other choice. He realized that his old habit of nagging subordinates, a remnant from his days as a chief, had resurfaced. But when he held the sword, he felt something. His sword sense remained sharp. The sensation made him feel truly alive. He positioned himself in a stance which made Laika look confused and amazed. She recognized the posture. It was the stance of Imperial sword technique. She asked when he had started learning it and noted that he looked more serious than usual today. He remained silent and raised the sword, thinking to himself that she was being presumptuous asking when he had learned it. He'd wielded a sword for over 70 years, even in the final moment of his past life. As he swung the sword downward, a loud shockwave struck the ground, causing Laika to stagger backward from the sheer force. He flawlessly demonstrated the technique, feeling invigorated in his youthful body. It was light and energetic. He felt as though he could fly. Leaping at the puppet, he shattered it into pieces with a single blow. Laika stood stunned, shocked by what she had just witnessed, and stuttered his name in disbelief. He smiled at her, realizing he couldn't help himself when holding a sword, but he reminded himself that he should limit his swordplay. Afterward, he apologized, though she remained in disbelief. She knew that what he had displayed was the Imperial sword technique, the standardized method developed in the Empire. She asked how he could produce such speed and destructive power using what was considered a common and basic technique. Then she shouted his name, stunning him like a statue in shock. Grabbing his hand tightly, she exclaimed that it was amazing and told him she now saw great talent in him. She asked why he had hidden that ability all this time. He remained silent and shy, noting that she was still holding his hand. She confessed that until now, she had thought of him as a stupid and lazy person, but she admitted she had been wrong. He wondered to himself what kind of person Asher was in daily life. He replied that she was flattering him and that he only knew a little. But she disagreed, saying he clearly knew more than a little. She then asked what he had said earlier, something about what she should do slowly, when suddenly, someone interrupted them. Laika's brother Luke asked what all the noise was about and demanded to know what she was doing with Asher. He turned to Asher and told him that if he was awake, he should go outside and chop firewood or something. He also asked how dare Asher speak so casually to a noble. Luke added that his tone was too cheeky and called him a piece of trash, who better remember he was just a commoner, while they were nobility. Asher apologized, silently thinking that Luke was quite the uncouth young master. Luke then asked why he was holding Laika's sword. Was he planning to learn noble sword techniques? Laika tried to explain, but Luke cut her off and said it was perfect timing. He needed a sparring partner. He declared that if Asher could last 1 minute against him, he would admit his skill and invited everyone to observe. Laika, stammering, tried to stop her brother, but Luke confidently reassured her that he wouldn't kill Asher. However, she sighed, thinking that it wasn't Asher who might be in danger, but Luke himself. On the side, Asher panicked and noted that Luke's posture wasn't even the correct basic stance for sword combat. He wondered how someone like Laika could have such an unworthy brother. He decided he had to bring Luke down quickly before things escalated. Luke charged at him, yelling for him to be prepared. But with just one slash, Asher disarmed him. Luke's sword flew through the air and stabbed into the ground beside him. Asher thought that losing on purpose was proving harder than expected. Then he saw blood drip down in front of Luke. The stunned young noble had a small cut on his face. Gasping in horror, Luke touched the wound only to panic upon realizing it was blood. He screamed, unable to believe that a mere servant had injured a noble. Asher, meanwhile, felt like he had just signed his own death warrant. Later, in the castle of the Lord of Arak's territory, Luke knelt, tied up in front of the Lord and the Queen, begging the Lord to punish Asher severely. He insisted that Asher, a mere servant employed by the castle, had dared to harm his master. Luke added that, to his surprise, Asher had disrespected the heir of the noble Halbarok family and claimed they could no longer tolerate his disgraceful actions that undermined the dignity of the nobility. The Lord called out to Asher, who responded immediately. The Lord of Arak, Rebarok, asked if what Luke had said was true. Asher remained silent, realizing that Rebarok had become the Lord. Memories returned. 40 years ago, when he had just been appointed captain of the guard, he remembered visiting the guards with the former Lord. It dawned on him that 20 years had passed since his death. Rebarok told him that they had treated him like their own child all this time. Despite his many misdeeds, they hadn't cast him out and had allowed him to remain in the castle as an employee. But this time, he had crossed a line too far, and severe punishment was warranted. However, in light of the affection they once had for him, Rebarok declared they would be lenient. He ordered Asher to leave the territory immediately. The queen pleaded with the Lord to do anything but banish Asher. However, Rebarok silenced her, saying he had tolerated it because of her. But this time, he could no longer forgive. He asked how long they were expected to show affection to an ungrateful child who failed to recognize the grace he'd received. He added that Asher was fortunate to be expelled in good health. At that moment, a voice interjected claiming that it was Luke who was in the wrong. Laika stepped forward, declaring to her father that Asher had done nothing wrong and should be released. Luke shouted at her to stop, but she explained that Luke had injured himself while attacking Asher. She added that Asher had merely been teaching her swordsmanship, and that it was her brother's terrible technique that was a true disgrace to nobility. Luke trembled in anger, but Reborok and the Queen were visibly shocked. Reborok asked Laika if Asher had been teaching her swordsmanship and said this was the first he'd heard of it. Laika confidently replied that Asher possessed a high level of Imperial swordsmanship, so much so that she wished to have him as her mentor. She stated that Asher had changed and was now earnestly devoted to his swordsmanship training. Luke scoffed, mockingly asking if she really wanted to learn swordsmanship from someone like Asher, who had barely held a sword. He pointed out that not only did she want him as her mentor, but she also wanted to learn the so-called worthless Imperial swordsmanship style. He asked if she was in her right mind. She replied that she had witnessed Asher's skill with her own eyes and suggested that if they didn't believe her, they should have him demonstrate his ability. Meanwhile, Asher, still kneeling, had no idea what was going on. Reborok then called for Karen, who responded immediately. Reborok ordered Karen to test Asher's swordsmanship. The Queen stammered in concern, saying Karen might be too much, but Reborok reassured her that it would be a simple assessment. He then turned to Asher and said he didn't know what trick Asher had used to suddenly display skill and bewitch Laika, but warned him that if this was a joke, he'd be crawling out of the castle half dead. When Reborok ordered him to choose a sword, Asher complied, though he knew things were spiraling out of control. Reborok told him that if he could last more than 5 minutes against Caron, his skills would be acknowledged. Caron faced him with hostility, inwardly raging at Asher for daring to teach Laika. He considered Asher an insolent fool and had no intention of going easy on him, not even in front of Queen Benizia. He vowed to beat him down and see him expelled. Karen rushed toward him, shouting. Asher managed to block the initial strike while Laika watched intently, thinking that if what she saw earlier was real, Asher could hold his own. Karen arrogantly taunted Asher, claiming he was already trembling and that swordsmanship wasn't something learned so easily. He promised to teach him a painful lesson and followed up with a powerful blow, which Asher also blocked. Karen scowled, thinking that Asher hadn't even mastered the basics, yet dared to speak of swordsmanship. He launched a relentless series of attacks. Asher blocked them all, though he struggled slightly under the pressure. Karen noticed this and smugly thought he was right. Asher was a weak, arrogant fool who dared tarnish the name of swordsmanship. Eventually, Asher dropped to one knee. Reborok remarked that perhaps it was too much to pit him against Karen, while Laika was stunned and thought something felt off. On the other side, Luke praised Karen, shouting that, as the top graduate of the Imperial Academy, he was truly worthy of being a knight commander from a distinguished swordsman lineage. There was no way Asher could stand against one of the best in the Empire. Asher smirked at the remark while Karen sneered, thinking Asher was pathetic and weak. He told himself that Asher should learn the true meaning of swordsmanship. But then, Asher stood back up and calmly told Karen it was a nice little performance, an adorable display of swordsmanship. Karen was enraged and demanded to know what Asher meant. Asher told him he was simply returning his own words and asked if he thought the title of Knight Commander was something to be taken lightly. He offered to teach Karen a proper lesson. He swung his sword with immense force, sending Karen flying into a nearby pillar, shocking the siblings and the lords. Bleeding, Karen wondered what had suddenly changed. Asher calmly walked closer and mocked him, saying that he had barely struck him and Karen couldn't even block that. How pathetic. He then ordered Karen to pick up his sword and stand. Sarcastically, he called Karen an esteemed elite swordsman and mused that perhaps, in this era of peace without demons or war, swordsmanship had grown dull and weak. He concluded that it was time to correct the military discipline. He then faced Karen seriously, addressing him as the chief of the Empire and the head of the Templars in Iraq territory. He provocatively asked if Karen would allow himself to fall into the hands of a commoner, successfully triggering him. Enraged, Karen grabbed his sword and called him a bastard. Karen then charged, shouting how dare a commoner defeat him, and swung his sword. Asher effortlessly dodged the attack and taunted Karen, saying he was too slow. Then, raising his fist, he punched Karen in the face, slamming him into the floor. Everyone stood in stunned silence, unable to believe that he had punched Karen hard enough to break the floor and cause him to collapse. Asher looked down at him, saying it was a shame. He told Karen that he might think of him as an old man reminiscing about the past. But back then, not just commanders, even regular soldiers were leagues above him. They were skilled, rigorously trained, and disciplined. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, had died helplessly against the demons, unable to do anything. He reminded Karen that while this may be a peaceful era without demons or war, they must never let their guard down, and they couldn't afford to grow weak. Suddenly, the other knights surrounded him. Queen Benizia panicked, begging Reborok to wait. But Reborok, serious and suspicious, asked who he really was, declaring that he was not the Asher they knew. Sensing their hostility and doubt, Asher thought about what he could possibly say to make them believe him. He finally replied that he had lost his memory. Rebarok asked in disbelief if he had heard correctly. That Asher had lost his memory. Asher confirmed, explaining that when he woke up that morning, he couldn't remember anything. Not who he was, nor who they were. All that remained was the memory of swordsmanship. He had thought that wielding a sword might help recover more memories, but the void remained. He then released his grip on the sword and told Rebarok that regardless of the truth, he had clearly caused harm to the chief. Kneeling down, he stated that he was willing to accept any punishment. The room fell into a heavy silence and Benisia called his name, her voice filled with worry. A moment later, he was back in his room, sitting at the edge of his bed. He knew he needed time to gather his thoughts. He recalled Rebarok's final words to him. Until further notice, he was not to leave his room. He glanced to the side and saw the wooden sword standing against the wall, his gaze lingering on it. Elsewhere, Laika walked through the corridor, holding a piece of bread and a glass of water, deep in thought. She reflected on how much Asher had changed. It was as if he had become an entirely different person. Until just yesterday, Asher had never even held a sword, and his language and behavior were crude and vulgar, a constant source of irritation. She knew that Asher was her mother's adopted son. Before she and Luke were born, their mother had found Asher abandoned outside the castle. At the time, their mother had been in deep despair over not having children. So she raised Asher herself, without the help of any maids, pouring all her love into him. Since she and Luke were born, Asher had remained like family. But their relationship had grown increasingly strained. It nearly looked like favoritism. Their mother had shown Asher overwhelming affection, bordering on obsession. Yet despite her efforts, Asher grew distant, and his behavior sowed resentment throughout the estate. Asher had once been on the verge of expulsion from the castle. However, due to their mother's insistence, he was allowed to stay, under the condition that he would serve as an employee. Luke often declared that Asher was trash, and though Laika sometimes silently agreed that he was a pathetic child, she now couldn't deny the sudden change in him. Everything, his speech, behavior, and personality, had transformed. To her, he now resembled a swordmaster, one who had trained relentlessly for years to reach such a level. She arrived at Asher's room and knocked on the door, announcing herself and saying she had brought him some food. When he didn't respond, she opened the door and called out to him, but she froze in shock upon seeing Asher lifting a sword in front of her. In panic, she dropped the food she was holding. When the food hit the floor and the plate shattered, she dropped to her knees, trembling in fear. He quickly apologized, explaining that he had seen a sword in the room and instinctively began practicing swordsmanship. She, confused, questioned whether he meant sword practice. A short while later, he stood in the corner of the room, repeatedly swinging the sword. Laika observed him and could no longer contain her thoughts. She realized he was completely obsessed, almost fanatical, about swordsmanship. As he called her name, snapping her out of her thoughts, he asked what kind of person he had been before. From the way Luke and Rebarok treated him, it was clear their feelings were far from favorable. She responded that, even without saying much, it was obvious he had not been a good person. Aside from her mother, neither the family nor the castle residents viewed him kindly. He had resorted to violence against residents, destroyed property, and committed actions that tarnished the dignity of their household. He then realized that, even as a servant, he had crossed lines that no one should. He asked her why she was still speaking to him so calmly, and noted that it wouldn't be strange if she despised him. She turned the question back on him, stating that if he had lost his memories, then none of it concerned her. In fact, she saw it as a benefit. There would be no more trouble, no more irritating behavior. She remarked that his current personality was an improvement, and told him to take care of her. He came to understand, through her tone and words, that she was neither contemptuous nor indifferent. Suddenly a knock came at the door, followed by a request for permission to enter. Benisia, the mother of Luke and Laika, and Asher's adoptive mother, entered the room. She smiled at him gently while he tried to confirm to himself that her name was indeed Benisia. Kneeling respectfully, he asked the purpose of her visit, but she simply touched his face softly and insisted that formality wasn't necessary. Regardless of what had happened to him, she had raised him, and he should speak to her as he always had. He called her his mother, surprising her. She asked how he could say that if he had truly lost his memory. He told her that the Asher she once knew was not him. He admitted that everything from her face to her name was forgotten, meaning to him, she was a stranger. Still, Benisia hugged him and recounted the past. She had been in her 20s, still without an heir, burdened by guilt and uncertainty. One day, she had found him abandoned near the castle walls. When she held him in her arms and saw him smile, her entire world shifted. Despite resistance from others, she had chosen to raise him with love and care. Even if he now considered her a stranger, it did not change anything for her. He was her child, and she had loved him as such. He remained silent as she asked whether he could begin anew and become someone else. Still, a quiet sadness lingered in him as he wondered whether Asher truly meant so little to her. Despite this, he replied that he understood. Meanwhile, in the Lord's office, Luke burst in, raising his voice and questioning if Rebarok had just suggested Asher might be a demon. Caron, equally shocked, struggled to believe the possibility. Rebarok responded with caution, stating that it seemed too far-fetched. Demons had disappeared long ago. Even if one had survived, it would more likely infiltrate lords or nobles to seize power. A mere commoner like Asher would be an unlikely target. However, Reberoak admitted that it defied logic. A child defeating a high-ranking knight like Caron, and someone as talented as Laika acknowledging and supporting Asher. Just then, a new voice interrupted the conversation, noting that the discussion was quite interesting. Everyone turned, stunned, to see a man with a massive sword across his back sitting casually in the window. The man smiled as Karen charged toward him, demanding to know who he was, yet the man remained completely unbothered. Karen swung his sword, but the stranger stopped the blade using only 2 fingers. He casually remarked that Caron's swordsmanship was not bad, and even complimented his stance. Turning to Reberoak, the man observed that he had hired a fairly decent squire, which surprised Reberoak. Without much effort, the man tossed Karen aside, sending him crashing to the floor beside a frightened Luke. Karen coughed from the impact, ashamed to find himself in that humiliating position again. The man remarked that it was unfortunate. If Karen were a bit younger, he might have managed a real fight. He then asked Reberoak if he wasn't right. Reberoak, trying to maintain composure, reminded the man that Karen was still his knight and that he was taking things too far. Karen, stunned by the exchange, suddenly recalled something. Then, with clear recognition, Reberoak bowed respectfully. He stated that it had been 20 years and welcomed into his home the one who had reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship, Swordmaster Haiban Esther. Reberoak then asked Haiban where he had been, noting that he had vanished suddenly 20 years ago and that he had thought for certain Haiban was dead. Haiban simply laughed and explained that he had something he needed to investigate. He recounted his travels, having journeyed to the ends of the continent and to the horizon of the world, yet admitted that he still had not figured out everything. He then asked Reberoak if he had heard correctly that a child had defeated the knight assigned to guard him. Caron, filled with shame, reluctantly confirmed it. Luke, meanwhile, was in disbelief that someone like Asher was even sitting at a noble's desk. Reberoak pointed out that Asher was a commoner who had never received formal swordsmanship training. Haiban responded that such a feat meant the child must possess exceptional talent. He then instructed Reberoak to tell him more about the situation. The next day at the training ground, Asher instructed Laika to attack him with all her strength. She hesitated, asking if he was sure, and reminded him that he hadn't even drawn his sword. He explained that this wasn't about swordsmanship technique. It was training for real combat, a lesson that began even before the sword was drawn. He repeated his instruction, urging her to strike with the intent to stab. He was aware that, until recently, he had barely managed to remain in the castle, but now Laika had requested to become his disciple. Though he initially refused due to the stark difference in their social status, her determination had been unwavering, even bowing her head to him in earnest. With trembling hands, she gripped her sword and ran toward him. She launched a series of attacks, which he skillfully dodged. He recognized her technique as the heroic swordsmanship of Ravenia. She certainly had talent, and her skills were respectable. However, she was still weak. Her movements were textbook perfect but lacked depth. He easily lifted her and slammed her to the ground. Reaching out to help her, he told her that while she was strong in swordsmanship, real combat was an entirely different matter. He reflected on how many talented individuals he had seen perish on the battlefield, overconfident and unprepared for the brutal truth of war. He emphasized that before mastering swordsmanship, she needed to train both her body and mind. In response, she pointed her wooden sword at him and questioned who he really was, attacking again while remarking that it felt as if he had experienced war. He dodged her strikes and replied that his goal was to help her understand the essential difference between technical swordsmanship and true combat. He quickly pinned her down. She insisted that what he demonstrated wasn't swordsmanship. He countered by saying that blind faith in swordsmanship would not help her survive. What she needed was not just skill, but the application of swordsmanship, combined with emotional control. He explained that she must never lose her composure before an opponent, and that she needed the flexibility to overpower other styles with her own. As he swung his sword downward, she realized that, no matter when she saw it, his strikes were always flawless. He stated that he would teach her real combat, the kind that effectively applies swordsmanship. She stood and praised him, agreeing that they should begin proper training. Later, as the sun began to set, Laika walked through the castle, panting from exhaustion. Her entire body ached, and she felt as if she might collapse. She muttered that Asher clearly had no understanding of moderation. Regardless of the situation, he had pushed her, noble or not, to her limits, never once showing signs of fatigue himself. She thought he must possess monstrous stamina. Still, she felt happy, believing she had already become stronger after just one day of training. As she walked, someone called out to her. She turned to see that it was Luke. He asked if she had been playing around with Asher. She retorted by questioning what he meant by playing and clarified that it had been training. Luke dismissed it, claiming that training was a laughable excuse and insinuated that being alone with a man under such conditions was improper. She responded that he could think whatever he wanted. Luke, now serious, told her to mind her manners, accusing her of disgracing the dignity of a noble. He reminded her of her status, stating that nobles were expected to show generosity to commoners, not learn from them. His words infuriated her. She pointed the wooden sword at him, causing Luke to scream in fear and shock. She asked him if he couldn't just be quiet. Luke panicked, questioning whether she would actually strike him, the heir to the lordship. He shouted that it would not end well for her. She simply replied that she didn't care. Before things escalated further, a voice interrupted with a laugh commenting on how rare it was to see a daughter try to strike the eldest son. Rebarok immediately apologized to Haiban for such disgraceful behavior. He then turned serious, calling Laika by name and warning her that even if she had managed to get past Asher, she could not allow Luke to be hurt any further. Even she would not get away with such actions without consequence. Laika responded with an apology. She then glanced at Haiban, who continued to smile, and wondered who the old man really was. There was something undeniably extraordinary about him. She was startled when Luke addressed him by name, Swordmaster Haiban. Luke then introduced himself respectfully as Luke Halvark, the heir to the great Halvark family. As Laika heard this, her mind recalled what she knew of the Swordmasters, figures revered across the empire, their skill surpassing rank and status, and numbering fewer than 10 in the entire realm. Luke, swelling with pride, told Haiban that as a swordsman himself, he had long admired his heroic swordsmanship and now wished to become his disciple. He laughed proudly, telling Laika that among even the most accomplished masters, there were levels, and only a true swordmaster could teach true swordsmanship. But his confidence faltered when Haiban ignored him and instead approached Laika. Haiban greeted her, and to his surprise, sensed no fear in her whatsoever. Even standing directly in front of him, she showed no hesitation, no intimidation. She was poised, ready to react should he make a move. Haiban began to wonder whether he should test her. He reached behind his back and slowly drew his sword. Rebarok and Luke reacted in horror, shouting out, yet Laika did not flinch. She simply shifted her stance and prepared, wondering if the old man before her truly was a swordmaster. She then recalled Asher's words, how he had warned her not to be overwhelmed by an opponent's aura. The moment she instinctively swung her sword out of fear, she would be defeated. Maintaining composure in front of any opponent, he had told her, was fundamental. That was the reason she did not succumb to fear when Haiban released his aura and reached for his sword. She focused and stared at Haiban with steady eyes. When he attacked, she managed to block his strike with her sword. Haiban found it impressive. He recognized that this was rare as he often approached promising young talents aggressively to gauge their reactions. Most either fled in fear from his overwhelming presence or failed to endure even a light sword strike. But the young woman before him stood her ground, wielding only a wooden stick, fearlessly enduring his sword's force. He began to think that Laika possessed the makings of a true warrior. Laika then forcefully swung her sword to the side, pushing Haiban back. He leapt away as she did so, and she ran toward him using her snake-like technique. Haiban observed the fluid movement and considered whether her style originated from Ravinia's sword technique school. He blocked her strike with ease and acknowledged her skill, then gently pushed her away with enough force to send her to the ground. She fell hard, dropping her sword, and winced in pain. Haiban pointed his sword at her, prompting Rebarok to panic and plead with him to stop. Haiban, however, calmly remarked that unlike his cowardly son, Rebarok had a brave and commendable daughter. He then asked whether Laika was the disciple of the one they had discussed. Rebarok, stammering, confirmed it, while Luke stood behind his father in shame. Haiban was about to address Laika further, but she saw an opening and kicked him in the chest. She quickly retrieved her sword and prepared to face him again. Just then, a hand appeared behind her, gently resting on her head. A calm voice noted that it was impressive she had counterattacked while he had been distracted. Shocked, she asked how he had managed to get behind her. He remarked that she might one day rival Ravinia and asked if she could guide him to her master. She agreed, confirming to herself that Haiban was clearly no ordinary man. A short while later, they rode in a carriage. Laika glanced at Haiban, thinking about how easily he had handled her full-strength attack as if it had been nothing more than child's play. Even her father, she noticed, treated Haiban with great caution. Haiban asked if he had her name right, Laika. She confirmed it. He then asked what she had felt while watching her friend's swordsmanship. She replied that it had felt like witnessing the skill of a seasoned veteran. Haiban laughed, surprised she would call an 18-year-old a veteran. Moments later, they arrived at the training grounds. Haiban mentioned that it had been a long time since he had visited that place, reminiscing about how he once sparred there with a dear friend. Rebarok asked how that friend was doing, and Haiban replied that he had been a good man, but he was no longer among the living. Rebarok offered his condolences, but Haiban smiled and responded that it was all right. It had been 20 years. Laika listened quietly as they spoke. She then approached Asher, who was training with his sword. As he was about to swing again, she called to him, prompting him to stop and turn. He froze in shock upon seeing Rebarok and Haiban walking toward him. He panicked, questioning in his mind why Haiban was even there. Haiban greeted him warmly, which reminded Asher of who Haiban was, Rebarok's former guardian. During the era of the previous lord, Haiban had been specifically asked to watch over the young Rebarok. Asher realized that Haiban must be quite familiar with him. He addressed Haiban as a swordmaster. Haiban laughed, pleased that Asher recognized him. He said he had been wanting to meet him, smiling as he placed his hand on his sword once more. Asher immediately sensed it. Haiban's habit of testing young talents was in play. Knowing that, he acted first, swinging his wooden sword at Haiban with great speed, catching him off guard and stunning him. Haiban suddenly recalled a moment from the past, when he had told him that his swordsmanship was truly impeccable. He modestly replied that the Imperial swordsmanship was intended only for self-defense, and it was nothing compared to that of a swordmaster. Haiban had answered that they had simply taken different paths and that he had reached another level altogether. He then proposed that they spar once more, for old time's sake. He agreed. As their swords clashed, Haiban stared at Asher, overwhelmed by the memory. In that moment, he called out in shock, referring to Asher as captain of the guard. Asher turned, stunned, struck by disbelief at the name. They all stood in silence when Reborok asked Haiban what he had just said. Haiban, however, dismissed the question casually, saying it was nothing. He then referred to Asher as a kid, which made him jump slightly in surprise, wondering if Haiban had noticed something. Haiban then asked if he was, perhaps, a disciple of that man. Asher was pleased that Haiban thought so, but replied that he didn't know who Haiban was referring to and that he had no master. Haiban smirked at the response and suggested that Asher become his disciple instead. Reborok could hardly believe what he was hearing, that the swordmaster himself wanted to take Asher as a disciple. Before anyone could say more, Laika interrupted, asking everyone to hold on. She told Haiban that, swordmaster or not, she didn't know about his title, but pointed out that he had attacked someone who was just standing still. She questioned what kind of behavior that was, catching Haiban off guard. She then asked if being a swordmaster gave him the right to swing a sword at anyone as he pleased. Reborok panicked at his daughter's boldness and warned her that she was being rude, but Haiban reassured him that it was fine. He remarked that younger people these days didn't know who he was. With a smile, Haiban reached for his sword and released a powerful aura. He said he would show them for themselves. The surge of energy stunned Laika. Haiban calmly acknowledged that what she was seeing was aura, the unmistakable mark of a swordmaster. He then turned his gaze and swung his sword in the opposite direction. The force of the strike tore through the ground, sending debris flying and raising a cloud of dust. Everyone shielded their faces from the smoke. When it cleared, they were all stunned by the display of power, witnessing the presence of a true swordmaster in front of them. Haiban proudly declared his identity as a swordmaster, stating that Asher was a talented individual with the potential to reach great heights. He asked once more if Asher would become his disciple. Reborok understood the weight of such an offer. Being a swordmaster's disciple alone brought immense recognition and authority. Laika, too, was in awe of Haiban's incredible power. On the other hand, Asher considered what it might mean to train under someone like Haiban and how strong he could become. But despite that, he replied that he refused. Haiban's aura instantly faded. Everyone was left stunned and speechless by his answer. Meanwhile, outside the castle, a crowd had gathered. People were murmuring with excitement, asking if it was true that a swordmaster had arrived in the territory and expressing their hopes of becoming Haiban's disciple. Karen tried to control the situation, telling them to go home, explaining that Haiban already had a disciple. The crowd erupted in shock, begging to know who it was and pleading with Karen to have Haiban consider them as well. Back at the training ground, Asher was practicing again when he heard the distant cheering. He immediately knew that chaos had broken out outside the castle. Turning back, he looked at Haiban, who was sitting nearby, casually drinking. Asher asked if he wasn't planning to leave, but Haiban sipped his drink and responded that there was nowhere for an old man like him to go. He said he planned to stick around for a while. Haiban asked again if Asher was truly not considering his offer. Asher reaffirmed his earlier answer, saying no. Annoyed, he thought about how Haiban, a famed swordmaster, was clinging to him, practically begging him to become his disciple. The idea of becoming the disciple of his own friend seemed absurd. Asher then pointed to someone else, telling Haiban to focus on that kid instead, as she was probably more worth teaching. He motioned toward Laika, who stood nearby, fuming. Haiban replied that he had already offered, but Laika had politely declined. She had said she already had a master and could not learn from anyone else. Haiban laughed, remarking that Laika was a very polite girl. Asher could hardly believe it. He then looked at her with a hint of disbelief, wondering if she had truly turned down a swordmaster's offer just to remain his disciple. He muttered to Haiban that there was no need for her to go that far. Later, when night fell and the castle was silent, Luke staggered through the darkness, muttering curses under his breath. He was drunk, cursing his fate and life. His thoughts drifted to Haiban's words. How the swordmaster had told his father that, unlike his son, he had a brave and admirable daughter. Luke, filled with resentment, questioned the worth of being a noble. He blamed Asher for everything, convinced that his life had spiraled into chaos because of him. Suddenly, as he raised a bottle of liquor to his lips, a dark shadow lunged at him. He dropped the bottle in panic, unable to comprehend what was happening. The shadow slithered around him, encircling him until it completely consumed him. A sinister smile formed on the shadow's face. It laughed, a laugh like a demon, gleeful in having executed its plan perfectly. A moment later, Luke regained consciousness and attempted to stand. As he looked around, he wondered where he was. To his surprise, a voice called out to him, referring to him as the heir to the territory, Luke Halvark. When he turned, he saw a man floating in the air, surrounded by a dark shadow. The man smiled and greeted him calmly. The next morning, inside the castle of Arak, Laika told Asher that she couldn't stand that old man, Haiban. Asher reminded her that Haiban was still a swordmaster and asked if she shouldn't at least show some respect. Laika pointed out that he didn't seem to look at Haiban with much respect either. Asher felt awkward and wanted to explain that it was because Haiban had once been his friend. In truth, he had also reached the level of a swordmaster himself. He told her that it wouldn't hurt to learn from someone like Haiban, especially since he was the one who had mastered the heroic swordsmanship she admired. Laika responded that she wanted to be like Asher. That made him pause and look back at her, asking what she had just said. She repeated that he was the one she aspired to be like. When he asked why someone like him, she said that she truly respected him and considered him her master, and that he shouldn't belittle himself so much. In his thoughts, Asher reflected that he had no real talent for swordsmanship. All the swordsmanship in this world had been created by heroes of the past. Most swordsmen learned heroic swordsmanship and aspired to overcome human limits as they had. But he was different. The Imperial swordsmanship he practiced was basic and simple, created by the Empire and distributed so anyone could learn it. For someone like him, with no exceptional talent, it was the only viable option. He had spent his entire life wielding a sword, committed solely to that practical style. He questioned why a naturally talented person like Laika would respect someone like him. But in Laika's mind, he had made her strong. If not for him, she would never have been able to withstand Haiban's pressure. His guidance and teaching had helped her grow. She was confident that he was her guiding light. Haiban then appeared and asked them if they were having a lover's quarrel. Asher told him not to be ridiculous and asked what he was holding. Haiban explained that the items were a present for him, suggesting that if Asher stopped limiting himself to swords alone, he might be able to handle a variety of weapons. Asher stuttered in agreement, already understanding that Imperial swordsmanship focused on practicality and could adapt to various weapons, unlike heroic swordsmanship, which was founded on complex theory and superhuman techniques. He had learned to handle other weapons simply because in real combat, survival depended on using everything available. Haiban handed him a pair of gloves. When Asher put them on, he asked if they were iron gloves. Haiban replied that they were not just gauntlets, they were something far more interesting. He instructed Asher to focus strength into his arm and imagine any weapon. Asher imagined a dagger. Lightning flickered from the gloves, and to his shock, a dagger materialized in his hand. Haiban asked how it felt and whether it was usable. Laika watched the scene, amazed. Asher asked if it was magic, and Haiban confirmed it was spatial magic. The gloves were a form of weapon storage gauntlet, designed to allow the user to store and summon weapons at will through imagination. Haiban added that only weapons could be stored inside. Asher agreed that it was useful, but also noted that such a device would be wasted on swordsmen who were obsessed with weapon form and tradition. He then asked Haiban why he had made it. Haiban explained that it wasn't made for himself, but for a friend. Unfortunately, that friend had died before ever receiving it. Laika asked if it was the same friend Haiban had mentioned from 20 years ago. Haiban nodded and said yes. That friend had also used Imperial swordsmanship. Though they had taken different paths, he respected him greatly. That man had accepted his own lack of talent, yet never gave up. He simply followed his own path with quiet determination. A kind of enlightenment. Haiban asked how he could not admire such a person. Hearing this, Asher realized that he had always kept his distance, assuming someone like him, without any special talent, would hold no value in the eyes of heroes. He couldn't believe Haiban had cared enough to create something like that for him. Haiban continued, saying that Asher reminded him so much of his friend. His blunt way of speaking, his mannerisms, his eyes, and even his swordsmanship stance were exactly the same. Haiban admitted that he felt envious. He then asked once more if Asher would become his disciple. Laika, clearly irritated, frowned at the question being asked again. This time, Asher responded that he would accept, but only temporarily. He reassured Laika that he would still continue to teach her. Then, pointing his spear toward Haiban, he proposed a sparring match to thank him. Haiban raised his sword and accepted, telling him to listen carefully. Laika stood to the side, watching them. She noted that Asher seemed pleased with the gift and had now acquired a master with considerable prestige. She then turned her attention to the spar, watching as Haiban and Asher fought side by side. Back at the ruined castle, the man who had greeted Luke told him that he had heard a rumor about a swordmaster visiting the village and had come to investigate. Luke stuttered, asking who the man was. The man introduced himself as part of the assassination guild, Motorola. He explained that they had come seeking the Lord's Son's permission to establish themselves in the region. Luke was horrified. The name Motorola brought back memories. He had heard it whispered in fear. The world's largest assassination guild, one that had emerged 50 years ago, now stood before him. He couldn't comprehend why such an organization had come to a territory like this. But then, Luke remembered the demon's assassination offer. He turned to the man and said that he would allow the guild to establish itself, but only under one condition. The man's smile widened. Laughing, he asked Luke to tell him what the condition was. Luke, cold and resolute, ordered the man to kill Asher, without hesitation. As the sun began to set once again, Asher and Haiban were still engaged in battle. When Haiban pulled his sword back slightly, Asher saw an opening. He lunged forward and struck, calling it a good hit. Hyben blocked the attack just in time and offered praise in return. He acknowledged that Asher's raw combat ability was on par with his own and that his movements had been honed to near perfection. But he added that this was all Asher had to offer. Hyben released his aura and swung his sword backward, aiming to push him away. Asher managed to hold his ground. Hyben remarked that it was a shame. Beyond Imperial swordsmanship, Asher didn't seem to possess any aptitude for heroic swordsmanship. He then fell silent, watching him closely, until he caught a knife with his fingers midair and commented that it seemed Asher had adapted to using tools. Asher confirmed, saying that he had to rely on small tricks like that to get by. Hyben agreed, tossing the knife away. He explained that one couldn't unleash the overwhelming power of heroic swordsmanship using Imperial swordsmanship alone. In actual combat, complementary skills like magic could be incredibly useful. Asher caught the falling knife and nodded. He agreed that such tools could be effective. Since receiving the gauntlets, he had been training with Hyben every day to master their usage, all while continuing to teach Laika. He admitted that Laika was more naturally talented than he was, but Hyben turned the conversation, asking whether he was concerned about his emotions, always being around that particular child. Hyben was about to bring up the situation between them from before, but Asher cut him off, claiming he wasn't affected at all. In truth, he wanted to be affected, but the old man remained frustratingly cautious. Hyben said it was boring, and that Asher's stoic personality reminded him of Jinwoo. Asher asked if he meant his old friend, and Hyben confirmed it. Just like Asher, his old friend had only learned Imperial swordsmanship. He was a man who had once lived in despair, believing himself to be talentless. Hyben laughed as he recalled it, saying that whatever his old friend believed was his own business. Many others thought the same, that he had no talent. But then Hyben's expression shifted to something more serious. He said that now, he wasn't even sure what talent really was. Hearing this, Asher was taken aback. He couldn't believe Hyben would say such a thing. He had always seen Hyben as someone who believed in the value of talent and considered his own skills a blessing. To hear that such an arrogant man had changed his thinking over just a few years made him wonder what exactly had happened. Suddenly, Laika arrived and called Hyben's name. Hyben asked her what the matter was. She hesitated for a moment and then informed them that they had a guest from the Empire. Both Hyben and Asher were surprised. Hyben muttered in irritation, saying they had finally arrived and referring to them as a troublesome bunch. They stepped outside where the captain of the Imperial Knights greeted Hyben with respect. The knight reported that the Emperor had summoned him and requested that Hyben return to the capital. Hyben responded that he had expected the successor to the captain of the guard to arrive. The knight stuttered and replied that the captain of the guard was currently occupied with other matters. Hyben accepted the explanation and said he was planning to return anyway, but since it was already late, they would depart the next day. The knights thanked him and left. Hyben then turned to Rebarok and told him that it had been good to see him again after such a long time. Rebarok bid him farewell. Hyben called to Laika, catching her by surprise, and said that it had been a pleasure to meet her. He told her he was sure they would meet again one day, although he did not know what path she would ultimately choose. Laika thanked him. Later, under the full moon, Asher sat alone in his room. He had a dream, one drawn from his past life. In it, he was practicing with a sword when someone told him he had no talent, suggesting it might be better for him to find a different path. But he replied that he did it because he wanted to, and if he had intended to give up because of a lack of talent, he would have done so long ago. He told her to stop watching and to leave. Yet Lepenia, standing nearby, continued watching. She offered cold advice, saying he would achieve nothing, that his talent was pathetic and worthless. In her view, he would return to the world as nothing more than a third-rate swordsman. That would be his future. He woke up suddenly and sat upright in his bed, realizing it had been a dream, an unpleasant one from his past life. He muttered that it was disgusting. He remembered that Lepenia had been the youngest swordmaster and a true genius of the blade. She had once told him he would achieve nothing, but now, he wanted to show her. He had become a swordmaster in the end. More than that, he was now mentoring a child who might one day become her successor. He found it ironic and thought to himself that she had been wrong. Hyben appeared and asked him why he was still training at such a late hour. Asher replied that he had a nightmare and couldn't sleep. He asked Hyben why he was awake as well. Hyben answered that he would be leaving for the Empire at dawn. Hyben suggested that since they would not see each other for a while, they should spend some quality time together. He looked at Asher seriously and said that he had spent the past 20 years traveling the world, seeking contradictions and experiencing the changes of time. But after meeting Asher, he believed he had finally figured something out. Asher grew uneasy. He wondered what Hyben meant and sensed bloodlust emanating from him. Hyben gripped his sword and explained that he had come to realize how false his former beliefs had been. Asher stood his ground in silence. Then Hyben swung his sword at him. Asher still did not move. Hyben attacked, and his slash split the ground at Asher's sides, shattering it. The force of the strike slashed through 3 figures behind him. Realizing something was wrong, Asher quickly turned around and saw a swarm of demons being thrown back by the shock of Hyben's attack. Hyben calmly told him that this was the truth he had uncovered after 20 years of wandering. Asher looked down and saw the corpses of demons scattered across the ground. Hyben explained that these demons had been relentlessly pursuing him, lurking just behind him the entire time. Asher asked why they were there, insisting that such creatures should have been banished from the world by the heroes. Hyben admitted that while it was true the hero had defeated the Demon King, and the world believed that all dark beings, demons, monsters, had vanished, the truth he had experienced was different. The demons were still alive and actively hunting him. He suspected they were trying to eliminate him to keep the truth hidden. Hyben added that for now, their priority should be dealing with the immediate threat. Asher agreed. The demons charged forward screaming, and Asher swung his sword, killing the ones on his side instantly. When others attacked from behind, he quickly grabbed a different weapon, used the momentum of a backswing, and rolled through the group, slaying the demons surrounding him. While Asher fought, Hyben observed his movements. Even while fending off his own enemies, Hyben recognized the precision and skill of a seasoned veteran. He smiled, thinking that watching Asher was like watching his old friend. He acknowledged silently that this boy was no ordinary child. He had true talent, a genuine swordsmanship that surpassed even heroic techniques. Hyben unleashed his aura and slew several more demons in a single sweep. As he moved through them, he pondered what kind of swordsmanship Asher was using and what level of mastery it had reached. A moment later, all the demons had been defeated. When one of them still stirred, Hyben calmly stabbed it through the head, ending it. He explained that demonic beings had returned to the world. For a time, he even suspected that Asher himself might be a demonic entity, possibly a demon that had assumed the appearance of a child by consuming the memories of his deceased friend, Jinwoo. Asher asked if he meant a doppelganger. Hyben confirmed it, but added that no demon could mimic the swordsmanship of a human who had reached such a level of mastery. He was now convinced Asher was human, a boy who simply resembled his fallen friend. Hyben said he would return to the Empire to reveal the truth and warn them of the looming threat. He also mentioned that he intended to search for the missing hero. Before departing, he expressed hope that he and Asher would meet again one day for a proper conversation. Later, as the sun began to rise, Asher lay awake in bed, reflecting on what Hyben had said. He thought about the heroes and questioned whether the warrior had truly failed to defeat the Demon King. He recalled how, when the world was being consumed by fire and chaos, the warrior had arrived like a comet and pushed back the demonic tide. The warrior had been strong and radiant, like something out of a fairy tale. But just like Hyben, he had disappeared 20 years ago, abandoning the land and the people he had once ruled. Asher wondered where the warrior had gone and how peace had remained if the Demon King hadn't been defeated. Still, regardless of whether the truth was ever uncovered, his own duty remained unchanged. Whether or not he knew the full story, he would continue to wield his sword. That one conviction would never waver. As he stepped into the hallway, he encountered Luke, who looked exhausted and sleepless. But Luke smiled at him, eerily, and handed him a folded piece of paper. In another castle, the man stood before his leader and offered to handle the situation alone. He asked whether it was truly necessary for his superior to accompany him. The leader reminded him that Asher was the disciple of a swordmaster. The man dismissed the concern, calling Asher just a boy with no real talent, someone who only knew Imperial swordsmanship. But the leader corrected him, saying Asher was dangerous, different. He reminded the man that when their organization, Motorola, first emerged into the world, the one who brought it to the brink of destruction had also been a user of Imperial swordsmanship. That fact, he said, must not be forgotten. Still, the man took up his sword and replied that back then, their group had been weak. Things were different now. He swore that Asher would fall by his hand. As one who now carried the legacy of the hero, he would not be defeated by something as inferior as Imperial swordsmanship. The leader fell silent, deep in thought. Later, in the streets, Asher followed the instructions Luke had given him. Using the map drawn on the piece of paper, he made his way through the alleyways as directed. He chuckled, thinking that the situation was turning out to be quite interesting. Asher stopped when he reached the designated alleyway. He turned slightly and spoke aloud, addressing the people he sensed following him. A shadow shifted above. When he looked up, he saw 4 men floating above him. He recognized them immediately. They were members of Motorola. He calmly asked what business they had with someone as humble as himself. The other members were shocked to hear that Asher knew about them, and questioned how he could possibly recognize who they were. The leading man simply laughed, calling it interesting and admitting that he hadn't expected Asher to be aware of their identity. He then asked if the swordmaster had told him about them, but Asher calmly replied that he knew enough, because in his past life, he had fought against them as well. Back then, they had settled in this same territory, where he had discovered and destroyed their base entirely. The man teased him, claiming that Asher had come seeking his own grave. But Asher only smiled in return. He suddenly sensed someone behind him, quickly turned, and stabbed the man who had tried to sneak up on him. He remarked that, just like before, the past repeated itself. The same chatty scum, cut down again by Imperial swordsmanship. This surprised the man, who asked how Asher knew that style. Asher dismissed the question, stating that the reason didn't matter. His objective was clear, and only one thing needed to be done. Meanwhile, in the Imperial castle, Hyben arrived and was greeted by the Emperor. Hyben laughed, remarking that it had been over 20 years. He added that the Emperor used to seem clever back then, but now appeared to be just an old man burdened by reality. The Emperor noted that Hyben still lacked respect for the royal family. Haiban casually sat on the palace stairs and replied that, having walked the path of the sword, human authority meant little to him. Shifting topics, the emperor acknowledged that he had heard troubling rumors. The emperor asked if it was true that a rift had opened and demons had reappeared. Haiban confirmed it and explained that their top priority now was finding the missing hero. He requested the empire's cooperation. The emperor, however, apologized and explained that such assistance would be difficult. Haiban turned his head, puzzled, and asked what the emperor meant. The emperor explained that it was not the only problem. They were facing a laughable shortage of manpower, and the hero wasn't the only person who had disappeared. Haiban, clearly alarmed, asked him to clarify further. Back in the alleyway, the man told Asher that he found the situation fascinating. Under normal circumstances, he would have killed him already, but now he was curious. He demanded to know how Asher was aware of their past. Asher simply told the man to try him. Suddenly, another assassin appeared behind him, prepared to strike. Asher swiftly turned and cut him down with ease. Two others jumped toward him, and Asher hurled two daggers in opposite directions, killing both instantly. The man pretended to be amazed and mocked him, saying that his actions were the desperate struggle of a weak man using cheap tricks. Asher smiled to himself, thinking that the gauntlet had proven to be quite useful. The man continued, surprised at how thoroughly Asher had prepared. He hadn't realized Asher was using spatial magic to generate weapons on the spot. Drawing his own sword, the man declared that it was the end for Asher. A dark aura surrounded him. Asher recognized the technique. It was the swordsmanship of Motorola. He couldn't believe he was witnessing it again. He recalled that this style concealed its form, moved through shadows, and struck at vital points. The man pointed his sword at Asher, boasting about the greatness of his technique and warning that Asher would perish by it. The shadows surged around Asher, who immediately repositioned himself and focused. The first attack came from the front. He barely managed to block it. More shadows coiled around him, and he realized the technique was unconventional. The attack patterns were erratic, difficult to read. The man laughed as he launched strikes from hidden angles, blending into the shadows. One powerful attack forced Asher backward. He lost his grip on his sword while trying to stay upright. The man stepped forward, blade at Asher's throat, calling him a stubborn fool and telling him to die quietly. Asher, unfazed, complimented the man on his skill, acknowledging that the technique was difficult to master. The man proudly stated that he was one of the 13 honored seats, recognized by the master of Motorola. But Asher scoffed. He called it pathetic that they still clung to such titles and asked why Motorola was targeting him. The man refused to answer, saying assassins never revealed their reasons to their targets. Asher smirked and told him that he was going to die anyway, so he might as well grant a dying man his last wish. The man dismissed it, stating that they had come specifically to kill him. When Asher asked why, the man said it was decreed by the Oracle. That name made Asher freeze. He realized that he had been marked by the Oracle. The man confirmed it and asked if that answer was sufficient. Asher said it was more than enough. But before the man could react, a spear pierced his chest. Bleeding and in shock, the man stuttered, asking what had just happened. Asher calmly responded by asking what else it could be, calling it a cheap trick. Meanwhile, in Luke's room at Arak Castle, candlelight flickered as he poured himself wine and laughed gleefully. He thought that by now, Asher must be dead. The thorn in his side had finally been removed. He congratulated himself, thinking that no matter how skilled Asher was, the enemies he faced were on an entirely different level. But a voice interrupted, saying that he was there. Luke turned toward the sound, confused. His wine glass slipped from his hand, crashing to the ground. He stumbled backward, shaking in terror as he looked toward the door. Asher stood there, holding his sword and staring at him with cold determination. Without emotion, he told Luke that they needed to have a word. Luke asked why Asher was there, but Asher merely asked him what he meant by that, pointing out that it sounded as if Luke believed he shouldn't be there. Luke stared at him, unsure whether Asher had truly defeated the members of Motorola and if he had discovered that Luke was the one behind the assassination attempt. As Asher stepped closer, Luke shouted at him with a trembling voice not to come any nearer. He asked how Asher dared to enter the private quarters of a noble. Without hesitation, Asher raised his sword and swung it, but the blade only slashed into the wall just beside Luke's head. Asher addressed him as young master, and told him that up until now, he had overlooked his actions lightly. But this time, Luke had gone too far. Luke, trembling, begs for mercy. Asher looked at him seriously, and told him he hoped he would never disturb his peace again with such disgraceful behavior. Pulling his sword from the wall, Asher turned to leave. Before exiting, he added that this would be the last time he dealt with him. He hoped they wouldn't cross paths again, for the sake of avoiding further unpleasantness. Glancing back, Asher gave one final warning. Then, without another word, he left, leaving Luke frozen in fear, crying and trembling on the floor, unable to move. Meanwhile, at Motorola Castle, a man who had managed to escape reported their failure to the leader. The leader, unfazed, admitted he had expected it. He noted that once again they had been defeated by Imperial swordsmanship, just like before. It unsettled him. The more he thought about it, the more he questioned who that child really was. Then, a woman appeared unexpectedly, laughing as she stepped forward, surprising the leader. She asked mockingly if he truly believed there was a connection between the child and the former captain of the guard simply because the child used Imperial swordsmanship. She then taunted him, remarking how pathetic it was that the renowned Motorola could not handle a single child. The leader defended their failure, stating that their past experiences with Imperial swordsmanship had never ended well, but the woman dismissed his excuses. She said the failure was due to a lack of skill, not some mystical power, and announced that she would deal with the child herself. Releasing a divine energy from her hand, she vowed that she would kill Asher with the mighty power of the god Marwena. Outside the Arak castle, citizens gathered in the streets, confused by the commotion in the middle of the night. One of them shared a rumor that an assassin had attempted to threaten young Master Luke and infiltrated the village. Another asked who had defeated the assassins, and someone replied that it was Asher. The crowd was stunned. They had long seen Asher as nothing more than a troublemaker. Then someone remembered that Asher had recently been accepted as a disciple by the Swordmaster. Whispers of disbelief turned into intrigue, as many wondered how someone like that could have changed so drastically. Karen stood nearby, silently observing and listening to the murmurs. Later, inside the castle, Rebarok could not believe that Motorola had reappeared. He told Caron that they were a notorious group of assassins, and now they were active within his territory. Caron remarked that the entire village could have been wiped out. Rebarok, frustrated, shouted that Luke had caused an enormous problem. Rebarok asked where Luke was now, and Karen reported that Luke had not left his room. Rebarok agreed, stating that someone destined to become the next lord must reflect on having endangered his own people. He then asked Caron about the current atmosphere in the village. Karen responded that fortunately the situation had calmed and things were stabilizing. He added that people's perception of Asher seemed to be improving. Rebarok acknowledged that they owed their gratitude to Asher. Still, Karen confessed his lingering curiosity about Asher's true identity. He questioned whether a person's personality could truly change so drastically and how he had become so powerful. Rebarok reminded him that Haiban had assured them Asher was not a demon. But even so, Asher remained a dangerous individual. If Asher ever turned his power against them, he could destroy the Arak territory easily. Yet, despite all that, Asher had fought for them and saved the village. That fact couldn't be ignored. Rebarok then said that an opportunity to learn the truth had presented itself. He unrolled a scroll and told Caron they would observe how Asher reacted to it. Caron, confused, asked what he meant, but Rebarok remained silent, thinking that while the opportunity had come unexpectedly, it could prove useful. Elsewhere, in his room, Asher cleaned the blood from his sword. His thoughts lingered on Motorola. He remembered demanding the truth from the last assassin. He had asked why their god wanted him dead. The man had replied that they didn't know the reason, they only followed divine orders. The oracle had decreed his death, and the assassins had acted once they confirmed his presence in the village. The man had revealed that they had used Luke to establish a foothold in the area. That was the extent of the information. Desperately, the man had asked if Asher would spare him for telling the truth, but Asher had simply raised his sword and coldly reminded him that he never said he would. Asher now pondered their greater intentions. The name Marwena surfaced in his thoughts. He remembered that Motorola was a cult devoted to the god Marwena. Their leaders, the ones who held the honored seats, were granted immense power through the god's blessing. They had expanded their reach through divine influence. He had defeated them once before, but now they had returned, and with them, a new mission to kill him. The implication was clear. If they were targeting him again, it meant their god was aware that he had been reincarnated. Asher then thought of the Sword's Gate and resolved to travel to the capital. Someone there might know the secret behind his reincarnation. Suddenly, a knock came at his door. When he opened it, he found Laika standing there, her expression somber. He asked what was wrong. She quietly replied that she had just received a proposal for an arranged marriage. The news caught him completely off guard. Before that, in Rebarok's office, Laika shouted at her father, asking if he had truly said she was to be part of an arranged marriage. She cried out that she didn't want to go through with it and that she wasn't ready to get married. Rebarok responded that he understood how she felt, but insisted there was no choice. He reminded her that she already knew who the other party was, and urged her to at least meet him first, saying that he might be a good person. Back in Asher's room, Laika told him bitterly that this was nothing more than being sold off to a prestigious family, no matter what anyone said. Asher noted that the other party must be quite powerful. She confirmed that it was the Count of Bellaturia, which surprised him. He wondered if the Bellaturia family was truly arranging a marriage. He recalled that Valbaka Bellaturia was one of the past heroes and the current lord of Bellaturia. In his previous life, he had known Valbaka, who, while not particularly exceptional in power or skill, had been a virtuous man. Valbaka ruled his territory with compassion and was praised by his people as a hero. Asher asked if Valbaka himself was proposing marriage, but Laika quickly clarified, shouting that it was not Valbaka, but his son. She expressed her disgust, saying the thought of marrying someone over 50 was disturbing. Asher agreed. It was likely that Valbaka was quite old by now, but he wondered why Valbaka's son would be involved in an arranged marriage. He remembered meeting Valbaka's son, Boros, in his past life, during a visit to Bellaturia. He had told Valbaka that he had a valiant son and mentioned that he'd heard rumors of potential marriage alliances being discussed among noble families. Valbaka had responded that he intended to let his son marry someone he loved, whether noble or commoner. That moment confirmed to Asher that Valbaka was not a typical aristocrat. He was humble and sincere. The fact that even someone like Valbaka was now engaging in noble politics made him wonder just how much pressure the world could place on a man. Laika then told Asher she had heard he single-handedly wiped out the assassin organization that had invaded their territory, and she admitted she wished she could be as strong as him. But now, she said, she couldn't even hold a sword. Asher responded that she was truly talented and it was a shame to see her give it all up. She looked at him with a mix of sadness and hope and asked if he truly meant what he said. Then she asked him for one last favor. Confused, he asked what it was. A moment later, he stood with a wooden sword in his hand, asking if she was requesting a final duel. Laika shouted yes. She declared that, since she would no longer be able to wield a sword, she wanted one last battle. She pointed her wooden sword at him and told him not to hold back. He smiled at her determination. She charged forward, launching her attack, yelling for him to come at her with all his strength. Moments later, her sword clattered to the ground. Gasping for air, she admitted she couldn't go on. She looked up and saw someone standing above her. It was her mother, Benisia, watching with sadness. Benisia took her hand and began to cry. Laika, surprised, asked why her mother was more upset than she was. After all, Benisia had also gone through an arranged marriage and seemed to have turned out fine. Benisia gently explained that she and Rebarok had known each other beforehand. Laika, on the other hand, had never even met the person she was supposed to marry. Still, Benisia reassured her, saying that they were a family descended from heroes. She believed nothing would go wrong and forming a tie with them would be a beneficial alliance. Then, Benisia turned to Asher and asked him for a favor. He asked what she needed. Benisia requested that he accompany Laika when she traveled to Belaturia to introduce herself. He was surprised and asked why him. She answered that Laika would need someone to talk to in a foreign place, and that, of everyone, he was the closest to her. Asher agreed. He had been wanting to see Valbaka again anyway, curious about how much the man had changed. A few days later, they left the castle in a carriage. Inside, Laika stared at them, wondering aloud why her father had sent Karen with them. Both men remained silent. She asked again, suspicious about why her father would assign someone they weren't comfortable with. Karen stated that he was simply following the Lord's orders. In truth, Rebarok's instructions to Karen had been different. Rebarok had told him to keep a close eye on Asher, believing it was possible that Asher's true goal had always been Laika. He suspected Asher might be concealing deeper motives. Rebarok argued that someone like Asher, who had always been treated with disdain by the territory, wouldn't risk his life for it without some hidden agenda. He added that the only person who genuinely acknowledged Asher was Laika, and if she were to leave, Asher's true hostility might begin to show. He ordered Karen to observe Asher's actions and uncover his real intentions. Karen believed it was nothing more than a scheme to win Laika's affection, and he remained convinced that Asher was a despicable man. He vowed to cut Asher down immediately if he made any wrong move toward her. Laika then called Karen's name, breaking his concentration. Irritated, he asked why. She simply asked how much longer it would take to reach their destination, and guessed they must be close. Karen replied that they were entering Count Bellaturia's territory, and should arrive in about half a day. She was surprised that the land was so close, considering how little interaction they had with its people. Karen explained that Bellaturia had been isolated from the outside world for the past 20 years. When she asked why, he admitted they didn't know. He also found it strange that they had suddenly proposed an arranged marriage after so much silence. She brushed it off as nothing but still questioned why Valbaka was called a hero. Karen answered that Valbaka was seen more as a saint, far from a typical noble. Valbaka had been born into a prestigious noble house but chose a different path after witnessing the world's harsh realities during his travels. He gave up his luxurious lifestyle and instead became a lord who cared for the sick and poor. He dismantled his castle, sold all his treasures, and used the money to feed the hungry. He imposed only minimal taxes and even took up farming himself. Because of this, the people respected him deeply and honored him as a true hero. She remarked that it must have taken immense strength for a noble to live like that, and Valbaka truly seemed remarkable. Caron agreed, adding that Bellaturia had become a peaceful haven with kind people, a land often described as a paradise, one where murder and banditry were unheard of. Just as the words left his mouth, someone suddenly shouted from outside, "Bandits!" A servant stuttered while reporting to Caron that a group of bandits had appeared. Karen, stunned, couldn't believe it. Laika turned to him and reminded him of his earlier words, questioning his confidence. Outside, men with glowing red eyes approached, with murderous intent. Karen told them to stay inside the carriage, stating that he would handle the situation. Drawing his sword, he prepared to act, but Laika stood up and shouted for him to wait. She insisted on coming with him, yet Asher intervened and told her to stay. She asked him why, reminding him that she wasn't so weak that she couldn't deal with a few thieves. He explained that it wasn't about physical strength but mental preparedness. He reminded her that she hadn't yet killed anyone, and that alone made a difference. That startled her. Asher stepped out of the carriage, assuring her that he and Karen would handle the matter. At the same time, he wondered if Motorolia's men had somehow made their way there. As he got closer to the attackers, he saw the figures in front of them wielding various weapons and braced himself for combat. But when he moved in for a better look, he was shocked. The so-called thieves were nothing more than poor villagers. The villagers trembled, speaking with desperation as they asked for money and food. Their voices cracked with fear. Asher questioned whether they were really thieves at all. Karen raised his sword and shouted for them to step back, identifying the carriage as belonging to Lord Halbaruk of Arak. He warned that if they approached any further, he would cut them down. Asher calmly told Karen to stand down. He explained that they didn't appear to be thieves but rather starving peasants, desperate and on the brink. Karen was stunned. Asher reached into his bag and told Karan that these people had no intention of running. Whether they died by the sword or from starvation, to them, it made no difference. He tossed his bag to the peasants and told them to take the money and use it for food or whatever they needed. The villagers opened the bag and were stunned to see gold coins inside. Without hesitation, they scattered with gratitude, thanking him as they fled. Karan reminded him that it was his own money. Asher simply replied that it was fine. He had no immediate need for it. Watching the direction in which the villagers ran, he told Karen that they appeared to be coming from Belaturia territory. Karen was left speechless. Just then, Laika rushed toward them and asked what had happened. Asher replied that the situation had been resolved. He added that the peasants had been raiders heading into Belaturia. As they continued their journey, entering Belaturia's borders, Laika spoke out, expressing her frustration. Thieves had entered the Count's territory. Assassins had invaded their own. It seemed the world was growing more dangerous by the day. She angrily asked how such disturbances could happen in a place supposedly known for peace, but both Asher and Karen remained silent. Asher, however, was eager to meet Valbaka and find out what had happened. Soon, they reached Belaturia and were stunned by the sight of a massive castle. Laika turned to Karen and remarked on the castle's size, noting that it was much grander than expected. Karen was equally shocked, thinking it impossible. Valbaka had once dismantled his castle to avoid luxury. Laika questioned whether Karen hadn't said that Valbaka lived frugally. Suddenly, a man approached with guards and welcomed them to Belaturia. He asked if she was Laika Halbaruk, then introduced himself as Boros Belaturia, greeting her with respect. She asked if he was her fiancé, and he replied that he was, but clarified that it wasn't his idea. His father had pushed him into it, which surprised everyone. They returned to the carriage to head to the castle. Along the way, Asher noticed the condition of the civilians on the roadside. They looked impoverished and burdened. The area, once clean and lively, now resembled a slum. The villagers, once happy, now looked depressed and lifeless. Laika, shocked by what she saw, turned to Boros. He explained that the village had fallen into a poor state recently. A string of murders had taken place, and he warned her not to make eye contact with the villagers. Both Laika and Karan were alarmed by the news. Later at the castle's dining hall, Laika burst out in frustration. She exclaimed that this wasn't a paradise free of murderers or thieves, it had become a slum, a haven for criminals. She pointed at the lavish feast before them, noting how the people outside were starving and emaciated. She was too upset to eat. Karen added that this no longer resembled the Belaturia he had once known. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Boros entered and asked if they had finished their meal, informing them that his father now wished to see Laika. She stood and replied that she was ready. Karen tried to ask Boros something, but Boros cut him off. He said he knew what Karen was going to ask and confirmed it. He asked if Karen meant to ask why the Belaturia they once knew was now so unrecognizable. Boros, visibly bitter, stated that they shouldn't expect too much. His father, he said, had become a monster. A moment later, they were led into the audience chamber to meet Valbaka. What they saw stunned them. He was enormous, draped in gold and surrounded by opulence. Laika greeted Valbaka respectfully, but he casually drank his alcohol and asked if she was from Arak, remarking that it must have been hard to come from such a backwater place. Then Valbaka contradicted himself and said it was an honor to be visited by a member of a hero's family. He burst into laughter, making Karen think that Valbaka had become incredibly rude. Asher silently studied him. Compared to the man he remembered from his past life, Valbaka had become vulgar and unrecognizable. Valbaka turned to Laika, looking her over carefully. He asked for her name. She hesitantly replied that she was Laika Halbaruk. Valbaka licked his lips, repeating her name slowly, making Laika flinch in disgust. Valbaka then erupted into laughter again, saying that her name was pretty. A moment later, Laika angrily asked Boros what he had just said and whether he truly wanted her to sleep in Valbaka's room. She shook her head in disbelief, questioning how she could possibly sleep in the Lord's personal quarters. She insisted she would rather stay with Asher and Karen. Boros replied that there was no need for her to feel burdened. His father had specifically requested that she be accommodated there. He wished her a good rest, but Laika felt disgusted and unsettled. In her thoughts, she wondered what Valbaka was plotting behind that sinister smile of his. Meanwhile, Boros returned to Valbaka, who lounged in decadence with two women beside him. Valbaka asked his son if he had placed Laika in his room. Boros reluctantly confirmed that he had. Valbaka, swirling his wine, called Boros his son and asked if he remembered what he used to tell him when he was young. Boros trembled and replied through clenched teeth that he did. Valbaka reminded him that he used to say a man should marry someone he loves. But since Boros had failed to find a suitable bride, he had arranged a match with that girl from the Arak territory. However, after seeing Laika, Valbaka decided she would be better suited as his own bride. He was planning to take her as a concubine, believing the arrangement worked out well. Boros, stunned, asked what he was talking about. Valbaka calmly repeated himself. He was planning to make Laika his concubine. Elsewhere, in the guest room, Karen sat at a table, disappointment weighing heavily on him. He wondered how a once great lord could have fallen so far. The Valbaka Belaturia he remembered had been endlessly gentle and humble. The Belaturia territory had once been a beautiful, lively village. Now Valbaka was arrogant and greedy, drowning in alcohol and pleasure, while his starving villagers turned to raiding. Karen questioned whether this was even the same man at all. Suddenly, someone knocked at the door. Boros entered, excusing himself. He said he had something important to share. Karen, already on edge, was stunned as Boros explained. Upon hearing Boros's words, Karen smashed the table in fury. He demanded to know if Boros had just said that Valbaka intended to marry Laika. Boros confirmed it calmly and explained that his own engagement with Laika had been called off. His father would marry her instead. Karen trembled with rage. He rushed past Boros, who asked where he was going. Karen, visibly shaking, replied that he was going to retrieve Laika. He refused to sit idly by and watch her be exploited. Asher tried to stop him, but Boros told him to let it be. He said Karen was truly a loyal knight. Boros added that he understood how everyone felt. He suspected none of them had wanted the arranged marriage to begin with. He had heard that Laika was quite talented in swordsmanship, and perhaps they had wished for her to walk that path instead. Asher was surprised and asked how Boros knew that. Boros explained that he operated an intelligence network and was well informed about the Arak territory. He said Valbaka had cut off all external communication to hide the affairs of the territory. That was why he had to rely on underground sources. He also knew that Rebarok hadn't arranged the marriage to elevate his own status. After all, his family was already powerful. The truth was that Rebarok likely couldn't refuse the offer, even in a world without heroes. Boros continued, stating that Valbaka had ordered Laika to stay in his quarters, but it made him uneasy. So he secretly arranged for her to stay in the annex instead. He left the back door open, and once dawn broke, they were to take Laika and leave the territory. Boros would try to reason with his father. Asher, looking at him seriously, asked what had happened to Belaturia over the past years. Boros replied that about 20 years ago, Valbaka began to change. He started harshly extorting grain, livestock, and money from the villagers to build his new castle, exploiting them without remorse. Outside, people were starving, groaning in agony, but Valbaka ignored them, lost in pleasure and indulgence. Asher asked how a man once called a saint, who had loved his people, could fall so far. Boros stared at him and asked what he meant by saint. In the past, Valbaka had always told him to be with someone he loved. 5 years ago, Boros fell in love with a commoner and brought her to his father. She was kind and decent, but the next day, she was dead, executed for daring to harbor desire toward a noble. Valbaka had ordered her death. Boros trembled with rage and asked if such a thing could ever be done by a saint. Asher responded by addressing him as Boros Belaturia. He said he was the rightful master of the land, and because of that, Asher placed his trust in him and would offer him his loyalty. Boros was stunned and turned to ask how Asher knew those words, but Asher had already vanished. Minutes later, in the throne room, Valbaka continued drinking and laughing. He muttered that he might as well head to Laika's room, but Asher suddenly appeared and took the wine glass from his hand. Valbaka, startled, asked who he was. Asher calmly examined the wine and remarked that it was Behemonia, from the year 43. He recalled that Valbaka used to rarely drink, especially not such expensive wines. Even when offered, he would decline them, calling them indulgent luxuries. Valbaka stared at him, confused, and asked if he even understood where he was. Asher looked him in the eye and called him by name. Then, with cold precision, he ordered him to recite the oath of Belaturia. Valbaka laughed nervously, asking what nonsense he was speaking. But that was enough for Asher. He realized with certainty that the grotesque man seated on Belaturia's throne was no longer Valbaka. Without hesitation, he raised his dagger and brought it down in a flash. Valbaka sat stunned, unable to react, then blood sprayed across the room. Outside the castle, Laika was being pulled along by Karen. She demanded to know where they were going, but Karen simply shouted that they needed to get out immediately. He told her that Valbaka was no hero, and that the greedy lord harbored lustful intentions toward her. Laika was stunned, and asked if he truly meant what he said. If Valbaka really had such intentions. They soon reached the carriage, and Caron hurriedly placed her inside, instructing her to stay put. Laika, still reeling, asked what about Asher. Karen was about to answer when an alarm suddenly echoed through the castle. The knights began shouting, reporting that there was an intruder and that Lord Valbaka had been attacked. Laika turned to Karen in panic, asking what was happening. Karen stood frozen, unsure how to respond, but in the back of his mind he feared the worst, that it could be Asher. Inside the castle, Boros rushed through the halls, flanked by guards. He demanded to know what was happening. One of the guards reported that Valbaka's scream had been heard coming from the audience chamber. Without hesitation, Boros sprinted toward the chamber. Upon entering, he froze in horror. His father lay on the ground in a pool of blood. Beside him stood Asher, calm and composed. Boros, trembling, called out to his father, but Asher turned to him and said it was not his father lying there. It was a being that had infiltrated a human body, mimicking its appearance. Asher then revealed the truth to everyone. It was a demon. The guards moved protectively in front of Boros, shocked and unable to process what they were hearing. He asked Asher if he was really accusing his father of being a doppelganger and insisted that Asher was mistaken. Boros asked if Asher truly believed he was such a fool that he couldn't tell a demon from a human. He argued that if Valbaka were truly a doppelganger, he would have no memories of his past. He wouldn't recognize his own son or recall their shared history. Yet Valbaka remembered everything, including what he had once told him. That, to Boros, meant only one thing. Valbaka's personality had changed, not his identity. As monstrous as he had become, Boros still hoped his father would change one day. Then, in fury, Boros demanded to know what right Asher had to kill his father. He called for the guards to seize him. The guards moved in, but suddenly, unsettling laughter filled the room. To everyone's horror, Valbaka's body began to twitch. His eyes snapped open and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. In a deep, inhuman voice, the creature mocked them, announcing that it had been found out. With a grotesque display, the demon burst from Valbaka's corpse, its true form twisting free as it laughed maniacally. The guards stepped back in disbelief, unable to comprehend the sight of a real monster before them. Boros fell to his knees, staring in shock, unable to process that his father had indeed been a doppelganger. The demon sneered and referred to them as wretched humans. Karen, racing through the castle toward the audience chamber, heard screams ahead. He turned the corner just in time to see several guards thrown violently into the hallway. He rushed in and froze. Before him stood a demon. The creature sneered and turned its gaze to Boros, mockingly asking what was wrong and calling him its lovely son. Boros, horrified, called the creature a beast and asked if it had eaten his father. The doppelganger grinned and confessed that it had been great fun. Killing Boros's beloved father, murdering his fiancée, and that it had even planned to slowly torment and kill Laika too. Boros was paralyzed by fear, unable to move. Karen lunged forward and shoved Boros aside, shouting for him to run. He raised his sword and attacked the doppelganger. The demon grabbed his blade mid-swing and complimented Karen's strength with twisted amusement. Karen gritted his teeth and tried to wrench the sword free, repeatedly slashing and attacking, but every strike was deflected with ease. The demon teased him, saying he was impressive, but it was time to end the game. It raised its clawed hand and slashed at them with brutal force, shouting that it didn't have time to play with weaklings. Both Karen and Boros were thrown into the wall with tremendous impact and collapsed. The doppelganger turned back to Asher and grinned. It said he had done well to see through the disguise. Asher stood calmly, explaining that the oath of Belaturia was always carried in Valbaka's heart, and then recited it. He reminded the demon that the oath was Valbaka's vow to his people. It was more than words, it was his identity, his soul. How could anyone who didn't even know that claim to be Valbaka? The demon laughed, admitting that it hadn't expected something like that. In order to fully inhabit Valbaka's identity, it had read through all his journals and committed them to memory. It had taken great care to play the part thoroughly, unlike past failures where its cover was easily blown. It grabbed Asher's head and whispered that it was just like the time its entire clan had been exterminated when their true identities were revealed. For over 20 years, no one had discovered its secret. Until now. The demon glared into his eyes and asked who he really was. Asher replied quietly that he was Imperial swordsmanship. The demon stared at him, confused. Asher reminded it of what it had just said, that its clan was annihilated by a human who used Imperial swordsmanship. Back then, it believed all of them had been killed. But one had survived. The demon stammered, asking if he was that person. Before it could speak again, Asher drove his sword through its open mouth, silencing its scream with steel. The demon writhed in agony, and Asher calmly whispered that it had been a long time since they last saw each other. A moment later, Boros slowly regained consciousness. Asher approached him and asked if he was awake. When Boros looked up, he saw Asher calmly checking if he was all right. Still shaken, Boros reminded him of the doppelganger. Asher gestured to the demon's corpse on the floor and explained that he had taken advantage of its moment of vulnerability to launch a surprise attack. He believed the demon had come seeking revenge, likely for being hunted in the past. But Boros remained quiet, staring at him, wondering how he could know such things. Suddenly, Laika's voice rang out as she ran into the chamber, calling for help. She shouted at the guards to assist her because Karen was injured. The guards rushed to respond, while others helped Boros, asking if he was hurt. Boros assured them he was fine and immediately ordered them to tend to the wounded, including the knight from the Arak territory. The next day, Asher stood in front of Valbaka's tombstone and placed a small bouquet of flowers before it. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Boros approaching. Boros said he had the tombstone erected as a way to honor his father's memory, even if it was long overdue. Asher acknowledged the gesture and told Boros he must be heartbroken. But Boros replied that it was all right, and in truth he was certain his father was more devastated than any of them, for failing to be recognized by his own son and for having a demon live in his place. Boros thanked him sincerely, acknowledging that the territory had been saved because of him. Asher then asked what would happen to Belaturia now. Boros replied that he would take full responsibility moving forward. His first task was to rebuild the lives of those who had suffered under the demon's rule. Though he admitted he may not be as great a lord as his father once was, he promised to do his best. Asher quietly remembered the real Valbaka's words from long ago. How he always said that his existence was thanks to the people, that he was not born to rule them, but to serve them. Valbaka had always kept one phrase close to his heart, the Oath of Belaturia. Boros, as if reading his thoughts, asked about that oath. He pointed out that it was something only Valbaka ever said to his family or closest friends. He asked Asher how he had known it, and how he could have known the demon's weakness. In that moment, Asher realized that Boros too had begun to suspect him. Meanwhile, inside the Lord's castle, Karan was reporting to Laika. He explained that it had been a demon, a doppelganger, that had taken over Valbaka's body and pretended to be him. Valbaka had been a victim. Laika processed the truth and realized that Valbaka hadn't become corrupt after all. Karan added that the arranged marriage had likely been part of the demon's manipulative scheme, designed with sinister intent. Laika told Karen not to worry. The engagement had been officially cancelled. Karen asked if that was true, and she confirmed it. Boros had said the engagement was something the demon forced, ignoring his own will. She then told Karen they would leave as soon as he had recovered. Back at the tomb, Boros nodded after learning that Asher was a disciple of Swordmaster Haiban. Suddenly, everything made sense. Haiban had been a close friend of his father, and if Asher was his disciple, it was likely Haiban had shared many things with him. Boros realized that claiming to be Haiban's student naturally earned others' trust. He knelt before Asher and told him that a man of such greatness had saved Belaturia. Asher couldn't help but feel a little amused at the sight of a noble kneeling before a commoner. Boros then stood and swore that if there was anything Asher needed or desired, he would do his best to fulfill it, on the name of Belaturia itself. Asher smiled, thinking that Boros had inherited much of his father's humility. He felt confident that Boros would grow into a great lord. Days later, they returned to the Arak territory. Karan stood before Rebarok, reporting everything that had happened. Rebarok asked if this was what Haiban had been referring to. Karan, curious, asked what Haiban had said, and Rebarok replied that the Swordmaster had warned them of a new crisis in the world. Rebarok then reflected on the recent events. First Motorola, and now demons. He confessed he was worried about what might come next. He told Karan they must remain vigilant, to which Karan agreed. Rebarok added that thanks to Asher they had overcome multiple crises, and perhaps it was time to reevaluate their judgment of him. He even went as far as to say that Asher might be something of a hero himself. He concluded that perhaps they no longer needed to be suspicious of him. What they didn't know was that Asher was standing just outside the door, listening. He walked away silently, reflecting on Rebarok's change of heart. He admitted to himself that it was only natural for them to have doubted him. After all, he had lost his memory and changed overnight. Anyone would have suspected him of being a demon. He paused by a window gazing outside and hoped that they no longer saw him as an enemy. He had no interest in Rebarok's territory and didn't plan on staying there for long. He had his own mission to carry out. Turning his head slightly, he called out, telling someone to show themselves. From the shadows, a man laughed and stepped into view. The stranger mockingly called him an arrogant brat and said he had heard plenty about him, about the one who was now known as the disciple of the Swordmaster. When Belaturia was being isolated by the doppelganger, Boros had secretly employed the intelligence organization to maintain external communication. Before leaving Belaturia's territory, Asher approached Boros and inquired about the intelligence group. He requested that Boros grant him the authority to employ them. Boros assumed he no longer needed the organization, but asked why he was requesting it. Asher responded that it was for personal reasons. Boros nodded, remarking that there was likely a deeper meaning behind his decision, and agreed to transfer the organization under his command. Soon after, the head of the intelligence organization introduced himself as Caius. Asher introduced himself in return as the new employer. Caius responded that he was already aware. He then commented that he was impressed by what Asher had done, stating that killing a doppelganger in a single swift move was quite terrifying. Asher admitted he hadn't noticed Caius's presence during the incident, to which Caius proudly replied that infiltration skills were a basic necessity in their line of work. Caius noted that the doppelganger had seemed to recognize Asher, which made him flinch. Observing the reaction, Caius casually remarked on his keen perception and asked what Asher was hoping to uncover by employing the organization, sarcastically suggesting it better not be for something trivial like finding a lost puppy. Asher informed Caius that he wanted to find the locations of the heroes, which shocked Caius. He asked for confirmation, questioning whether Asher truly meant the heroes. Asher clarified that he wanted to learn if any past heroes had disappeared or been corrupted. He explained that both Haiban and Valbaka had vanished around 20 years ago, with Valbaka's body eventually taken over by a doppelganger and Haiban hunted by demons. With the reappearance of demons now threatening the world, Asher wanted to understand what had happened to the others, especially the one who had defeated the Demon King and forced the demons to retreat from the world. He ordered Caius to focus on locating the champion. Caius hesitated and stammered, admitting that he never expected to be asked to find something like that. Asher challenged him, asking if the request was too difficult for a small intelligence organization. Offended, Caius snapped back, shouting that there was no information they couldn't find. Asher then asked if that meant it was possible. Caius proudly confirmed that it was, leaping into the air with excitement and shouting that Asher would just have to wait and see. As he left, Caius referred to him as a damn new boss, while Asher simply noted that Caius seemed to follow orders well. A few minutes later, Caius sat atop a building, realizing he had accepted Asher's request purely out of pride. He wondered how he was supposed to track down such vague and obscure information. Eventually, he figured the best place to begin was the capital. Just then, he noticed footsteps below and saw Asher walking through the street, silently labeling him an arrogant brat. Thinking again about the whereabouts of the other heroes, Caius admitted to himself that Asher's request was unusual. He chuckled, considering the young employer an interesting person, then jumped from rooftop to rooftop to begin his mission, thinking that things might get entertaining from now on. Meanwhile, in a forest, a group of men sat talking inside a carriage. They discussed the reopening of Bellaturia's territorial borders, which had been closed off for decades. One man laughed, saying it was good news for merchants like them and that they would now have a new area to trade with. Another man asked why Bellaturia had remained closed for so long, mentioning a rumor that demons were the cause. An older man scoffed at the idea, insisting it was nonsense, as demons had all been killed 50 years ago. The younger man asked the old one if he had lived through the war and what demons looked like, since they had never seen one. The old man described them as massive, monstrous beings that caused countless deaths. He added that he had nearly been crushed to death while fleeing with his mother, but someone had appeared just in time to slay the demon near them. He explained that heroes had emerged to save them, and though he had only been a child, he remembered the sight vividly. He told the others that they should be grateful to the heroes, as their actions had led to a world free of demons and war, though none of them noticed the monsters lurking in the trees above. Suddenly, the monsters leapt down toward the carriage, just as the old man was dismissing the demon rumors as nonsense. One of the men sitting opposite the other shouted in panic, asking what it was. When they turned to look, they were already being attacked by the monstrous creatures. Elsewhere in Arak's territory, Asher was walking toward the training grounds, reflecting on the return of beings that once posed a grave threat to humanity. He wondered whether a new danger would soon appear. He then heard the sound of a sword being swung and paused to see Laika training diligently. He stopped to watch her for a moment before calling out, prompting her to halt and explain why she was still practicing. She said that with rumors of demons spreading, everyone was on edge and she couldn't afford to remain idle. She added that demons were something she had only read about in books, but now she knew they were real. Asher agreed, acknowledging that the people of the current era knew very little about demons and would need better preparation. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of someone outside begging for help. Both turned in alarm and rushed toward the gate. There, the guard was trying to get answers from a bleeding man. Asher and Laika arrived as the man struggled to speak. Laika, clearly worried, asked what had happened. The guard explained that the man was a villager who had been returning to their territory. The man then trembled as he begged them for help, explaining that monsters had attacked their carriage in the forest. Everyone present was shocked, but none more than Asher, who immediately began to wonder if the attackers were demons. They immediately rushed out of the territory and headed toward the forest. Just a short distance ahead, Laika spotted the damaged carriage, and visibly worried, questioned what had happened. The carriage had collapsed, the horse was down, and several men lay on the ground, severely injured. The guards quickly moved to help the merchant and asked whether the attack had been carried out by bandits. As they began searching the area and tending to the wounded, Asher remained still, staring at the ground. He already suspected it wasn't the work of ordinary bandits. His eyes focused on the small footprints and fragments of crude weapons scattered nearby. He then heard Laika's voice as she asked someone if they were all right. An elderly man coughed up blood and through strained breaths managed to speak. Laika shouted for the guards to assist the man and they rushed to help her. But she was taken aback when the old man mentioned that goblins had appeared. The word confused everyone present and they asked what a goblin was. Asher, however, had expected them to show up eventually. He already understood that monsters were non-human creatures of various species, threatening beings that had once attacked humanity in the past. Just like the demons, these monsters had vanished from the world, making him wonder how they had now returned. Later in the clinic, the old man explained that they were part of a caravan returning from a neighboring territory when the goblins suddenly emerged from the forest, attacked their wagon, and stole their goods. Laika asked him what the goblins looked like, and he described them as small monsters with green skin and pointed ears. The old man was about to elaborate further, but Asher interrupted, noting that such monsters had once existed during the old man's youth and disappeared 50 years ago, along with the demons. The old man affirmed that he knew about monsters, and Asher explained that he had only read about them in history books. The old man continued, stating that since the end of the war, there hadn't been a single sighting of monsters, which left them all wondering where the goblins had suddenly come from. Asher recalled that, 50 years ago, The Demon King had been slain by the champion, and all other dangerous beings were eradicated by the heroes. The passage to the demon realm had been sealed, dragons hunted to extinction, and monsters driven far from human territories. Those that remained had been pushed into the northern lands, ruled by Lapinia, the hero known as the Queen of the North Sea. In her domain, northern monsters were said to live under her rule in peace, maintaining harmony without hostility toward humans. Now, however, monsters seemed to have broken through the northern boundary and were attacking humans again. This made Asher wonder whether Lapinia had vanished, and if the northern lands had fallen into lawlessness. Laika then asked the old man if he knew how to fight goblins, since he had seen them before. The old man replied that he had been too young at the time to understand anything and that the adults had done all the fighting. He added that it had been so long ago that probably no one alive today still knew how to fight them, a realization that left her visibly unsettled. The next morning, in the village streets, Laika held a bundle of fresh bread while noticing the tense atmosphere among the townsfolk. She guessed that it was due to the unsettling rumors of assassins, demons, and monsters appearing. Asher asked if Reberok was aware, and she confirmed that he was. She added that Reberok had called a meeting with the vassals, but none of them had any knowledge about goblins or monsters. There were no detailed records left from those who had seen or fought such creatures. This silence made Asher think that those people were likely already dead and gone from the world. He reflected on how goblins, while considered a low-tier species among monsters, were dangerous in swarms despite their individual weakness. In a time like now, when the populace had no concept or memory of monsters, these creatures could become genuinely terrifying. Laika sighed and admitted that she had come into the city to lift her spirits, but instead found the atmosphere gloomy. Asher quietly thought that it would be better to eliminate troublesome threats quickly. Laika glanced at him and grinned. Later that night, he stepped out of his bedroom, knowing it was time to go. He was planning to confront the goblins directly. Just as he turned, someone tapped his shoulder from behind. When he looked back, he saw Laika smiling brightly. She told him she knew he wouldn't sit by and do nothing, and asked if she was right in assuming he was planning to find the goblins. She insisted that she was coming with him. He warned her that it would be dangerous and that Reberok would be furious if he found out. But Laika simply stepped forward, saying that if the territorial lord's daughter took up arms, it would set a good example for the village. She added that he couldn't leave through the main gate, as the guards were controlling all exits. She then revealed a hidden escape route, sliding open a concealed wall beneath a window, and told him that they should use the secret passage, one that only she knew about. He was left speechless by her determination. Moments later, they had exited the castle. She asked if he knew where to find the goblins. He replied that they would start at the location where the wagon was found and track the footprints from there to locate the goblin's lair. He began running toward the forest, instructing her to follow. She acknowledged and kept pace, shouting that those goblin bastards wouldn't get away with it. She angrily questioned how such tiny creatures could be so bold. Unbeknownst to them, goblins with muscular builds and defined six-pack abs were watching from above. The leader of the goblins glared down at the approaching humans and scoffed, declaring that those tiny humans dared to be so fearless. A moment later, they arrived at the forest. Laika, panting, called out to Asher, asking if he could slow down a bit, but he simply told her that they were almost there. He then came to a stop, knowing that the location should be nearby. Laika took the opportunity to catch her breath. Asher explained that goblins preferred damp places and pointed toward a nearby swamp, which made Laika silently wonder how he knew so much. Suddenly, he sensed a presence nearby. Without hesitation, he pulled Laika down with him, instructing her to keep her voice down. He pointed ahead and indicated that sentries were stationed there. Laika gasped at the sight of goblin guards protecting their tribe. Asher calmly activated his iron gloves and told her they would need to eliminate the guards first. The two goblin sentries were focused on guarding the area. Asher lunged at one of them with incredible speed and, before it could react, slashed its neck with his dagger. The second goblin immediately retaliated by launching its spear from behind. Asher turned quickly and threw his dagger at the goblin's neck, knocking it to the ground. Approaching the fallen goblin, he realized the dagger hadn't pierced deeply enough. He pulled it free, knowing the creature was still alive, and called out to Laika, instructing her to finish it off. Startled, she asked what he meant. Asher explained that it would serve as practice for real combat and that she needed to understand what it felt like to take a life. He then stomped on the barely breathing goblin to pin it down. With trembling hands, she raised the dagger and, after hesitating and closing her eyes, finally stabbed the creature. Inside the goblin tribe, the creatures were busy with daily life, skinning their food, working, and playing. Some were eating a dead animal. Asher pointed them out to Laika, explaining that goblins were savage, of low intelligence, and poor in individual combat, but aggressive and dangerous when gathered in groups. Laika responded by saying they seemed weaker than she had imagined, but they were still a threat to the territory and couldn't be left alone. Asher observed her carefully and noted that she didn't appear shocked, even after taking a life for the first time. He concluded that her mental fortitude was unusually strong. Laika then unsheathed her sword and asked if they were going to charge in and wipe out the tribe. Asher told her to wait a little longer, explaining that the goblins would soon fall asleep. He noted that they typically posted sentries outside before going into their huts to rest. Although their sleep was brief, it was very deep. He shared his plan to infiltrate during that time. Hearing this, Laika acknowledged that he truly knew a lot and began to wonder whether he had fought goblins before. Hours passed, and deep into the night, the sentries took their positions while the rest of the tribe slept in their huts. Asher peeked from behind a hut near one of the guards and dashed toward it with incredible speed, killing it in a single, silent swing of his sword. He then checked inside one of the huts and, as expected, found the goblins sound asleep. He approached the goblin nearest to the entrance and thought to himself how foolish they were. Without hesitation, he raised his sword and stabbed the creature, fully aware that his actions were cruel. But given the threat these monsters posed to humans, he believed it was necessary. He moved swiftly, slashing, piercing, and stabbing the sleeping goblins one by one. Within minutes, he had cleared one entire hut and knew there were 2 more remaining. He then noticed a more solidly built structure nearby, one that resembled a human house. Curious, he wondered if it was the leader's dwelling. It struck him as odd, as goblins lacked the skills and intelligence to build proper houses or maintain hierarchies. Asher concluded they must be squatting in an abandoned ruin. Determined, he moved toward the building, but as he stepped onto a line across the ground, he heard something snap. A massive, spiked trap dropped from above, aimed directly at him. He realized too late that it had been a trap and questioned whether goblins had truly developed the ability to construct such mechanisms. The trap crashed down toward him. Elsewhere, Laika remained hidden, realizing that Asher had been gone too long. She regretted coming along and reminded herself that he had told her to wait because it was dangerous. Still, she wanted to help. Suddenly, she heard rustling behind her and turned quickly. She was shocked to see 3 goblins emerging with spears aimed at her. For a moment, she froze, but then reminded herself to stay calm. There were only a few of them, which meant she could handle it. She shouted to herself that she could do it, then drew her sword. With determination, she challenged the goblins. But before she could engage, a massive goblin ordered the others to step back and stepped forward to confront her. She was stunned by its size and composure, wondering what kind of creature it was and whether goblins could really grow that large, or even speak. The goblin leader smiles, studying her calmly. She asked the creature if it was a goblin as well. It responded that it was the leader of the goblins and, like her, a warrior walking the path of martial arts. She gulped, realizing that this was not an ordinary goblin. Its physique and intellect resembled that of a human. She asked if a goblin like it could truly be called a warrior. It smirked at her question and laughed heartily, questioning when race had ever mattered in mastering martial arts. Twirling the wooden spear in its hand, it said there was no need for words. It aimed the spear at her and declared it was time for a duel. She decided not to be fazed by it. To her, it was still just a low-tier monster. She shouted that she wouldn't lose to something like it and charged forward, the goblin leader doing the same. Meanwhile, inside the tribe, Asher was panting in pain, blood dripping to the ground. He gripped his injured arm, wounded by the trap earlier, and cursed his carelessness. He hadn't expected a goblin to craft such a clever snare. Suddenly, a swarm of goblins emerged from hiding and surrounded him. He activated his gauntlet despite the pain in his arm, knowing his top priority was to break through. Pulling out a long wooden spear, he swung it in wide arcs to keep the goblins at bay. When they closed in, he stabbed at them with the tip, killing those in his path. Cursing under his breath as they kept coming, he pushed forward, swinging the spear while advancing, determined to take down every goblin blocking his way. Outside the tribe, Laika was locked in battle with the goblin leader. It praised her for being impressive, which only infuriated her further. She demanded to know what it had just said, then retrieved her sword while angrily questioning how a monster dared to evaluate a human. She launched a flurry of attacks, swinging her sword at the goblin leader with increasing intensity, but every strike was effortlessly blocked. The goblin leader leaped around her with ease, dodging and landing behind her. It pointed out that she was using too much force and that her sword movements were unstable. She was stunned. It was saying the same things Asher had told her. She began to wonder how it could know so much about swordsmanship. As the goblin approached her calmly, it said that surely this wasn't the extent of her skills, and asked her to show more. Angered, she resolved to demonstrate true swordsmanship, and rushed at it using Rapenia's sword technique. She closed the distance rapidly, but the goblin leader simply replied that it understood now, stating that she was a fake too. In one motion, it swung its spear with great precision, shattering her sword into pieces. She was left stunned in disbelief. The goblin then turned the spear and aimed the blunt end at her, saying that it was time to end the duel. It lunged forward and struck her in the stomach, sending her collapsing to the ground. At the same time, back in the tribe, goblin corpses littered the area. Asher walked away from the battlefield, battered and bloody. He cursed himself, calling it pathetic that he had been brought down by goblins. He recalled that goblins often coated their weapons with lethal poison, just a trace of which could kill hundreds of humans. Collapsing to the ground from blood loss and poison, he quietly wondered if this was where he would die. Moments later, he lost consciousness. Not far away, Laika lay on the ground, gravely injured. The goblin leader and its followers approached her. The leader paused, surprised to hear her still breathing. It remarked that her wounds were serious, but she had survived thanks to her armor. Laika tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The goblin smiled and told her she should die honorably as a warrior. Raising its spear, the goblin aimed the tip at her chest. Laika, filled with fear and tears in her eyes, wondered if this was truly how she would die. She shut her eyes tightly, bracing for the end. Just as the goblin leader lunged forward, a spear struck its hand, knocking the spear aside. Shocked, it turned around. Laika opened her eyes and was astonished to see Asher standing there, his armor shattered and torn. The goblin leader looked at him with amusement, smiling as it commented that he had managed to survive. Asher said nothing. He only returned the smile and stared directly at it. He was then startled when he realized that the goblin could speak. He told it that he had only been going along with typical goblin behavior. Asher explained that he had already anticipated their tactic of coating weapons with deadly poison and had survived because he preemptively applied an antidote to his own weapons. He added that being prepared was essential when fighting goblins. Taken appeared impressed and asked if he truly understood their tactics. Asher immediately turned his attention to Laika and helped her up, while the goblin leader referred to him as a clever human. Asher told Laika to stay put and assured her that he would handle the situation. She agreed and warned him to be careful. Asher then looked at the goblin leader and asked if it was indeed the tribe's leader. The goblin retrieved its spear and introduced itself as Takan, leader of the goblins and an aspiring master of martial arts. Asher found Takan to be a fascinating creature. Takan pointed its spear at him and declared that interrupting an honorable duel was a grave offense. It asked if he was prepared. Asher responded affirmatively, drawing his sword. As Takan dashed forward, Asher blocked the incoming spear strikes. Takan swung and thrust the spear repeatedly, and Asher deflected each blow. He quickly realized that Takan was no ordinary goblin. Its strikes weren't wild or erratic, but precise and disciplined, refined through extensive training and countless real battles. Despite this, Asher smirked, feeling excitement rise within him. It had been a long time since he had faced a worthy opponent. Drawing his sword back, he slashed forward with great force. Takan blocked the strike, but the impact launched the goblin backward. It managed to land safely on its feet. Takan laughed with exhilaration and proclaimed that it was the kind of perfect swordsmanship it had longed to encounter. It referred to Asher as a real one, which confused him. Asher wondered what the goblin meant by that. Takan's body began to emit a dark aura as it declared that today must be its lucky day, having crossed paths with not one but two worthy opponents. It stared up at Asher with manic intensity and challenged him to continue. The two then darted toward each other, meeting in the middle with weapons clashing. Their strikes and parries echoed through the night. Laika, still struggling at the edge of the battlefield, peeked at the fight. She noticed that there were no tricks, just straightforward, masterful exchanges. Both fighters displayed near-perfect spear and sword skills. As her vision began to fade, she thought that, strangely, Takan resembled Asher. Then she lost consciousness and collapsed. Asher briefly paused in his assault. Takan asked what was wrong, and if he was already too tired to continue. Asher responded that he didn't have time to keep playing. Takan scoffed and asked if he really thought he'd be allowed to walk away. Asher firmly replied that he would. Suddenly, flames erupted from the tribe behind them. Takan turned in shock to see the goblin settlement engulfed in fire. It glared at Asher, calling him a coward and accusing him of setting the forest ablaze. Asher calmly asked if there was a need for some special method to eliminate them. Takan, realizing the situation, said he had no choice but to save his kin and couldn't let them burn to death. He declared that they would meet again someday and then ran toward the burning village. Asher turned his attention to Laika and found her still faint but alive. He recognized that she had held her own admirably, especially against an opponent with Takan's near-perfect spear technique. He lifted her onto his back, knowing they had to return and report what had happened. Without hesitation, he sprinted away from the forest, suspecting that the goblins were now targeting the Arak territory. Meanwhile, in the Lord's castle within Arak territory, Karon was instructing the guards to strictly monitor all access to and from the castle. The guards acknowledged the order, but moments later someone called out to Karon in a panic. When he turned, he saw Asher standing at the gate with Laika unconscious on his back. Asher told him to open the gates. Karon was stunned at the sight of Laika collapsed on Asher's shoulders. He immediately ordered the guards to take her to the infirmary, and they rushed to comply. Then, turning to Asher with fury, Karon called him a bastard and demanded to know what he had done to Laika. Asher remained calm and told him there was no time to explain. It would be better to show him directly. He dropped the bag he had been carrying onto the ground in front of them. When it opened, Karon froze in horror, staring at the severed goblin head inside. Trembling, he asked Asher if it truly was a goblin. He replied that it must have been their first time seeing a goblin in person and informed them that the goblins were planning to attack the Arak territory. Karon, shocked, asked if the goblins were truly going to invade. Asher simply responded that the goblins would arrive soon and that preparations for battle must begin immediately. The next day, the sound of birds filled Laika's room, gently waking her. She opened her eyes and, through blurred vision, saw her mother and father anxiously watching over her. She sat up quickly upon seeing them. Benija asked if she was awake and how she was feeling. Laika assured her mother that she was fine and that there was no need to worry. Rebarok, however, furiously asked if Asher had taken her outside and demanded how he could have led his daughter into such danger. Laika defended Asher, explaining that it wasn't his fault. She had chosen to go, and he had warned her about the risks, but she insisted on following him. She added that thanks to Asher, she had gained real combat experience and strengthened her mental fortitude. She told them that Asher had saved her during the battle against the goblins and had risked his life for the sake of the Arak territory. Reborok's clenched fists slowly relaxed as he listened, realizing that she was right. While fear and anxiety consumed the territory, Asher had gone out alone and returned with the severed head of a goblin. In that moment, Reborok began to understand that Asher was no different from a hero. Shortly after, in the training grounds, the goblin's head was displayed at the center as the knights trained intensely in its presence. Asher observed them from above when a voice spoke behind him, noting that the goblin's head had been displayed on his order. Reborok stepped beside him and explained that it would help the soldiers shake off their fear and remain alert. Asher greeted Reborok, who asked his opinion on the soldiers' skills. Asher replied that they were performing well and had a strong chance of victory. Reborok sincerely thanked him as the Lord of Arak territory, a gesture that startled Asher and made him wonder if he had begun to earn some of Reborok's trust. He responded modestly, saying the words were too kind, and asked how Laika was doing. Reborok sighed and replied that Laika had gone straight to the training grounds as soon as she got up. The two headed there together while Reborok noted that Laika could choose a comfortable life, but instead chose the path of struggle. Laika excitedly called out to them when she saw them approaching. Reborok asked if she was feeling well, and she confidently replied that she felt great. Reborok sighed again and muttered that she and Luke were both troublemakers. Laika responded that comparing her to Luke wasn't fair. He had become a squanderer who spent his days locked in his room. Reborok reluctantly agreed. She then told her father that since Luke was no longer present, she needed to grow stronger in his place. Hearing this, Asher recalled Luke and wondered if he had suffered a mental breakdown after what had happened that day. He thought of Luke as a fragile boy, someone he would need to help straighten out. Benesia then approached Asher and asked if she was correct in thinking his right arm was injured. He replied that it was fine, merely a small wound caused by goblin poison. Benesia was alarmed, but Laika reassured her mother that thanks to Asher's thorough preparations, the wound healed quickly. Asher informed Reborok that goblins were known to coat their weapons with deadly poison, and the soldiers should be prepared for it. Reborok stammered his acknowledgement and said he would inform Karen immediately. Asher then assured them that with proper armor and medicine, they could win. But he also knew that the true threat was the goblin leader, Takan, who possessed the physique of a human and formidable spear skills. Asher realized that he would have to face Takan again. Meanwhile, deep within a forest cave, the remaining goblins worked while Takan rested at the center. Takan understood that goblins were inherently weak and lacking intelligence, yet he had become different. His body and mind had evolved beyond that of a normal goblin. With this strength, he believed it was his duty to protect his kind. He took the water handed to him by a servant and drank, but suddenly a voice echoed in his head, commanding him to kill the humans. Startled, Takan dropped and shattered the cup, trembling from the pain of the curse that afflicted him. The voice repeated its demand to destroy the humans. Takan questioned the value of the intelligence he had worked so hard to obtain if he was only a puppet in the end. Yet he laughed, thinking that because of that voice, he had gained something meaningful. For the first time in a world full of fakes, he had encountered another being like himself. Takan then slammed the base of his spear into the ground, and all the goblins lined up in front of him. He asked if everyone was present, and the goblins responded with growls. Takan raised his voice, declaring that it was time to go. They would wipe out the humans. The goblins roared in agreement and charged out of the forest, heading straight for Arak territory. Eventually, all the goblins arrived at Arak, and the soldiers quickly raised the alarm, informing everyone of the enemy's presence. Caron raised his sword high, commanding the soldiers to arm themselves. He shouted that this was their land and they would not allow monsters to trample upon it. He then ordered the soldiers to wipe out every last goblin, to which they all responded in unison with a resounding affirmation. The goblins began crawling up the gate's wall, and as they reached the top, the soldiers immediately stabbed them with spears and slashed at them with swords. Those guarding the gates gave everything they had, slaying every goblin that tried to break through. Among them was Caron, fighting fiercely to cut down as many enemies as possible. Meanwhile, in front of the castle, Reborok took charge. He commanded the soldiers with him to charge forward, hold the goblins back, and defend Arak territory. The troops responded with courage, engaging the goblins that had already slipped past the gates. Elsewhere, Luke was cowering in his room, trembling and covering his ears to block out the sounds of chaos outside. Suddenly, someone called his name. When he looked up and saw Asher, he sprang back in fear. Asher, however, remained calm and urged him to pull himself together, reminding him that everyone in the castle was fighting. Luke, still shaking, confessed that he couldn't do anything, that he was useless in battle. He admitted he was no warrior like Asher or Laika, and that he was just a coward hiding behind the title of heir to the lordship. Asher was momentarily speechless, realizing that Luke's confidence had hit rock bottom. Without another word, Asher drew his sword and threw it at the bed, startling Luke and making him scream. Asher then commanded him to pick up the sword, asking if he truly intended to run away without even trying. He questioned if Luke could stand by doing nothing while the territory burned and people died. He demanded to know how someone like that could ever be worthy of becoming a lord. Reminding Luke that he would one day rule that land, Asher told him to take responsibility. Then he turned and walked out, leaving Luke staring at the sword embedded in his bed. Luke sat frozen for a moment, deep in thought. Eventually, he clenched his teeth and, with a surge of determination, grabbed the sword. Cursing under his breath, he sprinted out of the castle. At the gates, Karen was still relentlessly swinging his sword, shouting in frustration that the goblins just kept coming. Suddenly, a group of goblins appeared behind him unnoticed. But before they could strike, Laika arrived and swiftly cut them down. Karan rushed to her side, worriedly asking if she was all right. She assured him that she was fine and in top shape. She asked about the battle's progress, and Karen explained that they currently held the advantage. Although the goblins had numbers, they were weak in both physique and attack power. The forces of Arak territory alone, he believed, were enough to defend against them. Karan expressed confidence in their victory, but Laika remained silent, knowing the true threat had yet to appear. Just then, one of the goblins was thrown from the wall and landed lifeless at the feet of Takan, who had been watching from below. Takan observed the scene, smirking as he realized that his kin had done well, but that the current force would not be enough to take the castle. He then raised his spear and declared that he would handle it himself. A few minutes later, the soldiers began to question whether the battle was over. They glanced around at the goblin corpses and, seeing no more movement, started to lower their guard. Karan, however, ordered them to stay alert and tend to the wounded. The soldiers chatted optimistically, mocking the goblins and confidently declaring that this was a victory for humanity. None of them noticed Takan stepping among them. When they heard a loud laugh from behind, they turned around in shock to see Takan standing there, grinning. He mocked them for letting their guard down and called them pathetic humans. With a sudden swing of his spear, he cut down a group of soldiers in one devastating blow. Karen, stunned, stammered in disbelief, asking if that thing was a goblin too. Laika, pale, recognized him immediately as the goblin leader. Panic spread as more soldiers surrounded Takan, hesitantly asking the same question. Takan's green skin identified him as a goblin, but his fearlessness made them pause. Karen ordered the soldiers to attack, but Laika quickly stopped him, warning that Takan was extremely dangerous. Karen turned to ask what she meant, but it was already too late. The soldiers charged forward, only for Takan to calmly declare that he had no time to waste on weaklings. He pounced, calling them worthless fakes. In a single strike, he overwhelmed the front line and charged forward, laughing wildly. Karen could hardly believe his eyes as he watched Takan cut through trained knights like nothing. Taken then calmly approached, turning to Laika and asking if she was the same human he had met in the forest. He also asked if the man beside her was the leader of these weaklings. He dismissed them both, stating that he had no interest in dealing with fakes. Laika, trembling with fear, called him a bastard, but Takan ignored her and ordered her to bring him the human he was looking for. Karan demanded to know what he meant, and Takan replied that he wanted to meet the one called Asher, or whatever his name was, the human who wielded a real sword. Karen responded to Takan that it was too bad, because he would never get to meet Asher. He declared that Takan would die by his hand first. Laika, clearly worried, warned Karen that Takan was dangerous, but Karen reassured her, telling her to leave it to him. Inwardly, Karen convinced himself that Takan was just a goblin. There was no way a monster could surpass a human in swordsmanship. Takan raised his spear and aimed it at Karan, acknowledging his confidence and inviting him to attack. Karan dashed forward and swung his sword with full force, but Takan easily blocked the strike. Karan shouted that he would cut him in half, but Takan smirked and mockingly challenged him to give it everything he had. Laika watched the duel unfold. She knew Karan was a top-class swordsman, recognized even within the Empire. Yet she saw Takan parry Karan's strikes with such ease that it resembled child's play. Takan then commented that Karan had some talent but quickly disarmed him with a single forward thrust of his spear. Karan, shocked, had no time to react before Takan lunged and struck his stomach. Laika screamed his name in worry. Thankfully, the blow was softened by Karan's armor, leaving only a minor wound, but it sent him crashing to the ground. Takan pressed the spear's tip to Karan's face and taunted him, calling him another fake who relied on hollow techniques. He asked Karen if they should end it there. Laika, seeing the danger, raised her sword and called for Karen to back away, preparing to step in herself. But before she could move, Asher appeared and called out to Takan. Takan laughed upon seeing him and said he had been waiting for that moment. Asher stepped forward and replied that he too had been waiting, as they had unfinished business. Drawing his sword, he raised it toward Takan and challenged him to bring it on. Takan stepped away from Karen and faced Asher directly. He said that the swordsmanship of the humans here wasn't worth his time. There was only one human worthy of his attention, and that was Asher. With excitement, Takan released his aura and lunged forward, thrusting his spear at Asher. Asher blocked the attack and forcefully pushed the spear aside. Takan laughed with exhilaration, calling it the true swordsmanship he had been searching for, a pure battle of martial arts. He attacked again, swinging and thrusting, and Asher responded with perfect blocks and counters. Meanwhile, Laika rushed to Karen and asked if he was badly hurt. Karen assured her that it was only a minor wound. Suddenly, someone called out to them. They turned to see Luke sprinting toward them, asking if they were all right. Both were shocked to see him there. Laika asked why he had come, and Karen told him he should have stayed inside. It was dangerous. But Luke replied calmly that as the heir to the territory, he couldn't just sit idly by. Even if he couldn't fight, he would stand on the battlefield with everyone. Laika smiled, realizing that Luke had finally come to his senses. Luke turned his attention to Asher, and Laika explained that Asher was currently fighting the goblin leader. Watching Asher clash foot by foot with Takan, Luke was left in awe. Taken laughed as he fought Asher, saying he was enjoying it because this was a battle against a real opponent, not fakes. Asher responded that he had a question he had been meaning to ask. He wanted to know what Takan meant by fakes. Takan replied that human swordsmanship was a lie, and that heroes relied on false strength. He asked mockingly what else their swordsmanship could be, but fraudulent. Asher was shocked. Could heroes truly possess false strength? Could the swordsmanship that surpassed human limits be considered fake? He couldn't believe it. But then Taken pointed his spear at Asher and declared that he was different. He, like Takan, had reached the pinnacle of pure swordsmanship. Takan shouted that only his swordsmanship held true value and charged, commanding Asher to prepare himself. Asher, confused by the claim, wondered if Takan was suggesting that his own style, Imperial swordsmanship, was the true path. Unlike heroic swordsmanship, he blocked Takan's strike and smirked, dismissing it as nonsense. He grabbed Taken's spear tightly and stared at him with cold seriousness. He acknowledged that Taken might be clever, but asked angrily how he dared to judge human swordsmanship. He knew that swordsmanship existed to push beyond human limits, and that heroes had used it to protect the world. Pure swordsmanship, such as the Imperial style, had no place in a world that needed heroes. Asher admitted that the master he admired had died the moment he reached perfection, and that he himself was nothing more than an aging swordsman stuck in a single style. He told Takan that, to a barbaric species like him, his swordsmanship might seem like mastery. But Takan had no idea what a true human master was, or how powerful they could become. With that, Asher pushed Takan's spear aside and raised his own sword high. He slashed it down fiercely, cutting across Takan's chest, and shouted that Takan was weak. Takan lay on the ground, bleeding heavily. Seeing this, Laika wondered if he had finally collapsed, while Luke questioned whether he was dead. But then, Takan stirred. Trembling, he pushed himself upright. Asher approached him and calmly explained that if the wound had been a little deeper, he would be dead, but he had no intention of killing him yet. First, Takan would be imprisoned and held accountable for everything. Taken let out a hoarse laugh, admitting that Asher had won, and telling him to do as he pleased. Asher then asked why he had invaded the territory. Taken answered that he had been ordered to. When Asher pressed further, asking who gave the order, Takan revealed that the demons had commanded him. Takan explained that the demons had tasked him with leading his kin to attack the humans. The realization struck Asher. It mirrored what had happened during the Demon King's invasion in the past. Back then, some monsters had also been incited by the demons to assault human settlements. The Demon King had been behind it all, and now Asher began to wonder if the Demon King had truly returned. Taken continued, saying that he was indeed weak, just as Asher had said. Regardless of what kind of true master he became or what heights he reached, he was still just a puppet following orders, no different from any other goblin. The only difference was that he had a higher intellect, which allowed him to train himself in spear techniques and challenge other races to test his strength. But even so, goblins were a lesser race among monsters, and he could never fully overcome the limitations of his species. Then one day, a high-ranking demon had appeared. That demon granted him both intelligence and strength. In return, the demon demanded that he lead an invasion against the humans. Taken asked what excuse he could possibly offer that demon when he returned defeated. He remarked that he now wanted to see what a human prison was like. Asher sheathed his sword and told Taken that he would show him. Karen and the soldiers arrived to escort Taken to the prison, and he followed them without resistance. The soldiers shouted in triumph, celebrating their victory. It was a hard-won battle, and for the moment, humanity had prevailed. Laika, observing Taken's composed demeanor, expressed surprise that he had accepted defeat so easily. But they all knew that Taken was no ordinary goblin. Asher was relieved the immediate crisis was over, but in the back of his mind, he feared that if the Demon King had truly returned, a far greater disaster loomed ahead. The next day, peace returned to Arak territory. Soldiers worked tirelessly to rebuild damaged structures. Inside the castle, Rebarok personally thanked Asher, telling him that the territory had been saved because of him. Asher humbly replied that he only did what he should as a resident of the village, but Rebarok said there was more to be grateful for. He thanked Asher for helping Luke turn over a new leaf, something truly worth celebrating. Rebarok informed him that Luke was now even assisting the soldiers in repairing the castle walls. Their conversation shifted to Takan. Rebarok admitted that although Karen was watching over him, he still felt uneasy. Asher suggested sending Takan to the Empire for further investigation. However, Rebarok revealed that a messenger from the Empire had already arrived. The Empire had sensed the rising danger following the doppelganger and goblin invasion, and would soon be sending someone. Days later, the Imperial carriage arrived in Iraq. Citizens lined the streets to watch as the Empire's carriages rolled into the territory. Some wondered aloud if it might be Haiban visiting, though others doubted someone so important would come to such a small village. One of the villagers caught a glimpse inside the carriage and asked his friend if he had seen it. The man responded in shock, saying that whoever was inside didn't look human. Meanwhile, in the training ground inside Eric Castle, Asher was practicing his swordsmanship. Laika observed him, then asked if she should learn Imperial swordsmanship too. He casually responded by asking if she wasn't already skilled in Rapenia's style. She confirmed that she was, but admitted that watching him made her realize how remarkable his style truly was. Asher warned her that she might be disappointed if she tried to learn it. He recalled that, in his past life, there had been students like Laika, aspiring swordsmen who asked to become his disciples. But Imperial swordsmanship was repetitive and fundamental, and most of them had left disappointed, all except one. He briefly wondered how that particular student was doing now. Laika then asked if he had heard about someone arriving from the Empire. He replied yes, as Rebarok had informed him. But he flinched when Laika added that the one arriving was the captain of the guard, and a dark elf at that. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Elsewhere, Rebarok rushed to the castle entrance and personally welcomed the arriving officer. A woman stepped out of the carriage and introduced herself as Arena Barcilis, captain of the Imperial Guard. She greeted Rebarok with respectful formality. Years ago, the forest burned as Jinwoo stood before it, silently watching the flames consume everything. Behind him, a voice called out. He turned and saw Haiban and Lepenia approaching. Haiban remarked that, in the end, Jinwoo had been forced to burn the forest, and with it, the Dark Elves had been completely destroyed. Jinwoo calmly responded that the Dark Elves had brought it upon themselves. Because of the Elder's actions, the world had been placed in grave danger. He turned around and began walking away, telling them that his task there was finished, and that if they needed him, they could call. Haiban agreed and advised him to be careful on his way back. Lepenia said nothing. As Jinwoo made his way back through the forest, he suddenly heard the sound of crying. He paused, realizing it came from nearby. Following the voice, he pushed through some thick bushes and discovered a small, dark elf child weeping behind them. From her clothing, he guessed she was the Elder's daughter. Somehow, the Elder must have managed to save her. Knowing the child bore no fault in what had happened, he gently asked if she wanted to come with him, offering his hand. The girl hesitated but eventually took it. He asked for her name, and she stammered a reply. Arena Barcilis. In the present, Arena formally introduced herself as a captain of the Imperial Guard. She offered a respectful greeting. Laika shook her hand, clearly amazed. It was her first time meeting an elf. She introduced herself and then turned to Arena, gesturing to Asher. She explained that he was a skilled swordsman who had played a key role in defeating the goblins. Arena turned her gaze to Asher and remained silent for a moment before offering a formal greeting. Asher responded in kind and shook her hand. Moments later, they were seated in the meeting room. Rebarok informed Arena that Asher would explain the situation thus far. She nodded and said she understood. Rebarok left to give them space to speak. Asher remained quiet for a while, unsettled by the situation. Sitting across from him was Arena, his adopted daughter from his previous life. He knew without a doubt that she was the sole surviving Dark Elf and the child he had once taken in. In his past life, the Dark Elf Elder had harbored a deep hatred for humanity and sought to destroy the world. The Elder had invoked a forbidden spell, summoning an abomination from another dimension with the intent to annihilate everything. But the Elder couldn't control the creature's power, and the Dark Elves were annihilated in the aftermath. The heroes had barely managed to defeat the Elder, who had become one with the abomination. Jinwoo had burned the forest to destroy what remained, as it had been tainted by the creature's aura. It was then that he found Arena, an orphan child hidden among the ashes, and chose to raise her. He had done what he could, offering protection but never affection, believing she must have resented him for destroying her home and family. He never expected her to follow the same path he did. He wondered how and why she had become captain of the Imperial Guard, and why she was now walking the same path he once walked. His thoughts were interrupted when Arena called his name. She explained that she was there on Haiban's behalf. Haiban had been unable to come himself and entrusted her with the task. Asher replied that he understood. Arena then got to the point. She informed him that the Empire didn't fully trust him. The information they needed to discuss was a highly guarded Imperial secret, and even though he was Haiban's disciple, it was difficult for them to disclose such information freely. Asher found this understandable. From the Empire's point of view, he had appeared out of nowhere, possessed knowledge of monsters, and demonstrated extraordinary swordsmanship. It was all very suspicious. Arena continued, saying that Haiban trusted him because of his swordsmanship. As a formal request from the Empire, she asked him to show it to her. He knew she was already familiar with it. She had been watching him ever since her childhood, but he agreed. They made their way to an open field. As he raised his sword, Arena stared at him, thinking that he looked just like her father, Jinwoo. She remembered once telling Haiban that she didn't understand. Haiban had replied that Asher's swordsmanship, his way of speaking, even his personality, were all similar. He had told her to see it for herself, which left her speechless. That was the reason she had come to Iraq in Haiban's place. Still, She couldn't believe someone so similar to her deceased father could exist in this world. Her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Asher turned to her and told her that he would begin. He then began to move, swinging his sword with practiced precision. With a smooth motion, he raised it and unleashed a powerful slash into the air. Arena watched closely, her eyes fixed on every movement. But when she saw the way he swung, the way he stood, her eyes widened. For a moment, it wasn't Asher she saw. It was Jinwoo. Her breath caught in her throat, and without meaning to, she softly whispered, "Father!" Later, Laika screamed in excitement and asked Rebarok if he had really said the academy. Rebarok confirmed with a smile and informed her that she had received an official acceptance letter, brought by Arena herself. He then handed her the letter, which she took joyfully, thanking him. Rebarok replied that it was simply something he should do as her father. Through formal education, she would be able to develop her talents further and prepare for the future. He added that they would be heading to the capital soon. Laika stepped out of Rebarok's office, beaming as she stared at the acceptance letter from the Capital Academy. It felt like a dream. The Imperial Academy was the most prestigious school in the Empire, known for producing legendary swordmasters and elite warriors. It was the gathering place of the finest swordsmen from across the Empire. She stopped walking and thought how nice it would be if Asher could accompany her. She knew he was undoubtedly one of the most talented people in the Empire. She wondered if he might want to experience the world as well. With that thought, she sprinted off to find him. At the same time, in the training ground, Asher was still practicing. His mind, however, was preoccupied with thoughts of Arena. He recalled that after he demonstrated his swordsmanship to her, he had asked whether she had seen what she needed to. Instead of answering, she had looked stunned and quickly excused herself before rushing off. He figured she must have been overwhelmed by the realization that a stranger was using the exact style of her long-dead father. Then, sensing a familiar gaze behind him, he called out to ask how long she had been standing there, startling her slightly. Arena stepped out from where she had been watching, a bit embarrassed, and apologized for disturbing him. He assured her that she hadn't disturbed him at all, silently thinking that she was watching him again, just like in the past. Later, on the balcony, Arena thanked him for honoring her request to demonstrate his swordsmanship. She told him that it strongly resembled someone she once knew, which momentarily confused her. She also apologized for not explaining everything beforehand. He calmly responded that he was glad it wasn't anything serious and asked if that meant her verification of his skills was now complete. Arena confirmed that it was. She then said she would now share confidential information from the Empire. She began by explaining that during the Age of War, many heroes rose to protect the world, like the Archmage who repelled the demons, the champion who slew the Demon King, as well as legendary figures like Valters and Rapenia. But now, those heroes were disappearing. The champion, who once ruled over a great domain, had caused its downfall and vanished. Valbaka, as he already knew, had been consumed by a demon. The situation in the north was the most dire. Even though Lapenia had once ruled the northern regions, her absence had allowed monsters to begin invading. Arena added that contact had also been lost with both the Archmage and the Dragonslayer's castle. The world, she said, was descending into chaos. Asher, unsurprised, asked about Haiban. Arena explained that Haiban had left the Empire on the Emperor's orders to search for the missing heroes and monitor the ongoing crisis. Before departing, Haiban had entrusted her with the responsibility of informing Asher of the situation. He then recalled Haiban once asking what he planned to do, if he would once again stand and fight to save the world, just as he had done before. Asher answered Arena that he would do nothing. Confused, she looked at him. He explained that he had no interest in noble causes. He reminded himself that he was not a hero. All he sought was the path of the sword. It had been that way in his previous life, and it would remain so now. He had no desire for grand ideals or honor. His only goal was to strike down whatever stood in his way. Arena stared at him for a long moment, speechless, then chuckled. She told him she understood. Turning to face the horizon, she added that Haiban had said something similar, that Asher was stubborn and would spend his life chasing the sword. She added, with a faint smile, that, in that way, he reminded her of someone she once knew. That surprised him. She then turned back to him and asked what his next plan was. He replied that he intended to go to the Gate of the Sword, which confused her. He explained that it was a place in the Empire and that he planned to visit it. Asher believed it held answers about the secret of his reincarnation, and if anyone could provide those answers, it would be the one who resided there. Before Arena could ask more, Laika appeared and called out to him excitedly. She rushed over holding the letter in her hands and announced that she had been accepted into the Imperial Academy. She then added, with hopeful enthusiasm, that he should come with her to the Empire. Both Asher and Arena were surprised, but Arena smiled and remarked that it worked out perfectly. She turned to him and asked if he would like to accompany them to the capital. He paused, thinking for a moment. Eventually he nodded and replied that he would. Deep down, he knew this would be a good way to spend the final moments before parting ways with Laika. It was decided that Laika would travel to the Empire to enter the Academy, and crowds gathered to bless the young lady's future. Laika, together with Asher and Arena, stood before Rebarok and Benizia for the last time. Benizia wished Laika a safe trip, and Rebarok assured her that Karan and Luke would protect their territory, so she shouldn't worry. Reborok then told her that he hoped she would return as the Empire's greatest swordsman, to which she proudly replied that she would. Benicia then turned to Asher, telling him that Laika might feel lonely living far from home and begged him to stay by her side as a friend, and to return with her. He replied yes, certain that he would accompany Laika to the Empire as her escort and companion, though he wasn't sure if he would ever be able to return again. Asher always wondered why he was reincarnated, why he had been targeted by that god, where his comrades from his previous life were, and how the demons had returned. All those questions constantly tormented his mind, and so he had decided to leave in search of answers. He had wanted to do nothing, but those questions blocked his path, making him think he must find the answers on his own. Reborok then thanked Arena for her efforts and wished her safe travels. Arena thanked Reborok for his hospitality. He informed her that he would hand over the goblin as requested by the Empire and warned her to be cautious while transporting it. Arena then approached Taken, who was inside the cage, and called his name, making him look up. She informed him that he would be imprisoned in the Empire for life once the investigation was complete. Taken simply asked what choice a loser like him had, and told her to do as they wished. They then began their journey back to the Empire, and as their carriage passed through the town, the people cheered for Laika and their territory. But when they saw Taken, they shouted furiously, calling him the creature who tried to attack their home. They shouted at him, calling him a disgusting monster and telling him to rot in prison for the rest of his life. Takan remained calm, and with a laugh thought to himself that imprisonment in the Empire wouldn't be easy. But he knew he would be free soon enough. The carriage then left Arak's territory and traveled through the forest. While on the road, Laika turned to Arena and said she had a question. Arena told her to feel free to ask anything. Laika asked how she had become the captain of the Imperial Guard, noting that, as a dark elf, it must not have been easy to adapt to the human world. Arena replied that she had become captain of the guard to follow the path of someone she respected, which confused Asher and made him wonder who she was talking about. Laika asked who it was, and Arena replied that it was a man who had been like a father to her. She explained that dark elves had long hated humans, and she had been taught the same beliefs. But after her people were wiped out, a human reached out to her, the sole survivor. He showed no hostility and didn't treat her with suspicion. She added that he was warm and kind. He had also been the captain of the Imperial Guard. He took her in and raised her like his own daughter. Though stern on the outside, he was kind and compassionate on the inside. She said he had been very strict with himself, and his way of life had become a guide for her. Laika was amazed to hear that Arena was following in her father's footsteps and asked if her father was still alive. Arena replied that unfortunately her father had passed away, but his memory remained in her heart. Asher then interrupted them, asking Arena if the person she had mentioned earlier, the one she said he resembled, was her father. She replied yes. He then asked what she admired most about her father. She answered that what she admired most was his swordsmanship. Though her father had never been called a hero, through lifelong training, he had reached a level of mastery with the sword that she deeply respected. She said she wanted to be like him, and that by following his example, she was able to reach her current position. He had never known that Arena idolized him, because he had always kept his distance, fearing she might resent him. But she had seen him as her savior all along. Laika then told Arena that, for some reason, her father reminded her of Asher. Arena agreed. Laika started to say that her father might have reincarnated, but before she could finish her thought, they suddenly heard someone shouting for help. They immediately looked outside and saw a man rushing toward their carriage. They asked what was happening, and the man begged them to help. Trembling, he explained that he was from a nearby village and that bandits were raiding it and kidnapping people. The news shocked all of them. Asher immediately jumped off the carriage and sprinted toward the village, shouting that he would go take a look. Laika told Arena that she would go with Asher and asked her to stay there, which surprised Arena, but she agreed. Arena then rushed to assist the injured man and ordered some of the soldiers to turn the carriages toward the village, while others stayed behind to guard the wounded. Arena was about to run after them when she paused. She heard Taken say, "Demon!" She asked him what he meant. Taken replied that those weren't the actions of human bandits. He said they might not sense it, but he was familiar with the presence. They were facing the aura of demons. He warned them to be cautious, then laughed teasingly, which horrified Arena. Meanwhile, in the nearby village, many people lay dead on the ground, sending chills down Asher and Laika's spines. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Laika then asked who could have done it, but both she and Asher were shocked when they suddenly heard someone shout, "Take them all!" They looked ahead and saw bandits threatening the villagers, warning them that if they resisted, they would be killed. The bandits were trying to load everyone into carriages to kidnap them. The leader of the bandits then heard someone sprinting toward them. As he turned to look, Asher swung his sword, slashing the man and killing him instantly. Two bandits approached and shouted at him, demanding to know if he wanted to die. Laika rushed closer as the remaining men began to surround them. She asked if these were bandits, and Asher replied that they were slavers. The surrounding men were shocked by the word, but Asher calmly explained to Laika that they were part of a criminal organization that kidnapped people and sold them to nearby continents. He remembered dealing with them many times in his previous life and knew they came from the northwestern continent where slavery was tolerated. Laika was furious upon hearing this and shouted that it was such an inhuman act. Asher calmly reminded her that, according to the Empire's law, trading people was punishable by death, meaning he had the authority to execute them right there. He then swung his sword at one of the slavers and Laika followed, slashing her sword around her as well. Asher killed another slaver, stabbing the man in anger while calling them disgusting bastards. Minutes later, the slavers lay dead on the ground, and the villagers gathered in front of them, murmuring in disbelief. Laika told them it was fortunate they had passed through the area. The villagers thanked them deeply. Just then they heard Arena calling out in worry, asking if they were all right. Asher angrily responded, saying that the villagers had lost their homes, and asked her what she thought about going to the Empire and seeking aid. She agreed and told him they would do it. Arena then assured the villagers that they would be provided shelter in the Empire until the village could be rebuilt, and asked them to come with them. The villagers tearfully thanked her. Laika helped Arena guide the villagers toward the carriage, while Asher stood guard at the rear. Then, someone respectfully called out to him from behind. When he looked back, he saw a young boy staring at him. The boy thanked him for saving them. Asher was furious that the slavers had even attempted to kidnap children. He knew how disastrous that could have been. He gently patted the boy's head and told him he was only doing his duty. But then he noticed the mark on the boy's forehead, and immediately recognized what it meant. He walked the boy over to the carriage. The two women noticed the child next to him. Asher turned to Arena and said he wanted to talk to her. He asked if he was right in recalling that there was a man named Crocus, the master of the underworld in the Empire. Arena was surprised and asked how he knew that name. Asher replied that he had heard it from Hyben. He explained that the mark on the boy's forehead meant he was the successor to the master of the underworld. He knew that the master of the underworld, also known as the hero of the underground, had the role of sealing the rift once used by demons to invade the surface. That rift, hidden in the depths of the Empire, was a dangerous portal to the demonic realm. The master's duty was to hold it back using barrier magic. If the demonic energy ever spilled out, it could threaten the surface. Thus, the master of the underworld was a tragic hero, protecting the world in secret while living a life of solitude in the dark. Laika asked if the Empire truly had someone like that, and Arena sadly replied yes. She explained that it wasn't widely known due to security concerns, but Crocus was indeed one of the great heroes. He stood at the boundary between their world and the demonic one, holding back the flow of energy. Taken, who had overheard their conversation, was shocked to learn that Crocus was holding back demonic energy. He then realized that the demonic presence he had sensed earlier was because of the boy. Taken thought to himself that the child was destined to live surrounded by the aura of the demonic realm. Laughing darkly, he remarked that there were quite a few interesting humans around, and added that the air of the demonic realm felt nostalgic. As they continued their journey with the rescued villagers, Arena asked the boy his name. The child replied that his name was Garen. He explained that he was on his final break before the succession ceremony to become the new master of the underworld. He had stopped by the village on his way back to the Empire, but the slavers had attacked and captured him. Asher told Garen he was lucky to have survived. Laika asked if living underground forever would be difficult. Garen replied that it was fine. Life outside would have been harder. He went on to explain that he was an orphan who used to beg during the day and sleep in the forbidden underground tunnels at night. One day, he stumbled into a hidden passage that led to Crocus's dwelling. It was filled with demonic energy, so much so that normal humans couldn't enter. After that, he became Crocus's disciple. Years later, Crocus, now old and weary, told Garen he had the potential to become his successor. Garen could withstand the demonic aura and use barrier magic. With nowhere else to go and deep respect for his master, Garen accepted the offer. Laika told Garen that it must have been a difficult decision and praised him for being amazing. Garen simply said that when they arrived at the Empire, he would meet his master and undergo the succession ceremony. Asher remained silent the entire time, lost in thought about Crocus. He recalled working with him during his younger days in Arak territory. He hadn't seen Crocus since he went to the Empire for the ceremony, and now he guessed that Crocus must be quite old. He wondered if he would get the chance to see him again. A few hours later, the driver informed them that they would arrive at the Empire soon. Several hours later, under the bright moonlight, they arrived at the Empire. The guards quickly rushed out to welcome Arena back. Arena informed them that the people accompanying her were villagers who had been attacked by slavers and ordered the guards to provide them with temporary lodging, to which they agreed. Meanwhile, Garen thanked Laika and Asher once again, waving goodbye as he told them that he would see them again before heading underground. Laika agreed and told Garen to take care. Arena then called out to them, praising their efforts and saying that since it was late, she would guide them through the Empire tomorrow. They both agreed, and Arena warmly offered to take them to their lodgings for the night. They then headed to the guest palace and were given separate rooms. Asher entered his room, thinking to himself that it had been a while. He recognized the quarters from his time working for the Empire. Looking around, he noticed that nothing had changed. He sat down on the bed and spoke aloud, saying that it was time for someone to come out. Caius responded, saying his senses were as sharp as ever, and jumped down in front of him. Asher told him that sensing his presence wasn't difficult, which made Caius laugh proudly. Asher asked Caius if he had found any information about the locations of the heroes he had asked for. Caius proudly confirmed that he had. He showed Asher a copy of the Empire's confidential documents, and tossed it to him, explaining that it contained a timeline of when the heroes disappeared and the locations of their domains. Caius told him to use it as he saw fit. Asher praised him for doing a great job. Caius then informed him that the atmosphere around the Imperial castle had been ominous lately, and he had heard that the master of the underworld had suddenly vanished. This news shocked Asher. The next morning, they were in the dining area having breakfast, when Laika asked where Arena was, mentioning it would have been nice to eat together. Asher remained quiet, lost in thought. Laika reminded him that Arena had promised to take them around the Empire today, but just then, someone knocked on the door. A guard entered and greeted them. The guard introduced himself as Kane, a lieutenant of the guard, and informed them that he would be their guide. Laika was confused and asked if Arena wasn't coming. Kane explained that Arena had urgent matters to attend to, so she couldn't come, and he would guide them to the academy in her place. Laika remarked that Arena must be busy and said she would leave it to him. Asher, however, had a suspicion. He wondered if Arena had gone to search for Crocus. Moments later, they arrived at the Imperial capital. Laika was amazed by the city, noting that the buildings were far larger than those in their territory, and that the people looked so elegant. She excitedly commented that the big city really was different, but Asher remained silent, still thinking about Crocus. He knew the Empire had remained peaceful all this time thanks to Crocus, who protected the world from the demonic realm. With the successor's inheritance ceremony approaching, Crocus disappearing didn't make sense. Asher wondered what had really happened to him. He flinched in surprise when Laika called his name. She asked what was wrong, saying he had looked a bit off since earlier. He simply replied that it was nothing. Kane then asked if being in a foreign land felt unfamiliar. He reassured them that they would be arriving at the academy soon and that he would do his best to help them feel comfortable. Asher thanked him, while Laika excitedly told Kane that they were counting on him. Yet Asher thought to himself that the Empire didn't feel foreign at all. He had spent most of his past life there. A few minutes later, they arrived at the Empire Academy. Laika was stunned by its size and commented that it looked even bigger than their castle back in Iraq. Asher stared at the academy, thinking it had been a long time. He remembered it as the place where he spent his youth with Haiban and realized that nothing had changed. Kane told them to follow him to the registration desk. At the desk, a lady asked for Laika's name and immediately recognized it from Karen's territory. Laika asked if she knew Karan and the lady replied yes. She explained that Karen was one of the great master swordsmen produced by the academy and that there was probably no one in the entire empire who could beat him. Laika and Asher fell silent. The lady then informed them that the academy didn't accept students without skill. They would need to pass a swordsmanship sparring test as part of the entrance exam. She asked if they agreed to the condition, and Laika eagerly replied yes. The lady told them to follow her to the sparring grounds, and they agreed. While walking toward the grounds, Asher called out to Laika and told her that he had some business to take care of and would be gone for a while. She responded that it would have been nice if he could watch her spar. He assured her that she would obviously pass, so she didn't need to worry. Boosted by his confidence, she told him she wouldn't worry if he said so. Asher then turned to Kane and asked him to take good care of Laika. Kane nodded, saying he would, and encouraged Asher to handle his business. Laika and Kane continued following the lady, and once Asher saw them leave, he turned around and sprinted in the opposite direction, knowing it was time for him to head to the Gate of the Sword. Minutes later, they arrived at the sparring grounds, where Laika encountered a man wiping a sword. The man asked her what her name was, and she stutteringly introduced herself. He then introduced himself as Haban, the instructor in charge of new students. Haban told her he wanted to make one thing clear. He wouldn't go easy on her just because she was a noble. He added that before the sword, everyone is equal. If she managed to block his attacks and land even a single valid strike, she would pass. Haban then stood up with his sword and told her that if she was ready, she should raise her sword as well. She followed his instruction and raised her sword. The receptionist whispered to Kane that Haban was an honorary instructor and a former member of the Imperial Knights, which meant no one could pass his test with mediocre skills. Kane remained quiet, knowing that the Academy's entrance procedure was infamous for being strict, and he wondered just how skilled Laika truly was. At that moment, Haban dashed toward her, shouting that he was coming. Instantly, Laika swung her sword forward and cut Haban's sword in half. Haban was pushed back and collapsed to the ground, shocking both the lady and Kane. Laika stood speechless, wondering what had just happened. If that was it, why Haban seemed so weak, and if that was all he could do. The lady stuttered, calling out to Laika and telling her that she had passed. Meanwhile, in the capital, the streets were alive with activity. But he stood still, staring at the building in front of him. He had finally reached the Gate of the Sword. The Gate of the Sword was a famous destination sought by swordsmen from across nations. To enter, one had to pass through 3 gates, and only those who had reached a high level of swordsmanship could open them. Behind each gate stood another. Many swordsmen had tried to test their strength against the gates, but not a single one had entered the innermost area. Even top-level swordmasters struggled to open the first gate, and not even Swordmaster Haiban had been able to open the third. The place beyond the third gate remained an eternal mystery. He stepped through the first gate and saw swordsmen giving their all to push it open. Opening even a single gate was proof of one's mastery and a symbol of being top tier. But despite repeated attempts, the gate wouldn't budge. One man gave up, and his friend encouraged him to try again, saying he was close. Then they heard someone approaching. Turning, they saw Asher walking calmly toward the gate. The man asked if he was also here to try opening the gate of the sword. Asher simply replied yes. The man's friend arrogantly told him that it wouldn't be easy, that his friend, Poitan, was the top student at the academy and had been trying for over an hour without success. Asher ignored them and placed his hand on the gate. The men teased him, saying he didn't even have a sword and didn't look like a swordsman. This gate wasn't something that would open so easily, but they were all stunned when he effortlessly pushed it open. They stood in shock, unable to believe what they were seeing. Before they could say a word, he shut the gate behind him. He remembered that, for some unknown reason, even in his previous life, he had passed through the first gate easily, as well as the second. He also recalled reaching the third gate, the one even swordmasters couldn't open, and entering the mysterious space beyond it. At that time, he had only been a captain of the Imperial Guard, not someone known for exceptional skill, yet he had passed through all the gates. He still didn't know why, but what he encountered there had stayed with him. He once again passed through the gates effortlessly and entered the mysterious space without breaking a sweat. At the center, he greeted Ensir, the sword at the heart of the chamber. Ensir recognized him as the captain of the guard, Jinwoo. He told Ensir it had been nearly 40 years. He remembered speaking with Ensir in his past life, knowing that Ensir was a transcendent being, one capable of reading the souls and mastery levels of humans, and one who possessed immense knowledge. If anyone could answer his questions, it was Ensir. Ensir asked him why he looked different and commented that he had suddenly become young again. Asher replied that his soul remained the same, but he had been reincarnated into the body of a child named Asher. That was why he had come, to find out the cause of his reincarnation. Ensir agreed to help, and told him to allow a closer look at his soul. He then released a powerful energy that surrounded Asher and told him that something was strange. He sensed impure energy within his soul. Asher was surprised. Ensir went on to explain that there were traces of an evil force interfering with his soul. Asher was shocked even further and began to wonder if it was Morena. Morena ruled over the Assassin's Guild Motoropia and was the most evil of all the Dark Gods. Morena had sent his followers to attack the Arak territory and attempted to kill him. He explained this to Ensir, who understood the situation. Ensir told him that gods were capable of interfering with human souls, and it seemed that Morena was attempting to seize his. He asked why his soul was the target, and Ensir explained that, before dying in his past life, he had reached the rank of Swordmaster. Those who reach that level undergo a phase where their aura and soul merge. However, since he died before the process was complete, his aura never fused with his soul. This made his soul particularly tempting to Morena, as it carried the essence of a swordmaster but lacked the aura needed to defend itself. Despite the danger, he remained confident that even with his new body, he wouldn't be easily defeated. At the very least, the answer put his curiosity to rest. Knowing that he would need to confront Morena directly, he told Ensir he would take his leave. Ensir, surprised that he was departing so soon, asked him to wait and questioned if he was really just going to leave. He replied that he was unfortunately busy and assured Ensir he would stop by again when he returned to the Empire. Ensir called out, pleading to be freed from the space he had been trapped in for decades, saying it had become suffocating. He reminded Ensir that the same thing had been said in the past, and that he had tried to pull him out several times, but always failed. Ensir insisted that this time was different. He was now a swordmaster, and that meant he should be capable of freeing him. He stepped closer, saying that as a reward for answering his question, he would give it a try. He gripped Ensir's handle tightly. Ensir laughed with excitement, shouting that this time he truly believed he could escape. Asher noticed the sword felt lighter than before, completely different. When he pulled, the blade came free. Ensir erupted in light and shouted with joy, finally free at last. Later that night, back at the guest castle, Laika noticed that he was covered in dirt and asked what he had been doing all this time. He simply replied that it was nothing and changed the subject by asking how the academy entrance exam had gone. Laika, excited, said she had passed. The instructor had looked strong, but she had brought him down with just one strike. She commented arrogantly that the academy wasn't as tough as she had expected. Kane remarked that there truly seemed to be many skilled warriors from Arak territory. Laika announced that she was going to wash up and sleep and told him he should rest as well. He agreed. Kane bowed and said he would leave now too. Asher thanked Kane for his help, then watched him walk away. Once Kane was far enough, Asher addressed the spirit beside him, noting that no one had noticed its presence and it seemed only he could see it. He called the spirit by name, Ensir. Earlier, Ensir had been amazed by the sight of the Empire, prompting Asher to ask if it was his first time seeing the human world. Ensir responded that he remembered glimpses from before he was sealed in the Gate of the Sword. He reminded Asher that the gate had been completely reduced to ashes. Asher agreed, noting that the shockwave had been massive. Ensir expressed relief that they had made it out safely, though Asher joked that it had left him looking like a complete mess. Ensir didn't mind. Freedom was enough. However, Ensir mentioned sensing some unsettling energy nearby. Asher agreed. He had sensed it too. Ensir, confused, asked what it was and what was happening. Asher explained that beneath the Empire there existed a rift leading to the demonic realm. The person who had guarded the rift, the master of the underworld, had recently disappeared. Since then, the barrier had weakened, and demonic energy had begun seeping into the Empire. Ensur, shocked, asked for confirmation. Asher nodded, explaining that Crocus had been a hero who secretly protected the Empire and a man with a strong sense of responsibility. He expressed concern about Crocus's sudden disappearance. Ensur warned that the energy present wasn't just demonic. It was laced with dark magic, a force capable of destroying the world. That revelation left him shaken. Meanwhile, deep beneath the Empire, a guard informed Arena that they would soon arrive at the residence of the Master of the Underworld. Arena sensed that the demonic energy was becoming denser. She ordered the guards to stay on high alert, and they all acknowledged her command. She warned them that letting their guard down could be fatal. Before she could finish, one of the guards at the front collided with something unseen. Arena turned around in shock and stuttered, asking what had just happened. A winged figure laughed at her reaction, amused. The demon mockingly remarked that all the fuss was about a few humans, then asked whether she had come for some sightseeing in the demonic realm. At the same time, Asher asked Ensur if he could sense dark magic, to which Ensur confirmed he could. Ensur explained that dark magic was a power possessed by demons, an evil force capable of engulfing the world in darkness and destruction. He added that someone was using dark magic to destroy the rift and spread demonic energy. The thought terrified Asher, who began to wonder if the demons had already taken over the underground beneath the Empire. Suddenly, a voice shouting for someone to let him out caught their attention. Asher immediately recognized the voice. They then saw Cain trying to stop Garen, insisting that he could not leave the capital at that moment. Garen, however, insisted that he needed to see his master. Asher called out to Garen while dashing toward them and asked what was happening. Garen ran to him, begging for help, explaining that his master had disappeared. Ensur asked if Garen was the disciple, though Asher remained silent, realizing that Garen had also sensed the demonic energy. He then explained to Cain that Garen was the successor to the master of the underworld. Cain hesitated upon hearing it. Asher went on to explain that they needed to go to the area where the captain of the guard had been, urging Cain to allow both him and Garen to leave. Cain protested, saying the underground was dangerous and only a select number of troops trained to endure demonic energy were permitted access. Ensur spoke up, explaining that demonic energy was not like that of ordinary monsters. It was unbearable for most humans. But Asher had reached a level where he could endure it, so he would be fine. Upon hearing the mention of monsters, Asher got an idea. He realized he would need to bring that guy along. A moment later, in the prison, Taken laughed and asked if that was the reason Asher had come to see him, after being told about the situation. Asher explained that if Taken helped, he would petition the Empire for his release. However, he had to promise never to harm humans again, and Asher asked if he could make that promise. Taken responded that he was a warrior and swore on his honor and loyalty as such. Hearing that, Asher smiled and ordered Cain to release the goblin. Cain agreed, knowing that under normal circumstances, approval from the captain of the guard would be required. However, Asher was a disciple of a swordmaster officially recognized by the Empire and was the only one they could trust in such a situation. Cain then unlocked the padlock to Taken's cell. A few minutes later, Asher, Taken, and Garen arrived at the entrance to the underground. Taken asked if this was the entrance and commented on the overwhelming stench of demonic energy. He then stepped inside, saying he would lead the way. Ensur found it amusing to hear a talking goblin and chuckled to himself. As they moved deeper underground, Garen asked Asher if he was all right, noting that the energy was getting stronger and it must be hard to endure. Asher replied calmly that he was fine. Taken laughed and said that a normal human would have lost their mind by now. This one was clearly different. Taken then looked ahead and saw the guards and Arena collapsed on the ground. He asked if the elf woman from earlier was among them. Asher immediately dashed to Arena's side and picked her up, asking if she was all right. She regained consciousness and recognized him, which relieved him to see that she wasn't seriously hurt. She asked what he was doing there and was startled to see Taken as well. Taken commented that she looked terrible, and she stuttered, asking what Taken was doing there. Asher explained that Taken was accustomed to demonic energy and would be useful. He then said that he and Taken would go check on the situation and return. Arena agreed but warned him to be careful. He nodded, stood, and rushed deeper into the underground, shouting to Garen to look after Arena and the soldiers. Garen confidently accepted. As they moved through the tunnel, Taken warned that the demons were close and he could sense their strength. Ensur was surprised that Taken could also sense dark magic. Taken replied that the energy was familiar to him. It was the same dark force that had once brainwashed and controlled him. At that moment, they heard something approaching. Asher readied his iron gloves and drew his sword. Taken positioned himself and told him to be ready. They were both startled when someone began laughing above them. A female demon appeared and mockingly asked who they were and if they had come to play. Despite her provocations, they remained calm. The demon gathered dark energy in her hand and declared gleefully that she would play with them and defeat them in a single blow. She lunged toward them, and a loud explosion echoed from deep within the underground. Outside, Garen and Arena were alarmed by the sound. Arena stuttered, asking what that was. Garen worried whether something had happened to his master. Without waiting, he dashed toward the gate to investigate. Arena followed immediately after him. At the same time, within the final gate of the underground, Crocus sat silently in the center of the chamber. Corrupted by demonic energy, he sensed Garen approaching. He waited patiently, preparing to begin the successor ceremony as soon as the boy arrived. A few minutes earlier, when the demon lunged at them, Asher immediately swung his sword forward and struck the demon, causing a powerful explosion. As the smoke settled, they calmly approached the downed demon. Ensir commented that it truly had ended with a single strike. Asher asked Taken who that demon was. Taken replied that she was nothing more than a pathetic, low-rank demon, not even worth fighting. The demon struggled to sit up, trembling in the process. Despite her condition, she arrogantly told them they were not bad, but that it wouldn't be enough. Her pride vanished the moment Asher pointed his sword at her. She quickly bowed and surrendered, begging him to spare her. He asked who had ordered her to come there. She hesitated and explained that it wasn't like that. She had simply wandered through the rift out of curiosity. Asher concluded that she was not the one responsible, and the true creator of the rift must still be elsewhere. Just then, Arena and Garen arrived at the scene. The demon sneered as she noticed them distracted. Suddenly, a beast appeared and slammed Asher away from the demon. Arena and Garen called out to him in panic. Taken, however, remained composed and simply observed as Asher crashed into the wall and slumped to the ground. The demon erupted into laughter and praised her beast Pedro for taking down Asher. She turned to Taken next and shouted that it was his turn. Taken calmly acknowledged the demon for bringing her beast, but then listened as she arrogantly claimed that monsters like him were slaves to demons. She asked if he understood that he had to obey, and then ordered him to eliminate the two humans behind him. Arena and Garen were stunned by the command. The demon declared they would wipe out the human world together. Taken's expression turned dark as he cursed her kind, surprising her. He then demanded to know if she truly believed she could manipulate them with such pathetic strength. Taken unleashed his aura, leapt into the air and hurled his spear with force, shouting for her to get lost. The resulting slash struck both the demon and Pedro simultaneously, causing a shockwave that echoed through the underground. Taken looked up, noticing they had vanished. He asked aloud if they had run away and called them pathetic. Arena rushed to Asher and asked if he was all right. He replied that he was fine. Ensir expressed disbelief that he had been knocked out by that attack but admitted that he had seen Asher block it at the last second. He then asked through telepathy if Asher had only pretended to be unconscious because he didn't want to fight. Asher responded through thought, confirming that he had simply wanted to see how Taken would handle the situation on his own. He then commended Taken for not obeying the demon's command. Taken reminded him of the promise he had made, to uphold his word as a warrior, and added that he had no love for demons either. Taken then loudly declared that they were wasting time and urged everyone to move on, surprising both Arena and Garen with his bluntness. Eventually, they reached the final gate of the underground. Arena explained that this was the underground fortress where the rift was located. Asher told Garen that he should go ahead and find Crocus while the rest of them dealt with any remaining demons. Garen nodded, saying he understood. Garen opened the gate and stepped inside, only to be shocked by the sight of Crocus sitting calmly in the center of the room. Crocus greeted Garen with a calm expression. Garen rushed to him, expressing concern and saying he had feared the worst. Crocus gently patted Garen's head, apologized for worrying him, and assured him that he was perfectly fine. Asher smiled, relieved. It had been a long time since he had seen him. Crocus then turned to greet Arena, recognizing her as the captain of the guard. Arena said she was glad to see him safe, but Taken remained quiet, feeling something was off. The atmosphere felt too calm, too controlled. Arena took a few steps closer and knelt in front of Crocus, explaining that the Empire was in danger because of the demonic energy. She stated that the nation believed in him and pleaded for his protection. Crocus asked if she truly meant that they believed in him, then coldly replied that he refused. Arena was visibly startled. Crocus questioned how much longer he was expected to live in the shadows, as the master of the underworld, trapped in that underground prison, shackled by endless responsibility. Years ago, in the same empire, a young Crocus had thanked Asher for everything he had done up to that point. When asked if he was finally going underground, Crocus had replied yes. Asher questioned whether it wouldn't be too difficult, since Crocus would have to spend the rest of his life in that place. Crocus responded that someone had to do it on behalf of the Empire. His parents had been killed by demons, and by taking on the role, he felt he could become the kind of son they would have been proud of. Crocus had then said his final goodbye and wished Asher well. Asher now couldn't believe that the Crocus he once knew had become so corrupted. Behind the current Crocus, he could see dark energy swirling ominously. Asher asked Ensir what those beings were, and Ensir explained that they were demonic forms, creatures existing at the boundary between the demonic realm and the human world. Ensir elaborated that these were ancient beings, the very source of demonic power and physical forms. Crocus had absorbed them, and in doing so, gained control over dark magic. Crocus then commanded the creatures of darkness to spread out, horrifying Arena. One of the demonic forms rushed toward her, but Taken intercepted it in time and slashed it down, shielding her. Taken warned Arena not to lose focus and told her to draw her sword. He declared that Crocus was no longer a hero, but a monster. Arena, trembling, drew her blade. Taken then caught sight of Asher eliminating several demonic forms off to the side. He called out to Asher and told him to leave the remaining demons to him and Arena, and to go find Garen, who had been taken by Crocus and vanished. At the same time, within the Dark Realm, Crocus told Garen that they would begin the succession ceremony. Garen, confused and concerned, asked why Crocus was doing all this. Crocus responded that he was tired. After countless years trapped in the underground, he had been unable to escape. To be the master of the underworld meant living in eternal imprisonment, and he didn't want to pass that cursed life on to Garen. Garen, shouting with emotion, questioned why Crocus would call it a miserable life. He reminded him that he had chosen to become his successor out of deep respect. Crocus acknowledged this, but claimed that even the Empire, despite calling him a hero and pretending to respect him, actually despised him. They had kept him locked away, accusing him of spreading demonic energy. His so-called heroic existence had been more degrading than that of a criminal. Furiously, Crocus asked how he could ever escape such confinement. Garen was terrified by the shift in his tone. Crocus then shouted that the only answer was to turn the entire world into a prison. Meanwhile, Arena was in the midst of battle, swinging her sword and slicing through the demonic forms surrounding her. Taken watched and found her skill impressive. Her swordsmanship, he noted, had a distinct authenticity. While thrusting his spear into the dark creatures, he observed Arena maintaining sharp focus. She continued fighting, hoping desperately that Asher was safe. At that very moment, Asher stood before the portal to the Dark Realm. Ensir explained that it was a barrier formed by concentrated dark magic and appeared extremely solid. Asher raised his sword and asked if it could be broken. Ensir reminded him that he was a swordmaster, capable of withstanding demonic energy. If anyone could break through, it would be him. Asher understood that he had no choice. He raised his sword, aimed it at the barrier, and lunged with all his might. Inside, Crocus held Garen in place using dark magic and announced that he would channel the power of the demons into him. Garen cried out, begging him to stop, saying he didn't want it. But Crocus continued, declaring that he would turn the world into a reflection of the demonic realm. In doing so, he would become someone no longer rejected by the world, a true hero in his own twisted image. Crocus released a massive surge of dark energy and ordered Garen to accept the power. At that moment, Asher broke through the barrier and shouted that it would not happen. He was relieved that he had made it in time. His voice startled Crocus, who turned and released Garen from his hold. The boy collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by pain. Asher looked at Crocus with sorrow, telling him that he had once thought of him as a hero, but now he saw that Crocus had become something worse than a demon. Crocus, enraged, called Asher a bastard and hurled powerful waves of dark energy at him, shouting for him not to interfere. Asher shattered the attack with a single slash of his sword. Crocus, undeterred, launched more dark energy in desperation. Asher leapt into the air before the next blast could strike and angled his sword downward. He stared at Crocus as he descended, his weapon aimed for the heart. In that moment, he thought to himself that Crocus was truly a tragic figure, once a hero, now lost. Then with precision he drove his sword into Crocus's abdomen. Crocus clutched his wound and, panting heavily, acknowledged that Asher had broken through his dark magic. He remarked that Asher was no ordinary swordsman. He then asked whether Asher had come to stop him. Asher responded that he couldn't stand by and watch as Crocus attempted to turn the world into a den of demons. Crocus, enraged, released a surge of dark magical energy and accused Asher of arrogance. He questioned who Asher thought he was to dare challenge the great hero Crocus. Floating into the air, Crocus declared that Asher could not win against the immense power of dark magic. Ensir observed that the magic had fully restored Crocus's body, but Asher calmly raised his sword. He told Crocus that he was no hero. He was a traitor who had sold out humanity and bowed down to demons. This statement infuriated Crocus, who shouted for him to be silent. Crocus gathered dark energy in his hands and hurled it at Asher. The power of the darkness engulfed him. It was a type of energy that destroyed the mind and drove one to madness. Crocus continued pouring darkness upon him, insisting that no matter how strong he was, he remained just a human and would not withstand the impact. Yet Crocus was stunned when a sword flew past his head, nearly piercing his skull. He demanded to know how Asher could still fight. Asher calmly replied that such an attack would never work on him. Ensir grinned proudly, knowing that Asher was not just any human, he was a swordmaster, and mental attacks of that kind had no effect on one of his level. Realizing the usual tactics were ineffective, Crocus decided to crush Asher with raw power. He released an even more powerful wave of dark magic that shattered the ground and walls around them. Still, Asher remained composed. As Crocus continued his relentless assault, Asher blocked as many blasts as he could, though the sheer force of the attack caused a massive explosion. Seeing no response from Asher afterward, Crocus descended and approached the collapsed Garen. Standing over him, Crocus apologized for having to witness such brutality. He expressed his hope that Garen, of all people, would understand. Crocus explained that throughout his life, he had harbored a deep hatred for demons. Becoming the master of the underworld had been a personal mission to protect the world from them. For decades, he had lived alone in the darkness, enduring great suffering, all in the name of peace for the Empire. But in the end, the Empire had erased his existence to hide the rift's presence. He had been treated like a threat, tainted by demonic air, even though the prosperity they enjoyed had been paid for by his sacrifice. To them, he had become no different from the demons he once fought, and so he had made his choice. Tears streamed down Crocus's face as he told Garen that he no longer had a reason to guard the rift. The humans, he said, were worse than the demons, and that was why he had chosen to embrace dark magic. Crocus drew upon his dark energy once more and told Garen that he could not allow such a life to be passed on to him. Through the power of dark magic, Garen could live freely and without restraint. Before he could continue, Asher rose behind him and interrupted. Crocus glanced over his shoulder in shock. He called Asher a persistent fool. But Asher addressed him with seriousness, recalling the words Crocus once spoke, that he had wanted to be a child his parents could be proud of, and that the duty of guarding the underground was a burden someone had to carry. Crocus, stunned, demanded to know how Asher knew those words. Asher pressed him again, asking why he had abandoned the ideals he had once chosen and submitted to the demons. He went on to tell Crocus that the Empire had not abandoned him. They had trusted him and continued to recognize him as a true hero. Crocus stammered, asking who Asher truly was. Asher simply replied that it was time to let go of his delusions. He reached out a hand toward Crocus, urging him to return to who he once was, a hero stronger than anyone else. He stepped closer, extending that hand in hope. Just before he could reach him, darkness surged between them. Asher froze, confused by what was happening. From within the black void, a single massive eye emerged and stared directly at him. The dark eye spoke, addressing Asher as the Unchanging One. When Asher shouted and demanded to know who it was, the voice calmly replied that he could refer to it as the Master of Dark Magic. Asher asked whether it had been the one responsible for turning Crocus into what he was. The voice corrected him, not to misunderstand. It claimed it had done nothing to Crocus. It explained that Crocus had come willingly through the rift, seeking the power of dark magic. All it had done was grant a small request. Ensir immediately realized that this entity was the true force behind everything. The Master of Dark Magic then stated that it would let Crocus go, just as he wished, though it had hoped to play with him a little longer before finishing him off. It smiled with a twisted grin. Enraged, Asher charged at the darkness and swung his sword, but as the darkness vanished, he realized in horror that the one he struck was Crocus. The Master of Dark Magic laughed cruelly and remarked that perhaps it was better that Crocus had died at the hands of his own comrade. Then, before disappearing entirely, it once again referred to Asher as the Unchanging One, and promised that they would meet again. Crocus slumped to the floor, clutching the deep wound in his body as blood spread around him. Despite the pain, Crocus thanked Asher, saying that he had finally been freed and could now rest in peace. With a fading voice, Crocus requested to know Asher's name before passing. In response, Asher referred to him as the lieutenant of the guard from Arak territory, stating that it had been a long time since they last saw each other. Crocus was shocked and asked how he knew that. Asher then introduced himself as his former superior, explaining that although he no longer looked the same, he had once been the captain of the guard. In that moment, Crocus recognized him. Moments later, the rift slowly closed. Taken expressed his relief at the sight. Arena turned sharply when she heard footsteps and saw Asher quietly approaching. She asked what had happened to Crocus and Garen, but Asher said nothing, he only frowned. The next day, Arena placed a white rose on Crocus's grave. She acknowledged that, although demons had twisted Crocus's heart, his achievements in protecting the Empire should not be forgotten. She added that a monument had been built in his honor. Asher asked her if Garen was now the new master of the underworld, but she simply told him to follow her. He would see for himself. A few minutes later, they arrived at the underground chamber and called out to Garen. Garen greeted them cheerfully and confirmed that he had officially become the successor. He thanked them for coming and showed them the place where Crocus now rested. Asher offered an apology, but Garen reassured him that it wasn't his fault. Crocus had attempted to use demonic power to destroy the world, and he was no longer the master Garen once knew. Garen expressed his gratitude for helping Crocus regain his senses at the end. One day earlier, Crocus had laughed upon recognizing Asher and remarked that it was no wonder his swordsmanship had seemed so familiar. Asher asked how someone like him could have ended up in such a state. Crocus explained that the demons had slipped into his heart during a moment of weakness and twisted his will. He admitted that, in the end, he was just a weak man who had wanted to be strong, like Asher. At that moment, Garen had regained consciousness and rushed to his master's side in tears. He embraced him and cried, devastated to see his master in his final hour. Crocus apologized for everything and said that although it was late, they should properly begin the succession ceremony. Garen, sobbing, agreed. Crocus then turned to Asher and received a nod in response. He said that it had been nice meeting him and asked to speak privately with his disciple. Asher agreed, quietly leaving while saying that they would meet again someday. That scene continued to haunt Asher, and it made him feel guilty facing Garen. Garen admitted that even now it was difficult to shake the sadness. His hand trembled as he clenched it, the pain still visible, which concerned Arena. Suddenly, they were all startled when someone addressed Garen as Master. They turned to see the demon girl from earlier approaching excitedly, telling Garen that she had brought the books from his study. Upon seeing the others, she froze and asked why so many people were present. Arena instinctively reached for her sword upon seeing a demon, but Garen calmly assured them that there was nothing to worry about. He explained that the demon was now working as his assistant. The demon added that with the rift now closed, she had nowhere else to go. She had tried to hide but had been found quickly. Rather than killing her, Garen had taken her in. She admitted that she had been mistreated in the demonic realm, and that it was far better staying there with her kind master. Ensur, witnessing this, was amazed. He noted that although she was a demon, she showed something rare: gratitude. He acknowledged that she was a good one. Shortly after, Garen led them out of the underground, with the demon assistant following behind. He wished them well and told them to take care. Asher promised he would visit again, and Arena wished Garen good health. Garen assured them both that he would be fine. As they stepped away from the underground, Arena asked whether having a demon assistant wasn't a bit risky. Asher replied that while the demon girl had played a few mischievous pranks, she lacked the strength or the malice to cause any real harm. More importantly, having someone by Garen's side would help him stave off loneliness and find peace in his heart. Upon entering the Empire's castle, Arena was surprised to find Kane and several guards waiting for them. She asked Kane what brought him there. Kane responded that he was there to escort Asher. Then, Kane and the guards knelt before Asher, respectfully requesting that he come with them, because His Majesty, the Great Emperor, wished to meet him. Later, within the Emperor's castle, Asher kneeled and greeted the Emperor. The Emperor instructed him to rise, and he did so, while Ensir, standing beside him, chuckled quietly at the sight of the Emperor. Alark Bokados, the Emperor of the Empire, highly commended Asher's achievements. In response, Asher expressed that he was honored by his words. Alark remarked that Asher seemed to be the only one he could trust now, with the so-called heroes either falling into corruption or vanishing one by one. He added that Asher's service in saving the Empire must be formally recognized, and as a token of gratitude and trust, he would be rewarded. Alark ordered the guards to bring forth the reward. One of the guards stepped forward carrying something large. He stopped in front of Asher, and Alark stated that he believed Asher was the most fitting person to own it. The guard then opened the container. Sometime later, Asher was walking through the corridor, checking the iron gloves he had received. Ensir asked him what Alark had given him, and Asher explained that it was the Box of the Empire, a legendary weapon passed down through generations since the reign of a former emperor. He mentioned that he had heard rumors about it but had never known what kind of weapon it actually contained until now. Ensir was impressed that Alark had entrusted him with something so valuable and asked if he didn't want to test it out. Suddenly, Laika called out to him, sounding both worried and excited. She exclaimed that she had heard he had met His Imperial Majesty and admitted she couldn't believe he had spoken with someone so unapproachable. It made him seem even more impressive, but Asher remained silent, knowing what had to come next. He then spoke seriously, calling out her name, which surprised her. He told her that there was something he needed to tell her. Hours later, outside the castle, Laika expressed that it was unfortunate he was leaving so suddenly. Asher responded that he didn't know when, but he would return to see her. He urged her to focus on her studies, explaining that there was something he had to do. His mind wandered to the warning from the Master of Darkness, that they would meet again. He knew he needed to take care of everything that stood in his way. Laika patted his shoulder and said that wherever he went, it was fine, as long as he didn't die. Asher nodded in understanding. He glanced briefly at Kane and Arena. He had wanted to say to Arena that it was a pleasure to see her again, but instead, he simply thanked both her and Kane. Kane wished him safe travels. Arena remained silent. Asher turned around and said that he would be taking his leave, then departed from the Empire. Laika, trying to ease the silence, reassured Arena that Asher would be fine. He was tough and could survive wherever he went. But Arena stayed quiet, her thoughts drifting to memories of her father. She remembered him telling her he would be back, though it might take a while, and instructing her to lock the doors and take care of the house. The parallels between Asher and her father struck her again, both walking into danger without hesitation. Later in the forest, Ensur asked where they were headed. Asher replied that their next destination was the Kingdom of Arabia. He explained that it was ruled by an old comrade of his and, according to recent reports, the kingdom had suddenly fallen. Just then, a familiar voice called out to him. When he looked up, he saw Taken standing before him. Ensir recognized the talking goblin, and Asher commented that it looked like he had finally gained his freedom. Taken confirmed it and added that, fortunately, they had both kept their promises. With a smile, Taken said he would remember Asher, and that one day, no matter what, he would find him again. When that day came, they would face each other once more, and next time, he would be the one to win. Asher replied calmly that he would be waiting. Taken grinned and leapt away, shouting that they would meet again. Ensur, still watching the goblin's departure, reminded Asher that monsters were enemies of humans and asked if it was really all right to let Taken go. Asher responded that Taken had sworn never to harm humans, and he could tell that Taken would keep his word as a fellow warrior. He then turned to continue his journey, and Ensir mused that Taken truly was an unusual one. He couldn't believe a monster had referred to itself as a warrior and talked about defeating a human. Unbeknownst to him, Caius was watching from a tree above, carefully observing Asher's every move. Caius thought to himself that this boy was truly a mystery. He remembered doing some digging on him, how Asher had supposedly been the adopted son of a noble family in Arak territory, once a troublemaker who had caused constant problems, only to transform overnight into a master of swordsmanship. Caius also noted how Asher had gained the favor of a noble lady, been recognized as a disciple by a swordmaster, and achieved impossible feats, defeating assassins, demons, and even monsters. It all sounded too unbelievable, making Caius wonder if a person could really change that much. He pulled out a book containing the Empire's historical records, the one he had been using to investigate Asher from the beginning. Flipping through the pages, he recalled how his curiosity had been piqued ever since Asher had made the strange request to search for the whereabouts of missing heroes and champions. Eventually, he found the page that had captured his attention, a section on Jinwoo, the former captain of the Imperial Guard. As he stared at the entry, Caius's thoughts narrowed in on one question: who was Asher really? Later, as the sun set, they decided to rest and cook the monster meat they had just hunted. While sitting by the fire, Ensir asked what the Kingdom of Arabia was like. Asher replied that it had once been ruled by an archmage, a close friend from his past life. Ensir then asked if that same archmage had been the one to craft his gauntlet, and Asher confirmed it. He explained that the archmage was a hero who had protected the world through transcendent magic. After the war, the archmage had founded and ruled the Kingdom of Arabia on land granted by the emperor. Rabia, he said, was once more radiant and splendid than anywhere else, a true paradise brought to life. However, word had reached him that the kingdom had fallen, and the archmage had disappeared. Ensir asked whether the archmage had succumbed to corruption like the master of the underworld. Asher replied that no one knew yet. At this point, the only way to know the truth was to go and see it for themselves. Suddenly, a rustle from above interrupted them. Two men hidden in the trees were watching. Asher, reaching calmly for the food, commented to Ensir that there was no way to know the truth unless they investigated it directly. The two men took the moment as a signal and leapt from above with their weapons drawn. In an instant, Asher turned and unsheathed his sword, launching a swift, powerful slash that struck both attackers before they could land. They slammed into the ground, defeated. Ensir was stunned by the sudden ambush, but Asher remained calm, noting the design of their clothing. He explained that they had been followed and that their attackers were part of Motororia. Ensir asked if these were the ones affiliated with Marina. Asher confirmed it. They were followers of the Dark God. A new voice then called out, noting that, as expected, Asher was not an easy target. The speaker stepped forward, mentioning that he had heard rumors of Asher even defeating one of the seats of the banquet. As more figures emerged from hiding, the leader addressed Asher directly, accusing him of wielding Imperial swordsmanship and demanding that he surrender his life to the almighty Marina. Asher chuckled quietly and said he had planned to deal with that false god anyway. He then told them to bring him to Marina directly, which infuriated the group. The leader unsheathed his blade, shouting in rage that no one insults their god, and ordered the others to kill him. The followers charged at once. Asher surged forward, slashing through them effortlessly, sending several flying with a single swing. 6 more attackers leapt at him from above, launching their swords down at once. Annoyed, he told them to stop bothering him and slashed upward, instantly cutting them down. Asher stepped forward and warned the remaining enemies that if they didn't want more of their men hurt, they should bring Marina to him. But the leader replied that it would be impossible, because before he ever met the great Marina, he would die by the leader's hand. The man then released a powerful surge of dark energy. Ensir, watching from behind, commented with mock seriousness that the threat was intense. Still, he admitted he was curious to finally witness the swordsmanship of Motororia. He observed that the energy being emitted now was even more concentrated than before. The leader smiled, confident in his strength, and said he would finish Asher off himself. But before he could act, a new force charged in at blinding speed, striking down multiple Motororia members in an instant. Ensir asked what was happening, but Asher said nothing. He recognized the aura immediately. Someone stepped into view, calling the attackers irritating pests and demanding they move aside. Asher looked up and saw him clearly. It was Haiban. Haiban smiled at the sight of Asher and asked if those Motororia scum had really dared to attack his disciple. The leader, barely conscious, gasped in fear as Haiban approached. Haiban, filled with fury, asked how the assassins dared target his disciple and prepared to strike the leader down. But before Haiban could land the killing blow, Asher raised a hand to stop him. Haiban paused, asking why. Asher glared at the leader and warned him that if he didn't want to die, he'd better reveal the location of their base. Hours later, they were walking through the forest, following the information given by the captive. Haiban commented that it had been a while, yet Asher hadn't changed. He asked how Laika was doing. Asher replied that she had enrolled in the Imperial Academy. Haiban said he was on his way to the Empire and would visit Laika while he was there. With a grin, he added that he might even take Marina's head as a gift to the Emperor. He'd certainly love that. Ensir then asked Haiban if he was truly a swordmaster, noting that his aura felt very familiar. but something about it felt strange, and Ensur couldn't quite put his finger on it, leaving Asher wondering what he meant. Eventually, they reached the Motororia base, which, just as Hyben had predicted, was hidden near the forest. Hyben suggested wiping them out in one swift attack, but before they could act, a woman floated down from the sky, shrouded in swirling dark energy. She welcomed them to what she called the Sanctuary of Motororia, surprising both Asher and Hyben. Laughing, she recognized them both, Hyben and his disciple. Seeing her alive angered Asher. She gracefully descended to the ground and addressed Hyben with a smile, saying that it had been a long time. She removed her hood, asking Hyben if she was right to assume he hadn't forgotten her face. Hyben glared at her and confirmed that he hadn't. He then identified her, Shevanat, one of the seats of the banquet, and was enraged to see her still alive, appearing as though she hadn't aged a day. She responded smugly that it was all thanks to the power of their god, explaining that she had gained an immortal body, one that surpassed even swordmasters, a power beyond the limits of humanity. She asked if they really believed she would follow in the footsteps of those who had already fallen. Hyben scoffed, calling her a fool. Asher recognized Shevanat as a member of the seats of the banquet, the council that guided Motororia under the guise of divine revelation. He remembered how, in the past, he and Hyben had carried out a massive operation under the Empire's command to eradicate Motororia. After countless battles, they succeeded in wiping out the council, all except for Shevanat. She had escaped, evading them with skill and tenacity, surviving against all odds. And now she had reappeared. Shevanat informed Hyben that she hadn't come for him. She pointed directly at Asher and stated that it was his disciple she was interested in, because Asher wielded Imperial swordsmanship. In response, Asher raised his sword, but Hyben stepped forward, declaring that he would deal with Shevanat himself. He was putting an end to this, once and for all. Hyben charged at her and unleashed a powerful swing. She met the attack with her own blade, and the two weapons clashed with a resounding shockwave. Shevanat asked if Hyben truly dared to challenge her, but he cursed her, calling her a cockroach, and vowed to exterminate all of them, including Marina. He launched a flurry of attacks, striking faster and harder, but Shevanat deflected every strike, maintaining her composure. Asher observed with disbelief. She was wielding a sword infused with aura. Even Ensur was impressed as he watched her movements. With a calm smile, Shevanat warned Hyben not to underestimate the power of their great god. Dark aura coiled around her blade as she asked whether ignorant fools who defied Marina truly believed they could overcome such divine strength. She lunged forward, her strength immense. Hyben struggled to parry her attack, and she laughed, shouting at him to die. Hyben, despite the pressure, simply chuckled and called her a disgusting fanatic. He released a surge of sword aura, shoving her blade away with brute force. Shevanat was sent crashing into the ground. Hyben stood over her and reminded her not to underestimate him. He accused her of surviving by running and hiding, and now having the audacity to fight only because she clung to borrowed divine power. He demanded to know whether she truly believed swordmasters were nothing more than a joke. Still smiling, Shevanat sat up and told him that the era of their so-called heroes was over. The remark infuriated him. She continued, stating that heroes were worthless beings, those who defied a holy god and served vile, crumbling powers. Raising her hand, she gathered a dense mass of dark energy and shouted that Hyben would bow before the might of divine power. As the darkness expanded and pulsed outward, Ensur noticed a shift in the air and warned Asher that the presence now surrounding them was Marina's energy. Hyben demanded to know what it was and raised his sword again, preparing to attack. But then, suddenly, he coughed up blood and fell to his knees. His body trembled. He couldn't breathe. Ensur, shocked, asked if it was divine power suppressing non-human strength. But what stunned him even more was that Asher began to struggle as well, gasping that he couldn't breathe. Ensur panicked, unable to believe that even Asher, a swordmaster, was being subdued by the dark god's power. Hyben cursed Shevanat as he collapsed. She approached him with a mocking tone, calling him pitiful and asking how beings as low as them dared to challenge their all-powerful god. She then kicked Hyben, sending him crashing into the nearby rocks. Turning to Asher, she walked slowly and told him to consider it a blessing. He would be offered to Marina. She pointed her sword at his head, stating that she would end him with one clean strike so he would feel no pain. Asher mumbled something under his breath. She leaned in, confused, and told him she couldn't hear him. She asked if he had any final words. Tilting her head closer, she brought her ear to his mouth. That was when he whispered that she was letting her guard down. Before she could react, a hidden spear drove through her stomach, piercing clean through. Her eyes widened in shock. He stood up and watched as Shevanat struggled to remain upright. He told her that she had been careless, prompting her to ask how he had managed to land the blow. He replied that while he didn't know how she had overpowered Hyben, it seemed her power had no effect on him. Beside him, Ensur praised his impressive acting skills. Shevanat pushed herself up, laughing through the pain, and warned him not to delude himself into thinking he had won. She declared that he had already been marked by their god and asked if he truly believed someone like him could defy such divine will. Shouting now, she proclaimed that he would be bound and tormented for the rest of his life and that the will of their almighty God would always stand in his way. Infuriated, he pulled the spear from her stomach. She collapsed to the ground and died. Ensir confirmed that Shevanat was completely dead. Asher responded coldly, stating that it didn't matter to him whether it was a god or not. Anyone who tried to toy with his fate or harm those close to him would pay dearly. Hyban regained consciousness and immediately sat up, coughing and gasping. Asher rushed over in concern, and Hyban laughed weakly, saying it was humiliating that he had fallen so pathetically. But then he coughed up blood again. Asher advised him to rest. Suddenly, Asher heard a voice speak to him, remarking that he had made it this far, a human with the soul of a swordmaster. Shocked, he looked behind him. Hyban, confused, asked what was wrong. Realizing Hyban couldn't hear the voice, Asher told him he would go ahead into the temple first, warning that there might still be assassins inside. Hyban, too injured to argue, agreed and urged him to be careful. Asher dashed inside the base. Hyban nodded, stating that he would catch up shortly. Ensir asked if something was there. Asher realized that Ensir hadn't heard the voice either and revealed that it was Marina speaking to him. The moment the assassins guarding the temple spotted him, they charged forward to protect their sanctuary. Without hesitation, Asher sprinted toward them, pulled out a battle axe, and spun it in wide arcs, tossing the first assassin aside effortlessly. Another man, invoking Marina's name and begging for strength, tried to approach, but Asher stabbed the axe into him mid-sentence, yelling for him to move aside. He then rushed deeper into the temple. Ensir noted that he sensed movement farther in and pointed the direction. Asher burst into the chamber and froze in shock. At the center of the room, an elderly man sat peacefully, waiting. The old man greeted him and remarked that he had come a long way. Asher narrowed his eyes and asked if the old man had survived too. Ensir asked who he was, and Asher explained that the man was Bakrosa, the former leader of the Seats of the Banquet. He told Bakrosa that he had been sure he killed him back then. The man laughed softly and said the body was only borrowed. He then introduced himself not as Bakrosa, but as Marina. Ensir was stunned, but Asher remained composed and acknowledged that they had finally met. Gripping the battle axe tightly, he told Marina that it was time to end it once and for all. But Marina raised a hand and urged him to wait. He explained that he had no intention of fighting. His power, he said, was already gone. He had poured everything he had into empowering his followers to capture Asher, and all of it had failed. Now, reduced to this pitiful state, he was surviving only by borrowing a body. Marina then said he knew Asher had many questions. Asher asked whether Marina had been the one who caused his reincarnation. Marina replied that it hadn't been his doing. He had only discovered the nature of Asher's soul and tried to claim it for himself. At that, Ensir realized that Marina was not behind Asher's reincarnation. Marina continued, explaining that the soul of a human who had reached the pinnacle of sword mastery held the potential to free gods from their constraints. Asher asked what he meant, but Marina simply laughed and warned him to be careful from now on, because Marina was not the only one seeking his soul. Meanwhile, in the Empire's capital, Arena sat in her office, finishing the damage reports related to the demon and monster invasions across various territories. She had also resolved the outstanding compensation requests. As she leaned back, her thoughts drifted to Asher. She quietly wondered how he was doing. Just then, Cain entered and respectfully excused himself. She asked what brought him there. Cain, hesitant at first, finally spoke and informed her that the order of the solar god had arrived. The news left her stunned. At the same time, outside the main castle of the Empire, a luxurious carriage came to a halt. A noble-looking lady stepped out, smiling as she looked toward the grand structure before her. She was pleased. She had arrived at the place where the one sought by the solar god resided. A moment later, inside the palace, the lady met Arena and greeted her. However, Arena simply asked what brought her to the Empire and addressed her as the saintess of the solar god, Verkia. Arena knew that Verkia represented the most influential religion within the Empire and was revered as the rebirth of the divine due to the immense power bestowed upon her by the solar god. Verkia commanded the church's independent military force, the Solar God Knights. Despite their status, the Solar God Church was often perceived as a cruel and arrogant religious group that enforced conversions through violence and coercion, making them a troublesome presence from the Empire's perspective. Verkia told Arena that she had heard rumors. Arena asked her what rumors, and Verkia replied that a few days ago the Empire had nearly been invaded by demons, and she had heard that a swordsman named Asher had prevented the massacre. Verkia then asked where Asher was. Meanwhile, in the Matoria base, Asher asked Marina what he meant by saying his soul could set the gods free. Marina explained that gods were incomplete beings who sustained their existence and power through human faith. If humans lost their faith, the gods would lose their power and eventually fade away. In the end, gods had to protect their believers to maintain their strength. Asher asked what Marina's point was, and Marina replied that this was precisely the reason. His soul, the soul of a swordmaster, had the power to free gods from dependence on humans. Marina explained that if they obtained his soul, they would no longer need humans to exist. They would also gain omniscient power and eternal life. Marina added that they would become perfect beings, free from human constraints, and asked how they could not desire such a thing. But Asher called him insolent and asked if he was right in thinking that although gods depended on humans, they still wished to rule over them. Marina laughed and asked in return if that wasn't second nature to humans themselves. He then told Asher that he had once had devoted followers called the Motororia. To capture Asher, Marina had bestowed power upon them. But in the end he had failed, and now he had been reduced to a pitiful state. Asher approached Marina and told him it was a fitting end for his greed, asking if they should finally put an end to everything. But Marina only laughed and unleashed his dark power, telling Asher he should struggle to the very end. Suddenly, the entire place began to shake, prompting Insir to ask what was happening. He noticed the base was collapsing, but Marina remained seated and shouted that Asher should die there as well. Insir, in a panic, asked what they should do and warned that at this rate they'd be buried alive. Asher stayed quiet, while Marina shouted that with Asher's soul, he would regain his power, and demanded that he offer his life. In response, Asher threw his battle axe at Marina, successfully striking him in the stomach. Just then, they felt the presence of someone approaching and heard a voice glad that they weren't too late. They turned and saw Haiban slashing the huge collapsing stones from the ceiling into pieces, remarking that the timing was perfect. Haiban grabbed Asher and told him they needed to get out, urging him to hold on tight. Asher replied, "Okay." Haiban then released his aura and used it to push them out of the collapsing base at great speed. They pierced through the ruins and successfully escaped. At the same time, in the Empire, Verkia ordered Arena to hand over the information they had on Asher. Arena wondered why they were seeking Asher and realized that no one knew what they truly intended to do to him. Trembling slightly, she replied that she wouldn't hand it over. Verkia was confused by her refusal, but Arena believed she couldn't back down now. Suddenly, Arena stood up and shouted, startling Verkia. She demanded to know who Verkia thought she was and how she dared to issue orders to the Empire or toss around a national hero's name so carelessly. Arena then shouted firmly that she had no information to give and ordered Verkia to leave at once. Verkia was left speechless by Arena's defiance and trembled in fear, but managed to compose herself. She set down her coffee cup and calmly agreed, assuring Arena that they had no intention of creating conflict with the Empire over the matter. She turned to leave and apologized. But before Verkia could depart, Arena stopped her and asked why they were looking for Asher in the first place. Verkia replied that they didn't know the reason either. They were simply following the Solar God's orders. Arena was surprised upon hearing this, but before she could respond, Verkia told her to remember. They would certainly find Asher, because the Solar God's order was absolute. She then walked out, leaving Arena speechless. Arena watched Verkia's carriage depart, deeply troubled, wondering why the Solar God was searching for Asher and why he had become their target. A few hours later in the guest castle, Laika was in her room studying. She was tired and overwhelmed, realizing that academy life was no joke. She had thought she only needed to focus on swordsmanship, but now had to study math, physics, and the history of the Empire as well. She flipped through a history book, stopping at the section about Jinwoo's history, but she quickly grew bored. She questioned why she even needed to learn all of it. Just then, someone knocked on her door and a maid entered after excusing herself. Laika asked the maid what it was, and the maid replied that Arena was looking for her, which left her confused. Minutes later, Laika and Arena were seated at a table. Laika felt awkward, as it was her first time having a private conversation alone with Arena. Suddenly, Arena called her name, startling her. Arena explained that the reason she had called her was because there was something she wanted to ask about Asher. She knew that the Solar God was currently targeting him, and since a god could see into the depths of a human's soul, she wondered what exactly the Solar God had seen in Asher. It had made her increasingly curious about him. She reminded Laika of the events in the Arak territory and asked if she could share anything based on her own experiences. Laika responded that she could tell her, but asked why Arena had become so curious all of a sudden. Arena was about to reply when someone interrupted, accusing her of digging around for information. Arena dropped her teacup and immediately drew her sword to protect Laika, shouting and demanding to know who the intruder was. Caius revealed himself, raising both hands in the air, and calmly explained that he wasn't suspicious and that she should relax. He introduced himself as a member of the Topic Intelligence Organization and asked if he was correct in assuming they were the captain of the guards and the lady of the Arak territory. Arena recognized his group, prompting Caius to ask if she had heard of them. Caius then explained that they were a secret intelligence group recruited by Boros of Belitaria territory and that they now served Asher as their new master. This revelation stunned both women, who found it hard to believe. Caius pulled up a nearby chair and informed them that Asher had ordered him to find the whereabouts of a hero. Laughing, he told them it was quite an interesting order. He then sat down and told them they could resume their conversation. At the same time, in the forest, Asher was cooking food over a bonfire. He called out to Ensir, reminding him that he had once seen Haiban's aura and questioned whether Haiban was truly a swordmaster. Ensir agreed, saying the aura had felt strange. Asher noted that Haiban had once said something that made it seem like he was doubting his own strength. He recalled Haiban saying that he didn't even know what talent truly meant. Asher added that although Haiban had always displayed unwavering confidence in his talent, saying it was what made him a swordmaster, now, for some reason, he seemed to have lost that certainty. Ensir understood. Haiban no longer trusted his own power. Asher added that Haiban had expressed a similar sentiment the day before. He recalled Haiban saying that the doubts he'd long harbored were finally surfacing. Haiban had questioned whether the swordsmanship he believed to be the pinnacle of mastery was truly the peak. When Asher asked him what he meant, Haiban had asked why he was so powerless against Marina's strength. He then said that perhaps the so-called heroes, as Chevenot claimed, had been blindly admiring the wrong kind of power. Haiban had then taken out his aura and questioned how something like that could be considered true swordsmanship. He claimed that true swordsmanship shouldn't rely on techniques or external power, it should be pure, untainted mastery of the sword. Asher reminded Haiban that he was just a weak human, and if Haiban hadn't come to save him with his aura, he would have been crushed in the collapsing base. He told Haiban that swordsmanship was about surpassing human limits, and that he had used that power to protect the world and save countless lives. He asked Haiban if that wasn't proof enough, proof that he had truly reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship. Haiban agreed and said that hearing him say it made him feel better. He wished him well, and said they would meet again before walking off. Yet Asher noticed that Haiban's face still showed doubt. Ensir then said that Haiban might be right. Swordsmanship is about wielding the sword itself, but Haiban's power felt more like some kind of mysterious force. Unnatural, as if something foreign had interfered to create it. He added that Haiban's susceptibility to the dark god's energy was proof that his power was unstable. It didn't seem like a mastery achieved purely through training like Asher's. Asher admitted that, at present, he wasn't at that level. He was just an ordinary human capable of using the Empire's sword techniques. Still, he wished he had that aura again, because with it, he believed he could surpass the limits of his current body. Suddenly, he heard someone approaching, followed by a voice asking who was there. He immediately activated his iron glove in response. Meanwhile, in the Empire, after Leica finished recounting everything about the events in Arak territory where Asher had participated, Caius asked if it was true that Asher had analyzed the goblin's traits and prepared countermeasures. Leica confirmed it, adding that even the elders of the territory didn't know about it, and there was nothing written about such tactics in any manuals. Witnessing Asher in action had made it feel like he had experienced war before. Arena was deep in thought, and Caius noticed. He asked what was on her mind. Startled, she replied that it was nothing. Caius then asked why she had suddenly become so interested in Asher's actions. She replied that the solar god was searching for Asher and they needed to find out why. This revelation shocked both Leica and Caius. They couldn't believe that the solar god was targeting Asher. But unfortunately for them, Verkia had already found Asher in the forest. They stared at each other for a moment when Ensir asked him who the woman was. But he remained silent, guessing from her outfit that she must be a saintess of the solar god order. She then approached him, and he wondered why she was there. She let go of her staff and tightly grabbed his hand, asking if he could help her, surprising him as he felt her immense power. A moment later, after she had informed him of the situation, he asked if she was saying that a nearby village had been attacked and the residents captured. She confirmed it and told him that dozens of farmers were on the verge of being sold to slave traders. That was why she needed his help. He guessed that the perpetrators were slavers, and she said he seemed to be someone with great strength, so she had taken the liberty of asking for his assistance. He responded that she appeared to be a saintess of the solar god order and asked if it wouldn't be better to request help from the knights of her order. He had heard that the solar god knights were the largest religious force in the empire, with a significant military presence. He looked at Verkia, who remained silent for a moment, before eventually responding that the knights had departed on other matters and did not follow her direct command. Ensir asked him if something had happened. He paused for a moment, then stood up and told her that he would help, which she gratefully thanked him for. He thought it was a good opportunity to infiltrate and wipe out the slavers. He then asked her to lead him to where the slave traders were, and she replied affirmatively. As she stood up, she realized she hadn't introduced herself yet. She then formally introduced herself as the saintess of the solar god. Moments later, they arrived at the slavers' location. He glanced at her, recalling that he had heard the solar god order was an oppressive religion, but Verkia appeared surprisingly humble. Verkia then pointed to the location, saying this was the place. From below, they could see masked men guarding a cave. She told him there were about 10 men, but he noticed that these weren't the same slave traders he had encountered before. She then informed him that the villagers were locked up inside the cave. He concluded that it would be best to act quickly, and called out to her, telling her he needed a favor. A minute later, the masked men were guarding the cave vigilantly when one of them noticed someone approaching. Asher was walking straight toward them. One of the men shouted, asking who the hell he was. They quickly gathered in front of the cave, raising their weapons and questioning whether he knew where he was. When he didn't respond, they shouted again, calling him a bastard and demanding an answer. He simply raised his sword and swung it down, unleashing a powerful slash that instantly killed the masked men and caused a massive explosion. Ensir, witnessing the scene, shouted in excitement and awe, asking if Asher had regained his aura. But Asher replied that it wasn't aura, it was the divine power of the saintess of the solar god. He knew that Verkia herself had no offensive abilities, but her power could heal injuries and temporarily enhance a person's strength to its peak. For a short period, one could wield power equal to that of a swordmaster. Verkia approached and told him that she knew her instincts weren't mistaken, though she hadn't expected him to be that strong. He thanked her, acknowledging that it was thanks to her help. Knowing her divine power was what made the Solar God Knights so formidable. They entered the cave together, and once inside, he commented that it didn't look like an ordinary underground prison. Verkia agreed, noting that it looked more like the temple of a new religious sect. Regardless, she said, they needed to find and rescue the villagers. Suddenly, a man appeared in the middle of the temple and demanded to know who they were and who dared cause a commotion in that sacred sanctuary. Verkia asked if he was the leader of the slave traders. Asher stepped forward and warned the man to release the villagers willingly. But the man scoffed at being called a slave trader, claiming instead that they were saviors. He declared that through the power of the great god, they would liberate the suffering people and become the true saviors of the world. Verkia shouted back that it was nonsense. She said she didn't know which order he belonged to, but attacking innocent villagers and calling themselves saviors made them nothing more than bandits. The man, still calm, asked if the Solar God Order even had the right to criticize them, considering they were a fanatical group that had slaughtered countless commoners under the label of heresy. Verkia was left speechless. The man then shouted that the era of their outdated god was over. Torches around the temple suddenly lit up, blinding them for a few seconds. He proclaimed that a new god would soon descend upon the world, the true savior. When their vision cleared, they saw a pile of human corpses behind the man. Both of them were shocked and unable to believe what they were seeing. Ensir shouted that it was horrifying, and Asher angrily demanded to know if they were sacrificing humans. Verkia trembled in fear and stuttered that it was a cruel act. She then called the man a murderer, but he only laughed and responded that for the salvation of the many, the sacrifice of the few was inevitable. It was an offering to the god, and therefore those who died should be honored. The man then began to call upon his great god to grant him strength, and dark energy started to rise from the corpses. Verkia, her voice trembling, warned that the energy from the altar was seeping into the man's body. He replied that he knew, and had already realized that everything was being done to summon that. The aberrations were monsters from another dimension, neither divine nor demonic. They were hostile to the mortal realm and possessed transcendental power capable of destroying entire cities. He remembered that, in the past, a follower who worshipped aberration power had attempted to use forbidden sorcery to summon one, intending to bring about humanity's downfall. As a result, Arena's homeland, the Dark Elf Forest, had been utterly annihilated. Ensir told him that they had to stop it before the aberration's true form descended into their world. He explained that the man had only absorbed its power so far. He nodded, aware of the risk, but also knowing that they were up against an aberration, and even in the past, it had taken 2 swordmasters to barely defeat one. He doubted whether he could take on such a force alone. The man laughed maniacally and proclaimed that the time of judgment had come, having fully absorbed the aberration's power. He launched a powerful fist toward them, but Verkia cast a barrier just in time to shield them both. She shouted that she would try to hold it off, though he knew that was impossible. Her barrier alone couldn't withstand such immense power. Within moments, the barrier cracked. When the man saw it, he mocked her, calling it pathetic, and then completely shattered it. Verkia screamed in fear as the man's fist came crashing down toward them. Fortunately, he grabbed her and leapt away in time, narrowly dodging the blow. Ensir was terrified as well, realizing that even a single hit could mean instant death. Knowing they had no chance at their current pace, he changed his weapon into a spear, deciding he had no choice but to use divine power once again. He told Verkia to bless his weapon and declared that he would charge in and strike the enemy's vital points. She warned that a frontal attack was too dangerous. He assured her it would be fine, asking her to trust him and lend her strength. She agreed, and immediately blessed the spear with her divine power. He stood ready as Verkia finished the blessing. The man sneered and said they were struggling until the end like insects. Raising his foot, the man shouted that he would crush them flat. Verkia called to him, urging him to take his weapon, and he grabbed it just in time. He leapt forward, avoiding being crushed, and swung the spear down, aiming for the man's chest. But the aberration's power slithered from the man and wrapped around the spear, trying to stop him. Verkia and Ensir called out to him in worry, but he didn't stop. With a final cry of effort, he forcefully thrust the spear deeper, piercing the man's chest. The spear went through completely, killing him instantly. He stood frozen in disbelief. He had actually defeated it. Verkia and Ensir immediately rushed to his side. Verkia began to heal his injuries using her divine power and gently assured him that it was over. Ensir noted how quickly he recovered and remarked that her divine power was quite impressive. He thanked Verkia, but she shook her head and told him that she should be the one thanking him, for he had saved the world. Though all the villagers had perished, thanks to him, an even greater disaster had been prevented. She knelt beside the corpses, her expression solemn, and said that although they had arrived too late, they must still pray for the souls of the fallen. She then bowed her head in silence, offering her prayers so the villagers could rest in peace. Hours later, they returned to the forest. It was time to part ways. Suddenly Verkia realized that she had never even asked his name. She turned to him and asked what his name was. She added that, regardless of what it was, he would forever be remembered as a hero of the Solar God's order. He was about to speak, but he decided not to reveal his name, instead telling her that he would share it the next time they met, because he planned to visit the Great Church of the Solar God in person soon. She replied that she understood, then removed her necklace, telling him that she would make sure to remember his face. She placed the necklace around his neck and explained that it was a token of the Solar God, given as a sign of her gratitude, and assured him that it would surely aid him. He thanked her for it, and she smiled warmly in response. A moment later, back in the village, Verkia was inside her tent, trying to calm herself when someone called from outside asking for a moment of her time. She agreed and allowed them to enter. A man stepped inside and knelt before her respectfully. Verkia addressed him, saying there was no need for formalities, and asked if he had completed the missionary campaign they had carried out without her approval. The commander proudly confirmed that he had and informed her that the foolish commoners had all sworn faith to the Solar God. Their church's influence had grown as a result. Verkia asked what the point was in forcing conversions through violence and oppression. She added that she was certain many lives had been lost in the process once again. The commander laughed and asked why she grieved over the deaths of heretics, wondering if she truly felt sympathy for such lowly beings. His words startled her, and she trembled. He then told her she lacked decisiveness and, just like in the Empire, had failed to obtain any information about the man named Asher. He accused her of being held back by nothing more than a guard captain, and now she was traveling from place to place in search of Asher. Frustrated, he asked why she had not demanded a clear answer from the Empire. Verkia stood up in anger and asked if he was suggesting war against the Empire. She told him that he could speak of war so casually because he would remain safe, while it would be the innocent commoners who died. Teasingly, the commander responded that he understood her concern for commoners. After all, before she was chosen by the gods, she was just an ordinary girl from a small village. She was left speechless, and the commander walked out of the tent saying he would take his leave and that she should rest. As he exited, he added with disappointment, loud enough for her to hear, that he wondered what the Solar God had been thinking. She knew that she was the saintess of the Solar God, the divine representative and nominal ruler of the Solar God's knights, but in truth, she held no real power. Verkia had been born and raised in a small rural village. One day, she was chosen by the Solar God and granted divine power. People began to revere her as the rebirth of the divine, allowing her to rise to her current position. However, the Solar God's knights were all noble-born elites. To them, serving a commoner as their leader was unacceptable. In the end, they completely disregarded her authority, expanding the church's influence through violence and tyranny while despising the very commoners they claimed to protect. While the knights indulged in their power games, innocent commoners were dragged into war and sacrificed. Verkia cried in silence, asking the Solar God why he had chosen her, if it was only to reveal to her these vile, deceitful truths. The Solar God told her to trust in him, but she wondered if someone courageous and trustworthy, like the hero she had met, could lead the Solar God's knights instead. If so, it would be far better. Meanwhile, in the forest, Enser asked Asher if he was truly planning to visit the Church of the Solar God. Asher simply replied for him not to be ridiculous. Enser pressed the matter, saying it was an opportunity to gain the church's support. But Asher reminded him that Marina had warned them to be cautious, that gods might be targeting him. If that were true, then the Solar God could be one of them. It was better, he said, not to get involved. A moment later, they arrived at the gate of Rabia. Enser asked if this was the entrance to the kingdom of Rabia, and Asher confirmed it. Enser then questioned how they were supposed to enter when the gate was locked. Asher told him to follow and led him to the side of the kingdom, where he pushed against a wall, revealing a hidden passage. He explained that it was a method a great mage had once taught him. A powerful barrier had been cast around the kingdom to protect its citizens from invaders, making unauthorized entry difficult. This secret route had been passed down only to trusted companions. They stepped into the kingdom of Rabia, and Enser commented that it was no wonder the place was called a paradise. Its lord protected the kingdom with powerful magic. Before they could go deeper, a spell was suddenly thrown at them. Fortunately, it missed. A voice shouted, demanding to know who was there. A lady stepped forward and asked how they had gotten inside. Frustrated, Enser groaned and asked what it was now, why they kept running into troublesome people. Asher stared at the mage woman, noticing that she looked familiar. The lady then shouted at him, stating that it was a secret passage only authorized individuals were allowed to use, and demanded he reveal who he was. Enser asked who she was to say such a thing, but Asher simply smiled, recognizing who the woman was. Suddenly, more people appeared. One of them asked the woman, named Badri, what was going on and whether the intruder had appeared. Asher immediately recognized one of the men, while Enser sighed in frustration, muttering that Badri had brought backup. Poitan, the man Asher recognized, then shouted to Badri that the intruder was the same person from before, surprising her. She turned to Poitan and asked if he knew him. Poitan explained that he had seen Asher in the Empire. They had met at the Gate of Swords. He added that Asher had easily opened the first gate and walked inside. Another man commented that Asher seemed quite skilled. Poiton, clearly irritated, snapped that it wasn't the point, and informed them that after Asher passed through, the Gate of Swords completely collapsed. That made Enser recall how the gate had crumbled the moment Asher's seal had been released. Badri laughed and said she had been right all along, accusing him of being a demon. But Asher remained calm. Poiton then asked if Asher had come to destroy this kingdom as well, just like he had destroyed the Empire. Badri said she couldn't allow him to leave alive. Enser asked Asher what they should do, noting that the two looked ready to fight. Asher paused for a moment, then drew his sword and replied that there was no helping it. He'd just have to deal with them. Poiton was shocked to see Asher using spatial magic, while the other man calmly noted that his gloves were quite intriguing. Poiton then shouted that he was coming and lunged at Asher, who easily blocked the strike and forcefully pushed him back. Asher wondered aloud if Poiton really was the top of his academy. Poiton began swinging his sword rapidly, trying to land a blow, but Asher effortlessly blocked each strike. He noted that while Poiton's stance was decent, it didn't come close to Laika's. With one smooth motion, he swung his sword and deflected Poiton's weapon, sending him flying back toward his companions. Badri then channeled her magic power into her arm and charged at him. She punched him, releasing a strong shockwave, but he blocked it easily. Enser commented that Badri had remarkably strong mana. She then demanded to know where he got that gauntlet and how he was able to use spatial magic. Asher replied that it was a gift from his master, Swordmaster Haiban, which shocked her. She immediately leapt back and calmed herself, unable to believe that he was Haiban's disciple. She admitted that she'd heard rumors of Haiban taking in a student in some distant territory, and it must have been him. He sheathed his sword and confirmed her suspicion. He added that his master had also taught him the way to the secret passage. He then explained that he had come to meet the Lord of the Rabia Kingdom, who was a close friend of his master, and asked who they were and what business they had there. A minute later, after the tension had eased, Badri explained that they were investigating the cause behind the fall of the Rabia Kingdom. She introduced Poiton as a swordsman from the kingdom of Hygen. Poiton awkwardly apologized for not recognizing the disciple of a swordmaster. She then introduced the other man, Ruban, a historian, who explained that he was there to gather data about the kingdom. She introduced herself as a mage, prompting Asher to ask if she had learned her magic from someone, which caught her off guard. He then mentioned that he had heard the lord of that place had taken on a disciple, and asked if she was there to meet her master. She guessed that he must have heard it from Haiban, and Ruben asked what she meant. She explained to them that she was the student of the Archmage, the Lord of the Rabia Kingdom. Her words shocked both of her companions. Enser asked how Asher had known that. Using telepathy, Asher explained that he had seen Badri when she was just a child. The Archmage had raised her as his foster daughter and successor, and now that child had grown into a fine young woman. Badri then admitted that she had been away from Rabia for a long time. She had dreamed of living a free life outside the castle. Her master had been like a father to her, but he was rigid and obsessed with magic, and they often clashed. Eventually, out of rebellion, she had secretly left the kingdom, hiding her identity as the Archmage's disciple and living freely among commoners. However, when she heard rumors of Rabia's fall, she met Poiton and Ruben by chance and decided to travel with them. Poiton realized the Lord had been a mage and asked her why the Rabia Kingdom had fallen so suddenly. She replied sadly that she didn't know, but she planned to meet her master and learn the full story herself. She added that she just hoped nothing terrible had happened. They eventually reached a massive door, and Badri explained that it was the entrance to the Rabia Kingdom. Asher stepped forward, drew his sword, and told them he would lead the way. He warned them that demons or monsters could be lurking inside, so they should remain on guard. He placed his hand on the door and pushed it open, only for all of them to be utterly shocked by what they saw. The place was completely neat, and the citizens appeared to be doing well. They walked inside, and Poiton asked if it was really a fallen kingdom, remarking that it looked perfectly fine. Badri agreed with Poiton and said the kingdom of Rabia looked the same as usual, but he remained quiet, wondering what the ominous feeling was that he kept sensing. Poiton then approached the fruit vendors, saying he was hungry, and this was perfect. He asked how much the fruits cost but became confused when the vendors remained motionless, standing like statues. Badri excused herself and approached a woman carrying a basket of fruit, asking if she had heard any rumors about the Archmage. The woman simply walked away as though she hadn't heard her. Ruben told Badri it was no use, prompting her to ask what he meant. He replied that the people there had no souls. Poiton then approached Asher and nervously told him there was something strange about the villagers. Asher agreed and explained that the locals were already dead, merely repeating the actions they performed in life, without souls. Ensir remarked that it was horrifying to see a city of living corpses. Poiton asked how something like that could even happen. Asher admitted he didn't know, saying he had seen countless battlefields and destruction, but nothing as bizarre as this. Ruban then asked if they didn't think it was a foreseeable outcome. He explained that the Archmage had wished to create a paradise on Earth, a world where magic would fulfill every human need. The Archmage had wanted to build a kingdom where people could live comfortably, free from worry and hardship. But in the end, they were consumed by magic, losing both self-awareness and their very lives. Reuben added that they had longed for paradise, only to become beings without consciousness or thought. Badri responded that her master only wanted to create a heaven-like world, and that she couldn't believe he would fall into ruin in such a horrifying way. Reuben told her that heaven has always belonged to the gods. He added that, in the end, the Archmage was still just a human. He suggested that perhaps this was the result of the Archmage's arrogance, believing in the power of magic and challenging the authority of the gods, leaving Badri speechless and sorrowful. They then headed straight to the palace, and Badri explained that it was Rabia's palace, where her master resided. Reuben observed that the security was quite tight, but Poitin dismissed it and reminded them that the guards weren't even alive. Poitin walked forward carelessly, telling them to ignore the guards and push through. Reuben shouted after him to wait and warned him that the people were repeating their actions from life. Reuben then asked what Poitin thought the guard's repeated action would be. Poitin, confused, asked what he meant, not noticing the guard behind him preparing to strike. Fortunately, Badri pushed the guard away in time and saved him. She then explained to Poitin that the guards detect intruders and attack them. Right now, they didn't recognize her as the Archmage's student. They saw everyone as an enemy and attacked on sight. They began fighting the guards, but then Ensir pointed out that the ones he had just defeated showed no concept of pain or death. No matter how many times they were cut down, they kept getting back up. He put his sword away, realizing fighting them was useless, and decided it was time to use it. Meanwhile, Poitin and Badri continued battling the guards, growing increasingly frustrated as their enemies simply wouldn't die. They realized it was hopeless no matter how many times they struck. As the guards rushed at them in unison, Badri shouted that if this kept up, they would be fighting forever. Suddenly, a barrier trapped the guards inside, stunning them all. They saw the source. It was coming from Asher's staff. He shouted for them to get inside the castle immediately and said he would hold the guards off for a while. Badri thanked him and they all rushed into the castle. Ensir asked if his staff was from the Empire and noted how useful it was. Asher replied yes and explained it was a rare weapon from the Imperial box that the Emperor had given him. It was a staff that generated barriers, originally used to restrain enemy movement. However, the spell was only temporary and wouldn't hold for long. They then ran toward the castle, with Ensir remarking that thanks to the staff, things had become easier. Meanwhile, Reuben, running in exhaustion, tripped and fell to the ground without Badri and Poitin noticing. He clutched his foot in pain and was terrified when he saw guards appearing before him, leaving him stunned with panic. Once they were all inside, they realized Reuben hadn't made it. Poitin shouted that Reuben wasn't good at fighting and asked what they should do. Badri, realizing the barrier must have faded, shouted that she would go rescue Reuben. But before she could act, Reuben appeared and apologized for being late. Badri angrily shouted that he had worried them, thinking he was in danger. Reuben replied that he had barely managed to slip away unnoticed. They continued walking deeper into the castle. Badri said she was just glad everyone was safe and urged them to hurry. Reuben thanked Asher, but he simply ignored him and walked on in silence, confusing Reuben, who wondered why he was acting like that. Outside, the undead showed no signs of returning.